Redwood Hollow stands on the brink of chaos under the looming threat of the ruthless Braxton Raiders. A once quiet orchard becomes the unlikely battleground for one determined young woman who has inherited her father's uncanny sharpshooting skill. Each twilight sees her perched with rifle in hand, guarding the homestead against stealthy intruders slipping through rows of battered trees. Gunfire and torches test her will as the orchard's isolation turns it into a prime target. Fear engulfs the nearby town, where lawmen scramble to unite a ragtag defense. The raiders continue their relentless probes, setting fires under dark skies and vanishing before dawn. Tensions peak when a final wave descends, forcing both the orchard and the town to fight for survival. In the midst of thunder and gunshots, courage clashes with desperation in a storm-lit confrontation. Lives, legacies, and the future of Redwood Hollow hang on a single night's stand. The valley known as Redwood Hollow lay nestled between two imposing mountain ranges that cast long shadows across the scrubland. Sparse vegetation clung to the rocky soil, and only the hardiest pines and junipers thrived in the thin air. At sunrise, the ridges appeared bathed in a subtle orange glow, yet that fleeting beauty often gave way to a harsh midday glare that tested the resilience of every living creature. The settlement within Redwood Hollow itself consisted of a dusty main street lined by rough-hewn wooden structures, a handful of ranches spread outward, each anchored by weather-beaten cabins, half-collapsed barns, and fence lines in various states of repair. Many years before the events at hand, a man named Oliver Pierce had made a name for himself by crossing this region as a scout in service of a distant cavalry unit. He was known to have an uncanny sense of direction, an ability to read the land's subtle signs, and a remarkable gift for marksmanship that saved him and his fellow riders more than once. Locals who encountered him during those days tended to recall his calm demeanor and the unwavering discipline with which he treated firearms. After the conflict in which he had served reached its conclusion, he drifted through small towns, occasionally hired as a guard for merchant wagons. Eventually, he settled near Redwood Hollow, where he built a modest homestead at the base of a gently sloping hill. The soil there was poor, but a narrow creek provided at least some water, and a small orchard of fruit trees hinted at better times to come. Oliver kept his personal history to himself. Townsfolk regarded him as a polite but reserved figure who traveled to the settlement only for essential supplies. He married a local woman who shared his preference for quiet routines, and together they tended the orchard as best they could. Over the years, they cultivated a patch of crops that struggled against the rocky terrain. When the couple's daughter, Rosalind Pierce, was born, the orchard was still young, and the homestead looked more like a hastily assembled set of boards than a final dwelling. Despite the difficulties, Oliver and his wife persevered, finding small joys in the life they built. As the daughter grew, she absorbed her father's attitude toward firearms, though he never formally pressed lessons upon her. Instead, she observed him carefully. On certain afternoons, he would aim at distant fence posts, testing his accuracy against the wind's unpredictable gusts. At other times, he would check the condition of his long rifle with meticulous attention. The child developed an early fascination with the mechanics of aiming and controlling one's breath, quietly practicing with a small wooden replica her father carved for her. If she happened to catch him in a reflective mood, he would gesture toward nearby ridges, explaining how wind patterns shifted in the canyons, or how the angle of sunlight influenced depth perception. Those lessons were offered sparingly, yet they sank deep into her consciousness. A few years after Rosalind's birth, her mother succumbed to a lingering illness that no doctor in Redwood Hollow could cure. Grief touched every corner of the homestead. Oliver grew more withdrawn, channeling his sorrow into the demands of orchard maintenance. The orchard itself faltered under repeated droughts, producing only a fraction of its original yield, yet he refused to abandon it. In the evenings, he sat on the cabin's stoop, gazing at the fading light. Rosalind sometimes joined him, and in those moments he might share a rare recollection of his scouting days or quietly mention that survival on the frontier required determination beyond anything found in books. Over time, Rosalind's curiosity led her to handle her father's firearms under his cautious supervision. By her early teenage years, she could load and fire a rifle with careful precision, matching a focus that seemed beyond her years. Oliver did not applaud or encourage with celebratory words. He simply observed that skill ought to serve a purpose higher than pride. This mindset merged seamlessly with the stoic values she absorbed from living in a harsh environment. She learned to respect the land's unpredictability and to understand the delicate balance between people's hopes and the rugged conditions that often crushed those hopes. Redwood Hollow was no place for illusions. As the seasons advanced, the settlement itself underwent changes. A handful of traders set up temporary posts, a small saloon drew itinerant ranch hands and travelers, and rumors of untapped silver veins in the nearby hills lured fortune seekers. Most left disappointed, having either found no trace of valuable ore or encountered difficulties they had not anticipated. The few who stayed contributed to the slow expansion of Redwood Hollow, though it never quite outgrew the aura of a remote outpost perched at the edge of wilderness. A rudimentary schoolhouse was established, along with a communal well and a dilapidated stable for visitors. Near the time Rosalind reached her late teens, the region's fragile peace came under threat from roving bands of outlaws. These groups took advantage of the minimal law enforcement presence, ambushing supply wagons and occasionally robbing travelers on the roads. Local ranchers tried to band together in improvised patrols, but their efforts were inconsistent. The sheriff assigned to Redwood Hollow, Emmett Tolliver, was a decent man with strong convictions but limited resources. He had 1 or 2 deputies at his disposal, and they were barely equipped to handle more than petty theft or the occasional saloon brawl. Stories began to circulate about a rising gang known as the Braxton Raiders, a collection of ruthless individuals rumored to be led by a figure who called himself Luther Braxton. The details of his background remained unclear, though some claimed he was once part of a larger outlaw confederation that had fractured. Others whispered that he had a personal grudge against Redwood Hollow for reasons unknown. While those rumors simmered, life at the Pierce homestead continued in steady isolation. Rosalind grew tall and strong, inheriting her father's steady gaze and a preference for deliberate speech. The orchard continued its struggle, yielding barely enough to justify Oliver's unwavering loyalty. The man himself aged noticeably, his once black hair graying at the temples, and the rifle that used to hang above the mantel began to see less frequent use. Yet he remained mindful of the persistent rumors about the Braxton Raiders and what might happen if they ever drifted into Redwood Hollow. He kept a small stockpile of ammunition in a locked trunk, quietly checking it from time to time. He also made sure his daughter understood that if danger ever arrived, speed and accuracy would be her greatest allies. One early autumn evening, Oliver decided to ride into town for a rare gathering that concerned the settlers. Word had spread that an influx of travelers had been attacked along the main road leading into Redwood Hollow, prompting the sheriff to host a public forum at the schoolhouse to discuss how best to defend the region. Rosalind remained at the homestead, attending to chores and feeding the horses. A sense of unease clung to her as she recalled the last time her father had looked that concerned. She occupied herself by stacking firewood, trying to keep her mind off potential calamities. Night settled in, and she paced the cabin, waiting for him to return. Eventually, Oliver came home with a subdued expression, explaining in clipped statements that the danger from outlaws seemed to be growing. The sheriff had called for volunteer patrols, but few individuals felt confident in taking up arms against a potentially large and organized gang. Rosalind grasped the significance behind her father's terse manner. It was one thing to fend off the occasional horse thief, quite another to oppose a cohesive group known for its cruelty. The meeting in town had evidently ended without a clear plan, leaving Redwood Hollow more vulnerable than ever. Over the following weeks, more unsettling news arrived in scattered fragments. A rancher reported that unknown riders had been spotted circling his property at dusk. A traveling tinsmith mentioned that he had passed a small canyon strewn with bullet casings, though he had seen no sign of who might have fired the shots. A blacksmith's apprentice claimed the Braxton Raiders were behind a series of thefts from stagecoaches in the adjacent territory. All of this fueled quiet dread. Redwood Hollow lacked the manpower to mount any real defense, and the existing patrols accomplished little aside from reassuring a handful of fearful residents. In the midst of this uncertainty, Rosalind found herself wandering the orchard one evening, watching the last rays of sunlight dance among the branches. She held her father's rifle, analyzing its weight and recalling all the small adjustments he had taught her. How to shift her stance to match the wind, how to exhale steadily before pulling the trigger, and how to keep her emotions from clouding her aim. She had fired that rifle countless times at inanimate targets. A line of battered tin cans, a distant post near the creek, or a stack of hay bales. Yet, she had never turned it against a real threat, though she suspected that circumstance might change if the Braxton Raiders continued their approach. Oliver's health began to show signs of decline, likely from years of hard labor under relentless sun and inadequate medical care. He rarely discussed any ailments, but Rosalind noticed subtle shifts, the way he occasionally clutched his side after strenuous activity, or how he would pause to catch his breath while tending to the horses. She stepped in to shoulder more responsibilities. With each passing week, it became clear that the orchard, the cabin, and their livestock required extra vigilance. It weighed on her that she might soon bear the primary burden of protecting the homestead if serious danger emerged. Amid these personal concerns, rumors of direct sightings of the Braxton Raiders near Redwood Hollow increased. Some merchants decided to pack their belongings and leave, hoping to find safer territory. Others hunkered down, praying that the gang would bypass this small settlement. The sheriff urged local ranchers to keep their valuables hidden, but he lacked any structured plan to counter a concerted assault. Tension mounted in the town's saloon, where visiting travelers offered conflicting stories. One insisted that Luther Braxton commanded over 30 men, armed with stolen military-grade rifles, while another suggested the group was smaller but possessed cunning strategies involving decoys and nighttime raids. In either scenario, Redwood Hollow remained ill-prepared. Eventually, an incident jolted the townsfolk from their indecision. A small convoy transporting mining equipment along the dusty road into Redwood Hollow was ambushed. The driver managed to escape with minor injuries, but several pieces of valuable machinery were seized or destroyed. The sheriff found limited clues at the site of the attack, only scattered footprints, a few empty shell casings, and footprints indicating that the assailants had driven stolen wagons off toward the foothills. The identity of the attackers remained unconfirmed, yet nearly everyone assumed the Braxton Raiders bore responsibility. News of the convoy raid spread rapidly, spurring some of Redwood Hollow's more resolute residents to call for collective action. Yet mistrust abounded, as some ranchers suspected others of hoarding supplies or refusing to help with general defense. Volunteer patrols plagued by disorganization disbanded almost as soon as they formed. In short order, the settlement found itself split between those who wanted to stand and fight, those who preferred to flee, and those who continued to hope that the threat would fade on its own. In the middle of that swirling uncertainty, Oliver realized that his failing strength might prevent him from defending his property if hostilities erupted. Although he remained reluctant to make a public show, he recognized that Rosalind's skills could play a critical role in protecting the homestead. He quietly handed her a small iron key to the locked trunk containing the extra ammunition and other gear, indicating that he trusted her judgment. She accepted the key with a mixture of solemn pride and apprehension. She knew that once she stepped forward, even quietly, her life and reputation in Redwood Hollow would be irrevocably changed. Night after night, she honed her marksmanship at the edge of the orchard. She hung small targets on the withered trees, pushing herself to aim more precisely in low light. The pop of gunfire echoed across the valley at intervals, though it was unclear whether those sounds came from distant skirmishes or other landowners engaged in their own practice sessions. Occasionally, she noticed faint lights or campfires flickering far off near rocky outcrops, and she wondered if the Braxton Raiders were establishing hidden camps. The repeated sightings of suspicious figures surveying the roads only reinforced her suspicion that a larger event was looming. One evening, an exhausted ranch hand knocked on the Pierce's door, having spotted the homestead's lantern glow from a distance. He warned of a small band of riders creeping through properties near the creek, possibly scouting for weaknesses. Rosalind's father listened intently, though he did not volunteer information about his daughter's abilities. Instead, he encouraged the ranch hand to keep moving toward town to sound a broader alarm, if needed. When the ranch hand departed, Oliver turned to his daughter, his expression grave. He admitted that the outlaws might strike in multiple locations, hoping to overwhelm the sparse defenses. Rosalind took in his words silently, acknowledging that Redwood Hollow's scattered inhabitants could hardly coordinate a unified response. A night passed without any visible attack, but the weight of imminent danger hung in the air. In town, the saloon buzzed with rumors that Luther Braxton had been spotted on the main road, exchanging heated words with two travelers. The travelers had allegedly fled, leaving behind any cargo they had. No one could verify the details, Yet fear took root in the hearts of many. People began to speak of barricading themselves in their homes, while others planned to gather at the schoolhouse if an alarm sounded. Through it all, the sheriff and his deputies were reduced to reactive measures, investigating claims that were difficult to prove and trying to reassure residents who had few reasons to remain hopeful. Meanwhile, Oliver's health took a turn for the worse. He was often confined to bed, leaving Rosalind to manage the orchard and livestock alone. She divided her time between daily chores and quiet drills with the rifle, practicing under every possible condition: early morning light, windy afternoons, twilight shadows. Occasionally she found boot tracks or hoof prints near the homestead, suggesting that strangers had approached. Yet there was no direct confrontation. She surmised that potential attackers might have realized the orchard provided minimal valuables to loot, or perhaps they had recognized signs indicating an armed occupant. Regardless, she felt the strain of solitude growing heavier. At the same time, a trickle of travelers reported that several small ranches in outlying areas had already been robbed, some residents assaulted or driven off their land. None of these events had occurred close enough to Redwood Hollow to rouse a full-scale panic, but the pattern of infiltration was clear. Those who studied the map concluded that the Braxton Raiders were expanding their reach in a calculated manner, wearing down smaller settlements before descending on a central location. Some observers guessed that Redwood Hollow, being the region's primary settlement, would inevitably become the main target. This realization weighed on Rosalind, awakening a conviction that if such an attack materialized, the settlement's sparse defenses could never hope to repel it on their own. The orchard, even if it lacked prized possessions, represented her home and all that remained of her family's legacy. She resolved inwardly to defend it in ways that few in Redwood Hollow would expect. If her father's body had grown frail, his teachings in marksmanship and strategy endured within her. Though she was not known to the town as anything more than a capable orchard hand and caretaker, that anonymity could prove advantageous. Events came to a head one crisp morning when the neighbor from a distant ranch arrived at the Pierce homestead, explaining that he had spotted a cluster of mounted figures near a canyon about 2 miles to the north. He suspected they were setting up a camp or vantage point to observe the valley. He worried that a strike might be imminent, targeting either the ranches or the settlement itself. The neighbor intended to ride to Redwood Hollow's sheriff to warn him directly, urging the formation of a posse. Before leaving, he cast an uneasy glance at the orchard, as though uncertain whether Oliver or Rosalind possessed the means to stave off an attack. He did not articulate his doubts, but the concern in his eyes spoke volumes. Once the neighbor departed, Rosalind gathered her courage and prepared for the worst. She inventoried the trunk of ammunition, verifying that she had enough cartridges. She examined the few vantage points around the property: a low rise near the orchard's southern edge, a spot of higher ground behind the cabin, and the barn's hayloft, which overlooked the approach from the main trail.
She examined the few vantage points around the property.
She laid out a plan in her mind,
a low
considering
rise
how
near the
best to
orchard's southern
respond
edge,
if riders
a spot
appeared.
of higher ground behind the cabin,
orchard's scattered
and the barn's
trees offered
hayloft,
partial
which
cover,
overlooked
but they
the
also
approach from
obscured
the main
lines of
trail.
sight.
She laid out
realized
a
she
plan
might
in
have
her
to draw
mind,
attackers
considering
in,
how
taking
best to
advantage of her
respond if riders
familiarity with the
appeared.
terrain. That
The
day
orchard's
stretched
scattered
into
trees
evening
offered
without
partial
incident.
cover, but they
Yet she
also
hardly
obscured
slept,
lines of sight.
expecting that at any
She
moment the
realized
sound
she
of
might have to
galloping
draw
hooves or
attackers in,
gunshots might
taking
shatter the
advantage of her
tranquility.
familiarity with the terrain.
She gripped the rifle,
That
recalling
day
how her
stretched into
father had
evening
once
without
described the
incident.
calm before a storm
Yet she
as
hardly
being
slept,
both unnerving and
expecting that at
strangely
any moment the
clarifying.
sound of galloping hooves
In that
or
hush,
gunshots
the
might
world
shatter the
seemed to
tranquility.
narrow to a single priority:
She gripped the rifle,
survival against
recalling how her
unknown
father
but
had
pressing
once
forces.
described the calm before a
She
storm as
recognized
being
that the
both
next dawn
unnerving
might
and
herald a
strangely
showdown,
clarifying.
not just for the
In
orchard
that
but
hush,
for
the
Redwood Hollow
world seemed
at
to
large.
narrow to a single
The orchard's
priority:
fruit might be
survival
sparse,
against
its
unknown
land
but
meager,
pressing forces.
but it was her entire world.
She recognized that the next dawn
She
might
prepared to
herald a
face whatever
showdown,
would come
not
from the
just for
dusty
the orchard,
roads and the
but for
canyon
Redwood
beyond
Hollow
the
at large.
settlement, uncertain
The
whether
orchard's
others
fruit
would
might
stand
be
with
sparse,
her or if
its
she would
land
confront
meager,
the threat
but it was her
alone.
entire
The
world.
valley known as Redwood
She
Hollow
prepared
lay
to face
nestled
whatever
between
would
two
come from the
imposing
dusty
mountain
roads and
ranges
the
that
canyon
cast
beyond
long
the settlement,
shadows across the
uncertain
scrubland.
whether others would stand
Sparse
with her or if she
vegetation
would
clung
confront
to
the
the
threat
rocky
alone.
soil, and only
The
the
valley
hardiest
known as
pines and
Redwood Hollow
junipers
lay
thrived
nestled
in the
between
thin
two
air.
imposing mountain
At
ranges that
sunrise,
cast
the
long
ridges
shadows
appeared
across the
bathed in a
scrubland.
subtle orange glow,
Sparse
yet that fleeting
vegetation
beauty
clung to
often
the
gave
rocky
way to a
soil,
harsh
and only
midday
the
glare
hardiest
that
pines
tested the
and
resilience
junipers
of every
thrived in the
living
thin
creature.
air.
The settlement
sunrise,
within Redwood
the
Hollow
ridges
itself
appeared
consisted
bathed
of
in
a
a subtle
dusty main
orange glow,
street lined
yet
by
that fleeting
rough-hewn
beauty
wooden
often gave way
structures.
to a harsh
A
midday
handful of
glare that
ranches
tested the
spread
resilience
outward,
of every
each
living
anchored
creature.
by weather-beaten cabins,
The settlement within
half-collapsed
Redwood Hollow
barns, and
itself
fence
consisted
lines
of a
in
dusty
various
main
states of
street
repair.
lined by rough-hewn
Many years
wooden
before the
structures.
events at hand, a
A
man named
handful of
Oliver
ranches
Pierce had
spread
made a
outward,
name for
each
himself
anchored
by
by
crossing this
weather-beaten
region as a
cabins,
scout in
half-collapsed
service of
barns,
a distant
and fence
cavalry
lines in
unit.
various states of repair.
He was known to have an uncanny
Many
sense
years
of
before
direction,
the events at
an
hand,
ability to
a
read
man
the
named
land's
Oliver
subtle
Pierce had made a
signs,
name
and a
for
remarkable
himself by
gift for
crossing this region
marksmanship
as a
that
scout
saved
in
him and
service
his
of a
fellow
distant
riders more than
cavalry unit.
once.
He was
Locals
known
who
to have an
encountered him
uncanny
during
sense
those
of
days
direction,
tended to
an
recall
ability
his
to read the
calm
land's
demeanor
subtle
and the
signs,
unwavering
and a
discipline
remarkable
with
gift
which he
for
treated
marksmanship that
firearms.
saved him and his fellow
After the
riders more than
conflict in
once.
which he had served reached its
Locals who
conclusion,
encountered him
he
during those
drifted through
days
small
tended to recall
towns,
his calm
occasionally
demeanor
hired
and
as
the
a
unwavering
guard for
discipline
merchant
with which he
wagons.
treated firearms.
Eventually, he settled
After the
near Redwood
conflict in
Hollow,
which he had
where
served
he built a
reached its
modest
conclusion,
homestead at the
he
base of
drifted
a
through
gently
small
sloping
towns,
hill.
occasionally hired
The
as a
soil there
guard
was
for
poor,
merchant
but a
wagons.
narrow creek provided at least
Eventually,
some
he
water,
settled near
and a small
Redwood
orchard
Hollow,
of fruit
where he built
trees
a
hinted
modest
at better
homestead at
times
the
to
base
come.
of a gently
Oliver
sloping
kept
hill.
his personal history to
The soil
himself.
there was poor, but a
Townsfolk
narrow
regarded
creek
him as a
provided at
polite
least
but
some
reserved
water,
figure
and a
who
small
traveled to
orchard
the
of fruit
settlement
trees
only
hinted
for
at better
essential
times to
supplies.
come.
He married
Oliver
a local
kept his
woman who
personal
shared his
history to
preference for
himself.
quiet routines, and
Townsfolk
together
regarded
they
him as a
tended the
polite
orchard
but
as best
reserved
they
figure
could.
who traveled to the
Over
settlement
the
only
years,
for
they
essential
cultivated
supplies.
a patch of crops that
He
struggled
married a
against
local
the
woman
rocky
who
terrain.
shared his preference for quiet
When the couple's
routines,
daughter,
and
Rosalind
together,
Pierce,
they
was
tended the
born,
orchard as
the
best
orchard
they
was
could.
still young, and the
Over the
homestead
years,
looked more
they
like a hastily
cultivated a patch
assembled
of
set of
crops that
boards than a
struggled
final
against the
dwelling.
rocky terrain.
Despite the
When the couple's
difficulties,
daughter,
Oliver and his wife
Rosalind Pierce,
persevered,
was born,
finding
the
small
orchard was
joys in the
still
life
young,
they built.
and the
As
homestead
the
looked
daughter
more
grew,
like a
she
hastily
absorbed her
assembled set
father's
of boards
attitude
than a
toward
final dwelling.
firearms, though he never
Despite
formally
the
pressed lessons
difficulties,
upon her.
Oliver and his
Instead,
wife persevered,
she observed him
finding small
carefully.
joys in the life
On
they
certain
built.
afternoons, he would aim at
As the
distant
daughter
fence
grew,
posts,
she absorbed
testing
her
his
father's
accuracy
attitude
against the
toward
wind's
firearms,
unpredictable
though he never
gusts.
formally pressed lessons
At
upon
other
her.
times, he would check the
Instead,
condition of his
she
long
observed him
rifle with
carefully.
meticulous attention.
On certain afternoons,
The child
he
developed
would
an
aim at
early
distant fence
fascination with the
posts,
mechanics
testing
of
his
aiming and
accuracy against the
controlling
wind's
one's breath,
unpredictable gusts.
quietly practicing with a
At
small
other
wooden
times,
replica
he would
her
check the
father
condition of
carved
his
for
long
her.
rifle with
If
meticulous
she happened to
attention.
catch him in a reflective
The child
mood,
developed an
he would
early
gesture toward
fascination with the
nearby
mechanics
ridges,
of aiming and
explaining
controlling
how
one's
wind
breath,
patterns
quietly
shifted in the
practicing with a
canyon,
small
or
wooden
how the
replica her
angle of
father
sunlight
carved for her.
influenced depth
If she
perception.
happened to catch him in a
Those
reflective
lessons were
mood,
offered
he
sparingly,
would gesture
yet
toward
they
nearby
sank deep
ridges,
into her
explaining
consciousness.
how wind
A few
patterns
years after
shifted in the
Rosalind's
canyons
birth,
or how
her
the
mother
angle of
succumbed to a
sunlight
lingering
influenced
illness
depth
that no
perception.
doctor in Redwood Hollow
Those
could
lessons
cure.
were offered sparingly,
Grief
yet they
touched
sank
every
deep into
corner
her
of the
consciousness.
homestead. Oliver
A few
grew more
years after
withdrawn,
Rosalind's birth,
channeling his
her mother
sorrow into the
succumbed to a
demands of
lingering
orchard
illness that
maintenance.
no doctor in Redwood
The
Hollow
orchard
could
itself
cure.
faltered under repeated
Grief
droughts,
touched every corner
producing
of the
only a
homestead.
fraction of its original
Oliver
yield,
grew more
yet he
withdrawn,
refused to
channeling
abandon
his
it.
sorrow into the
In
demands
the
of orchard
evenings,
maintenance.
he sat on the cabin
The
stoop,
orchard itself
gazing at
faltered
the
under
fading
repeated
light.
droughts, producing
Rosalind
only a
sometimes
fraction of its
joined him,
original yield,
and in those
yet he
moments he might
refused to
share a rare
abandon it.
recollection of his
In the
scouting
evenings,
days,
he
or
sat on the
quietly
cabin
mention that
stoop,
survival on the
gazing at the
frontier
fading light.
required determination beyond
Rosalind
anything
sometimes
found in
joined him,
books.
and in
Over
those
time,
moments, he might
Rosalind's
share a rare
curiosity led her to
recollection of his
handle her
scouting
father's
days or
firearms
quietly
under his
mention that
cautious
survival on the
supervision.
frontier required
By her early
determination
teenage
beyond
years,
anything found
she could
in
load
books.
and fire a rifle
Over
with careful
time,
precision,
Rosalind's
matching a
curiosity
focus
led
that
her to
seemed
handle her
beyond her
father's
years.
firearms under his cautious
Oliver did not
supervision.
applaud or encourage
By
with
her early
celebratory
teenage
words.
years,
He
she
simply
could load and
observed that
fire a
skill ought
rifle
to
with
serve a
careful
purpose
precision,
higher than
matching a
pride.
focus that seemed beyond
This
her
mindset
years.
merged seamlessly
Oliver
with the
did not
stoic
applaud
values
or
she
encourage
absorbed
with
from living in a
celebratory
harsh
words.
environment.
He simply observed
She
that
learned to
skill ought to
respect the
serve a
land's
purpose higher than
unpredictability
pride.
and to understand
This
the delicate
mindset
balance
merged
between people's
seamlessly with the
hopes
stoic
and the rugged
values she
conditions
absorbed
that
from
often
living in a
crushed
harsh
those hopes.
environment.
Redwood
She
Hollow
learned to
was no
respect
place
the
for
land's
illusions.
unpredictability
As the
and to
seasons
understand
advanced,
the delicate
the
balance
settlement
between
itself
people's
underwent
hopes and
changes.
rugged conditions
A
that
handful
often
of
crushed
traders
those
set up
hopes.
temporary posts. A
Redwood
small
Hollow
saloon
was
drew
no place
itinerant
for
ranch
illusions.
hands and travelers,
As the
and rumors
seasons
of untapped
advanced,
silver
the settlement
veins in the
itself
nearby
underwent
hills
changes.
lured fortune seekers.
A handful of
Most
traders
left
set up temporary
disappointed,
posts.
having either
A
found
small
no trace
saloon
of
drew
valuable
itinerant
ore
ranch
or
hands
encountered
and travelers,
difficulties they
and
had not
rumors of
anticipated.
untapped silver veins in the
The few
nearby
who
hills
stayed
lured
contributed to
fortune
the
seekers.
slow expansion of Redwood
Most
Hollow,
left disappointed,
though it never
having
quite
either
outgrew
found
the
no
aura
trace
of a
of
remote
valuable ore or
outpost
encountered
perched at the edge of
difficulties they had
wilderness.
not anticipated.
A rudimentary
The
schoolhouse
few
was
who stayed
established,
contributed to the
along with a
slow
communal
expansion of
well
Redwood
and a
Hollow,
dilapidated
though it
stable
never
for
quite
visitors.
outgrew the
Near
aura
the
of a
time
remote
Rosalind
outpost
reached her
perched
late
at the edge of
teens,
wilderness.
the region's fragile
A
peace came under
rudimentary
threat from
schoolhouse was
roving bands of
established,
outlaws.
along with a communal well
These
and a
groups took
dilapidated
advantage of
stable
the
for
minimal
visitors.
law enforcement presence,
Near the
ambushing
time
supply
Rosalind reached
wagons
her
and
late
occasionally
teens,
robbing
the region's
travelers on the
fragile peace
roads.
came under
Local
threat from
ranchers
roving
tried to
bands
band
of
together
outlaws.
and improvise patrols,
These
but their
groups took
efforts were
advantage of the minimal
inconsistent.
law enforcement
The
presence,
sheriff assigned to
ambushing
Redwood
supply
Hollow,
wagons and
Emmett Tolliver,
occasionally
was
robbing
a decent
travelers on the
man with
roads.
strong convictions but
Local
limited
ranchers
resources.
tried to band
He
together
had
in
one or two
improvised
deputies at his
patrols,
disposal,
but
and they
their
were
efforts
barely
were
equipped to
inconsistent.
handle more than petty
The
theft
sheriff
or the
assigned to
occasional
Redwood
saloon
Hollow,
brawl.
Emmett Tolliver,
Stories
was a
began to
decent man with
circulate about
strong
a rising
convictions
gang
but
known
limited
as the Braxton
resources.
Raiders, a
He had
collection
one
of
or two
ruthless
deputies at
individuals
his
rumored to be
disposal,
led by
and
a
they were
figure who
barely
called
equipped to
himself
handle more
Luther
than petty
Braxton.
theft or the
The
occasional saloon
details of his
brawl.
background remained unclear,
Stories began to
though some
circulate about a
claimed he was
rising
once
gang
part of a
known as the
larger
Braxton
outlaw
Raiders,
confederation
a
that had
collection of
fractured.
ruthless individuals
Others
rumored to
whispered
be
that he
led
had
by
a
a
personal
figure who
grudge
called
against
himself
Redwood
Luther
Hollow
Braxton.
for reasons unknown.
The details
While
of his
those rumors
background
simmered,
remained
life
unclear,
at the Pierce
though some
homestead
claimed he was
continued in
once part of
steady
a larger
isolation.
outlaw confederation that had
Rosalind grew
fractured.
tall and strong,
Others whispered that
inheriting
he
her
had a
father's
personal
steady
grudge
gaze
against
and a
Redwood
preference
Hollow
for
for
deliberate
reasons
speech.
unknown.
The
While
orchard
those
continued
rumors
its
simmered,
struggle,
life at the
yielding
Pierce
barely
homestead
enough to
continued in
justify
steady
Oliver's
isolation.
unwavering loyalty.
Rosalind
The
grew
man
tall and
himself
strong,
aged noticeably,
inheriting her
his
father's
once
steady
black
gaze
hair
and a
graying at the
preference for
temples,
deliberate speech.
and the rifle that used to hang
The
above the
orchard
mantle
continued
began
its
to see
struggle,
less frequent
yielding
use.
barely enough to
Yet
justify
he remained
Oliver's
mindful of
unwavering
the
loyalty.
persistent rumors about the
The man
Braxton
himself
Raiders
aged
and what
noticeably,
might happen
his
if they
once
ever
black hair
drifted into
graying at the
Redwood
temples,
Hollow.
and the rifle
He kept
that
a
used to
small
hang above the
stockpile of
mantle began to see
ammunition in a
less
locked
frequent
trunk,
use.
quietly checking
Yet
it
he
from
remained
time to
mindful
time.
of the persistent
He
rumors
also made
about the
sure his
Braxton
daughter
Raiders
understood
and what
that if
might
danger
happen if
ever
they ever
arrived,
drifted into
speed and
Redwood Hollow.
accuracy would be her greatest
He
allies.
kept a small
One
stockpile
early
of
autumn
ammunition
evening,
in a locked
Oliver
trunk,
decided to ride
quietly
into
checking
town
it
for
from
a
time to
rare
time.
gathering that concerned
He
the
also made
settlers.
sure his daughter
Word
understood
had
that if
spread
danger
that an
ever
influx of
arrived,
travelers
speed
had been
and
attacked
accuracy
along the
would be
main
her
road
greatest
leading into
allies.
Redwood Hollow,
One
prompting
early
the
autumn
sheriff
evening,
to host a
Oliver
public
decided
forum at
to
the
ride into
schoolhouse
town
to
for a
discuss
rare
how best
gathering
to
that
defend the
concerned the
region.
settlers.
Rosalind
Word had
remained at the
spread that an
homestead,
influx of
attending to
travelers had been
chores and
attacked
feeding
along
the
the main
horses.
road leading into
A
Redwood
sense of
Hollow,
unease
prompting
clung
the
to her
sheriff
as she
to host a
recalled the
public
last time
forum
her
at the
father had
schoolhouse
looked
to
that
discuss how
concerned.
best to defend
She
the region.
occupied herself by stacking
Rosalind
firewood,
remained at the
trying to
homestead,
keep her mind
attending
off
to
potential
chores and feeding
calamities.
the horses.
Night settled in,
A sense of
and she
unease
paced the
clung to
cabin,
her as she
waiting for
recalled the
him to
last time
return.
her father had
Eventually,
looked that
Oliver
concerned.
came home with a subdued
She
expression,
occupied herself by
explaining in
stacking
clipped
firewood,
statements that the
trying to
danger
keep her
from
mind off
outlaws seemed to be
potential
growing.
calamities.
The
Night
sheriff had
settled
called
in,
for
and she
volunteer
paced the
patrols,
cabin,
but few
waiting for him to
individuals felt
return.
confident in taking up arms
Eventually,
against a
Oliver
potentially
came home with
large
a
and
subdued
organized
expression,
gang.
explaining in clipped
Rosalind
statements that
grasped
the
the
danger from
significance
outlaws
behind her
seemed to be
father's
growing.
terse manner.
The sheriff
It
had
was
called
one
for
thing to
volunteer
fend off the
patrols,
occasional
but
horse
few
thief,
individuals felt
quite another
confident
to
in taking
oppose a
up arms
cohesive
against a
group known
potentially
for its
large and
cruelty.
organized gang.
The meeting in town
Rosalind
had evidently
grasped the
ended without a clear
significance behind
plan,
her father's
leaving
terse
Redwood
manner.
Hollow more vulnerable than
It
ever.
was one thing
Over
to
the
fend off
following
the
weeks,
occasional
more
horse thief,
unsettling
quite
news
another
arrived
to
in
oppose a
scattered
cohesive
fragments.
group known for its
A
cruelty.
rancher reported that
The
unknown
meeting in
riders had
town
been
had
spotted
evidently
circling
ended
his
without a
property
clear
at
plan,
dusk.
leaving Redwood
A
Hollow
traveling
more vulnerable
tinsmith
than
mentioned
ever.
that he had passed a small
Over the
canyon
following
strewn
weeks,
with bullet
more
casings,
unsettling
though
news
he had
arrived
seen
in
no
scattered
sign of who might have
fragments.
fired the shots.
A rancher reported
A
that
blacksmith's
unknown
apprentice
riders had been
claimed the
spotted
Braxton
circling his
Raiders were
property at
behind a
dusk.
series of thefts from
A traveling
stagecoaches in the
tinsmith
adjacent
mentioned that he had
territory.
passed a small
All
canyon
of this
strewn with
fueled
bullet
quiet
casings,
dread.
though he had seen no
Redwood
sign of
Hollow
who might
lacked
have
the
fired the
manpower to
shots.
mount any real
A
defense,
blacksmith's
and the existing
apprentice claimed the
patrols
Braxton
accomplished
Raiders
little
were behind
aside
a
from
series of
reassuring a
thefts from
handful of fearful
stagecoaches in the
residents.
adjacent
In the midst
territory.
of this uncertainty,
All of this
Rosalind
fueled
found
quiet
herself
dread.
wandering the orchard one
Redwood
evening,
Hollow
watching
lacked
the
the
last
manpower
rays
to
of
mount any
sunlight
real
dance among
defense,
the branches.
and the existing patrols
She held her
accomplished little
father's
aside
rifle,
from reassuring a
analyzing its
handful of
weight
fearful
and
residents.
recalling all the small
In the
adjustments
midst
he
of
had
this
taught her.
uncertainty,
How to shift her
Rosalind
stance
found
to
herself
match the
wandering
wind,
the orchard one
how to
evening,
exhale steadily
watching the
before
last
pulling the
rays of
trigger,
sunlight
and how
dance
to keep
among
her
the
emotions
branches.
from clouding her aim.
She held her father's
She had
rifle,
fired that rifle
analyzing its
countless
weight and
times at
recalling all the
inanimate
small
targets.
adjustments he had
A
taught
line
her,
of battered
how to
tin
shift her
cans,
stance to
a
match
distant
the
post
wind,
near the
how
creek,
to exhale
or a stack
steadily
of hay
before
bales.
pulling the trigger, and
Yet
how
she
to
had
keep
never
her
turned it
emotions from
against a
clouding
real
her
threat,
aim.
though she
She
suspected
had
that
fired that
circumstance
rifle
might
countless
change if
times
the
at
Braxton
inanimate
Raiders
targets,
continued
a
their
line of
approach.
battered tin
Oliver's
cans,
health
a
began to show
distant post
signs of
near the
decline,
or a
likely
stack
from
of hay
years of
bales.
hard labor under
Yet
relentless
she had
sun
never
and
turned it
inadequate
against a
medical
real threat,
care.
though she
He
suspected
rarely
that
discussed any
circumstance might
ailments,
change if the
but
Braxton
Rosalind
Raiders
noticed
continued
subtle
their
shifts.
approach.
The way he
Oliver's
occasionally
health
clutched
began
his
to show
side after
signs of
strenuous
decline,
activity,
likely from years
or how
of
he
hard
would
labor
pause to
under
catch his
relentless
breath while
sun and
tending to the
inadequate medical
horses.
care.
She stepped in to
He
shoulder
rarely
more
discussed any
responsibilities.
ailments, but Rosalind
With each
noticed
passing
subtle
week,
shifts,
it became
the
clear
way
that
he
the orchard,
occasionally
the
clutched his
cabin,
side
and their
after strenuous
livestock
activity,
required extra
or how he would
vigilance.
pause to catch his
It
breath
weighed on
while
her
tending
that she
to the
might soon
horses.
bear the primary burden
She
of
stepped in to
protecting the
shoulder more
homestead if serious
responsibilities.
danger emerged.
With
Amid these
each passing
personal
week,
concerns,
it became
rumors
clear
of
that the
direct
orchard,
sightings
the
of the
cabin,
Braxton
and their
Raiders near
livestock
Redwood
required
Hollow
extra
increased.
vigilance.
Some merchants
It weighed
decided
on
to
her
pack
that
their
she might
belongings
soon
and
bear the
leave,
primary
hoping
burden
to
of
find
protecting
safer
the homestead
territory.
if serious danger
Others hunkered
emerged.
down, praying that the
Amid
gang
these
would
personal
bypass
concerns,
this small
rumors
settlement.
of direct sightings
The
of the
sheriff
Braxton
urged
Raiders
local
near
ranchers
Redwood
to
Hollow
keep their
increased.
valuables hidden, but
Some
he lacked
merchants
any
decided to
structured
pack their
plan to
belongings
counter a
and leave,
concerted
hoping
assault.
to find safer
Tension
territory.
mounted in the town's saloon,
Others hunkered
where
down,
visiting
praying that
travelers
the gang
offered
would
conflicting
bypass this small
stories.
settlement.
One
The
insisted that
sheriff
Luther
urged local
Braxton
ranchers
commanded
to
over
keep their
30 men,
valuables hidden,
armed
but
with
he lacked
stolen
any structured
military-grade
plan to counter
rifles,
a concerted
while
assault.
another suggested the group was
Tension
smaller
mounted in
but
the town's
possessed cunning
saloon, where
strategies
visiting
involving
travelers
decoys
offered
and
conflicting
nighttime
stories.
raids.
One
In either
insisted that Luther
scenario,
Braxton
Redwood Hollow
commanded over
remained
30 men,
ill-prepared.
armed with
Eventually,
stolen
an
military-grade
incident
rifles,
jolted the
while
townsfolk
another
from their
suggested the
indecision.
group was smaller
A
but
small
possessed
convoy
cunning
transporting
strategies
mining
involving
equipment along
decoys
the
and
dusty
nighttime
road into
raids.
Redwood Hollow was
In
ambushed.
either scenario,
The driver
Redwood
managed to
Hollow
escape
remained
with minor
ill-prepared.
injuries, but several
Eventually,
pieces of
an
valuable
incident
machinery were
jolted the
seized or
townsfolk from their
destroyed.
indecision.
The sheriff found
A small
limited
convoy
clues at the site of
transporting
the
mining
attack,
equipment along
only
the
scattered
dusty road
footprints,
into
a few
Redwood Hollow
empty
was
shell
ambushed.
casings, and
The
footprints
driver
indicating
managed
that
to
the
escape with
assailants had
minor
driven
injuries,
stolen
but
wagons
several
off toward the
pieces of
foothills.
valuable machinery
The
were
identity of
seized
the
or
attackers
destroyed.
remained unconfirmed,
The sheriff
yet
found
nearly
limited
everyone
clues at the
assumed
site
the
of the
Braxton
attack,
Raiders bore
only scattered
responsibility.
footprints,
News
a
of the
few empty
convoy
shell
raid
casings,
spread
and
rapidly,
footprints
spurring some of
indicating that the
Redwood Hollow's
assailants had
more
driven
resolute
stolen
residents
wagons
to
off
call for
toward the
collective
foothills.
action.
The
Yet
identity
mistrust
of the
abounded,
attackers remained
as some ranchers
unconfirmed,
suspected
yet
others
nearly
of
everyone
hoarding
assumed the
supplies
Braxton
or
Raiders
refusing to
bore
help with general
responsibility.
defense.
News of the
Volunteer
convoy raid
patrols,
spread
plagued
rapidly,
by
spurring
disorganization,
some of Redwood Hollow's
disbanded
more
almost
resolute
as soon as
residents
they
to call
formed.
for collective
In
action.
short order, the
Yet
settlement found
mistrust
itself
abounded,
split
as
between
some
those who
ranchers
wanted to
suspected
stand and
others of
fight,
hoarding supplies
those who
or
preferred to
refusing to
flee,
help with
and
general
those who
defense.
continued to hope that the threat would
Volunteer
fade on its
patrols,
own.
plagued
In
by
the middle of that
disorganization,
swirling
disbanded
uncertainty,
almost as soon as they
Oliver
formed.
realized that his failing
In
strength
short
might
order,
prevent
the
him from
settlement
defending
found
his
itself
property
split
if
between those
hostilities
who wanted to
erupted.
stand and fight,
Although
those
he
who
remained
preferred to
reluctant
flee,
to make a
and
public
those who
show,
continued to hope
he
that the threat
recognized
would
that
fade on
Rosalind's
its own.
skills could play a
In the
critical
middle
role
of
in
that
protecting
swirling
the
uncertainty,
homestead.
Oliver
He
realized
quietly
that his
handed her
failing
a small
strength
iron
might
key
prevent
to
him
the
from
locked
defending
trunk
his property
containing
if
the extra
hostilities
ammunition
erupted.
and other gear,
Although he
indicating
remained
that he
reluctant
trusted
to
her
make a
judgment.
public show, he
She
recognized
accepted
that
the key with
Rosalind's
a mixture
skills
of
could play a
solemn
critical
pride and
role in
apprehension.
protecting the homestead.
She knew that once
He
she stepped
quietly handed
forward,
her a
even
small iron
quietly,
key to the
her
locked
life and
trunk
reputation
containing
in
the extra
Redwood Hollow
ammunition
would
and
be
other gear,
irrevocably
indicating
changed.
that he
Night
trusted
after
her
night,
judgment.
she honed her
She
marksmanship at
accepted
the
the
edge of
key
the
with a
orchard.
mixture of solemn
She
pride
hung
and
small
apprehension.
targets on the withered trees,
She knew that
pushing
once she
herself to
stepped
aim more
forward,
precisely
even
in
quietly,
low light.
her life and
The
reputation
pop of
in Redwood
gunfire
Hollow
echoed
would be
across the
irrevocably
valley at
changed.
intervals, though it was
Night
unclear
after
whether
night,
those sounds
she
came
honed her
from distant
marksmanship at the
skirmishes
edge
or
of the
other
orchard.
landowners engaged in
She
their
hung
own
small
practice
targets on
sessions.
the withered trees, pushing
Occasionally she
herself to
noticed
aim more
faint lights
precisely
or
in low light.
campfires flickering far
The
off
pop
near
of
rocky
gunfire echoed
outcrops,
across the
and
valley
she
at
wondered if the
intervals,
Braxton
though it was
Raiders were
unclear whether
establishing
those
hidden
sounds came
camps.
from distant
The repeated
skirmishes or other
sightings of
landowners
suspicious figures
engaged in their
surveying
own
the
practice
roads only
sessions.
reinforced her suspicion that a
Occasionally,
larger event
she
was
noticed
looming.
faint lights
One
or
evening,
campfires
an
flickering
exhausted
far
ranch
off near
hand
rocky
knocked on the
outcrops,
Pierce's door,
and she wondered
having
if the
spotted the
Braxton
homestead's
Raiders were
lantern
establishing
glow from a
hidden camps.
distance. He
The
warned of a
repeated
small
sightings
band
of
of riders
suspicious
creeping
figures
through
surveying the
properties
roads
near the
only
creek,
reinforced her
possibly
suspicion
scouting
that
for
a larger
weaknesses.
event was looming.
Rosalind's
One
father
evening,
listened
an
intently,
exhausted ranch
though he
hand
did not
knocked on the
volunteer
Pierce's door,
information about his
having
daughter's
spotted the
abilities.
homestead's lantern glow
Instead,
from a distance.
he encouraged the ranch
He
hand
warned
to
of a
keep
small
moving
band
toward
of
town
riders
to sound a
creeping through
broader
properties
alarm,
near the
if
creek,
needed.
possibly scouting
When
for
the ranch hand
weaknesses.
departed, Oliver turned to
Rosalind's
his
father
daughter,
listened
his
intently,
expression grave.
though he did not
He
volunteer
admitted that
information
the
about his
outlaws might
daughter's
strike
abilities.
in multiple locations,
Instead,
hoping to
he
overwhelm the
encouraged the
sparse
ranch hand to
defenses.
keep moving toward town
Rosalind
to sound
took in
a
his
broader
words
alarm,
silently,
if needed.
acknowledging that
When the
Redwood
ranch
Hollow's
hand
scattered
departed,
inhabitants could hardly coordinate
Oliver
a
turned to
unified
his daughter,
response.
his expression grave.
A night passed without any
He
visible
admitted that the
attack,
outlaws
but the
might
weight of
strike in
imminent
multiple
danger hung in
locations,
the air.
hoping to overwhelm
In
the sparse
town, the
defenses.
saloon buzzed with rumors
Rosalind
that Luther
took in his
Braxton had
words
been
silently,
spotted on the main
acknowledging
road,
that Redwood
exchanging
Hollow's
heated
scattered
words with two
inhabitants could hardly
travelers.
coordinate coordinate a
The
unified
travelers had
response.
allegedly fled,
A
leaving
night
behind
passed
any
without
cargo
any
they had.
visible attack,
No
but
one
the
could
weight of
verify
imminent
the
danger
details,
hung in the
yet
air.
fear took root in the
In
hearts of
town,
many.
the saloon buzzed
People
with
began
rumors
to
that
speak
Luther
of
Braxton
barricading
had been
themselves in
spotted
their
on the main
homes,
road,
while others
exchanging
planned to
heated
gather at
words
the
with two
schoolhouse if an
travelers.
alarm sounded.
The travelers had
Through it
allegedly
all,
fled,
the sheriff
leaving
and his
behind any
deputies were
cargo they
reduced to
had.
reactive measures,
No one could verify the
investigating
details,
claims that were
yet
difficult
fear
to
took root
prove
in
and
the
trying
hearts
to
of many.
reassure residents who had
People
few
began to
reasons
speak
to
of
remain
barricading
hopeful.
themselves in their
Meanwhile,
homes, while
Oliver's
others
health took
planned
a
to
turn
gather
for
at
the
the
worse.
schoolhouse if an
He was
alarm
often
sounded.
confined to bed,
Through it
leaving
all, the
Rosalind to
sheriff and
manage
his
the
deputies
orchard
were
and
reduced to
livestock
reactive
alone.
measures,
She
investigating
divided her
claims
time
that were
between
difficult
daily
to prove and
chores
trying
and
to
quiet
reassure
drills with the
residents who had
rifle,
few reasons to
practicing
remain
under
hopeful.
every possible condition.
Meanwhile,
Early
Oliver's
morning
health
light,
took a turn
windy
for the worse.
afternoons, twilight
He
shadows.
was often confined to bed,
Occasionally, she
leaving
found boot
Rosalind to
tracks or
manage the
hoof
orchard
prints
and
near the
livestock
homestead,
alone.
suggesting that
She divided
strangers
her
had
time
approached.
between daily chores
Yet
and
there was
quiet
no
drills
direct
with the rifle,
confrontation.
practicing under
She
every
surmised
possible
that
condition.
potential
Early
attackers
morning
might have
light,
realized
windy
the orchard
afternoons,
provided minimal
twilight
valuables
shadows.
to loot, or perhaps they had
Occasionally, she
recognized
found boot
signs
tracks or
indicating
hoof
an armed
prints near the
occupant.
homestead, suggesting that
Regardless,
strangers had
she felt the
approached.
strain of solitude
Yet
growing
there was
heavier.
no direct
At the same
confrontation.
time, a trickle of
She
travelers
surmised that
reported that
potential
several
attackers
small
might have
ranches in
realized the
outlying
orchard
areas had
provided
already
minimal
been
valuables
robbed,
to loot,
some
or
residents
perhaps they had
assaulted or
recognized
driven off
signs
their
indicating
land.
an armed occupant.
None of these events had occurred
Regardless,
close enough to
she
Redwood
felt the
Hollow
strain
to
of
rouse a
solitude
full-scale
growing
panic.
heavier.
But the pattern of
At the same
infiltration
time,
was clear.
a trickle of travelers
Those who
reported
studied the
that
map
several small
concluded that the
ranches in
Braxton
outlying
Raiders were
areas had
expanding
already
their
been
reach
robbed.
in a
Some
calculated
residents
manner,
assaulted or
wearing
driven
down
off their
smaller
land.
settlements before
None
descending
of
on a
these
central
events had
location.
occurred close enough to Redwood
Some
Hollow to
observers
rouse a
guessed that
full-scale
Redwood
panic,
Hollow,
but the
being
pattern
the
of
region's
infiltration
primary
was clear.
settlement, would inevitably
Those who
become the
studied the
main
map
target.
concluded that
This
the Braxton
realization
Raiders
weighed
were
on
expanding their
Rosalind,
reach in a
awakening a
calculated
conviction
manner,
that if
wearing
such an
down
attack
smaller settlements
materialized,
before
the
descending on a
settlement's sparse
central
defenses
location.
could never hope to repel
Some
it on their
observers
own.
guessed that Redwood Hollow,
The orchard,
being the region's
even if it
primary
lacked
settlement,
prized
would
possessions,
inevitably become the main
represented her
target.
home and all that
This
remained of her
realization
family's
weighed
legacy.
on Rosalind,
She
awakening a
resolved
conviction that
inwardly
if such an
to
attack
defend it in ways
materialized,
that few
the
in Redwood
settlement's
Hollow
sparse
would
defenses
expect.
could never hope to
If her
repel it on
father's
their
body
own.
had grown frail,
The orchard,
his teachings
even
in
if it lacked
marksmanship and
prized
strategy
possessions,
endured within
represented
her.
her home and all
Though
that
she was
remained of
not
her
known to the
family's
town
legacy.
as anything more than a
She
capable
resolved,
orchard hand and
inwardly,
caretaker,
to defend it in
that
ways that
anonymity
few
could
in
prove
Redwood Hollow would
advantageous.
expect.
Events came to a
If her
head one
father's
crisp
body had
morning
grown
when the neighbor
frail,
from a
his
distant
teachings
ranch
in
arrived at the
marksmanship and
Pierce
strategy
homestead,
endured within her.
explaining that he had spotted a
Though she was
cluster
not
of
known
mounted
to the
figures
town
near a
as anything
canyon
more
about
than a
2
capable
miles to the
orchard
north.
hand and caretaker,
He
that
suspected
anonymity
they were
could
setting
prove
up a camp or
advantageous.
vantage point to observe
Events
the
came to a
valley.
head one crisp
He
morning
worried that
when
a
a neighbor
strike
from a
might be
distant ranch
imminent,
arrived at the
targeting
Pierce
either the
homestead,
ranches or the
explaining that
settlement
he had spotted a
itself.
cluster of mounted
The
figures
neighbor
near a
intended to
canyon
ride to
about 2
Redwood
miles
Hollow
to the
Sheriff
north.
to warn him directly,
He suspected they
urging
were
the
setting up a
formation of a
camp or
posse.
vantage point to observe
Before
the valley.
leaving, he cast an
He
uneasy
worried that a
glance at
strike
the
might
orchard,
be imminent,
as though
targeting
uncertain
either the
whether
ranches
Oliver
or
or
the settlement
Rosalind
itself.
possessed the means to stave
The
off an
neighbor
attack.
intended to ride to
He
Redwood
did
Hollow
not
Sheriff
articulate
to
his
warn him
doubts,
directly,
but the
urging the
concern in his
formation of a
eyes
posse.
spoke volumes.
Before
Once the
leaving,
neighbor
he
departed,
cast an uneasy
Rosalind
glance
gathered
at
her
the
courage
orchard,
and
as
prepared
though
for the
uncertain
worst.
whether Oliver
She
or Rosalind
inventoried the
possessed
trunk of
the means to
ammunition,
stave off an
verifying
attack.
that she had enough
He
cartridges.
did not articulate his
She
doubts,
examined the
but the
few
concern
vantage
in his
points
eyes
around the
spoke
property.
volumes.
A low rise near
Once
the
the neighbor
orchard's southern
departed,
edge, a
Rosalind
spot of
gathered her
higher
courage
ground
and
behind the
prepared for the
cabin
worst.
and the barn's hayloft,
She
which
inventoried the
overlooked
trunk
the
of
approach
ammunition,
from the main trail.
verifying that she had enough
She laid out a
cartridges.
plan in her mind,
She
considering
examined
how
a few
best to
vantage
respond
points
if
around the
riders
property,
appeared.
a low rise near
The
the
orchard's
orchard's southern
scattered
edge,
trees
a
offered
spot of
partial
higher
cover,
ground
but
behind
they
the
also
cabin, and the
obscured
barn's
lines of
hayloft,
sight.
which overlooked
She
the
realized
approach
she
from
might
the
have
main
to draw
trail.
attackers in,
She
taking
laid out a
advantage of her
plan in her
familiarity
mind,
with the terrain.
considering how best
That
to
day
respond
stretched
if
into
riders
evening without
appeared.
incident.
The
Yet
orchard's
she hardly
scattered trees
slept,
offered
expecting
partial
that
cover.
at any moment the sound of
But they
galloping
also
hooves or
obscured lines of
gunshots might
sight.
shatter the tranquility.
She realized she might have
gripped
to
the
draw
rifle,
attackers in,
recalling how her
taking
father
advantage
had
of her
once described
familiarity
the calm
with the terrain.
before a storm as being
That
both
day stretched
unnerving
into
and
evening
strangely
without incident.
clarifying.
Yet
In
she
that
hardly
hush,
slept,
the world seemed to
expecting that
narrow
at
to
any
a single
moment the sound
priority:
of galloping hooves or
survival against
gunshots might
unknown
shatter the
but pressing
tranquility.
forces.
She
She
gripped the
recognized
rifle,
that the next
recalling how her
dawn might
father
herald
had
a
once
showdown,
described the calm
not just
before
for
a
the
storm
orchard,
as being
but
both
for Redwood
unnerving
Hollow
and
at
strangely
large.
clarifying.
The orchard's
In
fruit
that
might be
hush,
sparse,
the world
its
seemed to
land
narrow
meager,
to a single
but it was
priority:
her entire
survival
world.
against unknown but
She
pressing
prepared to
forces.
face whatever would come from the
She
dusty roads
recognized
and
that
the
the next
canyon
dawn
beyond
might
the
herald a
settlement,
showdown, not
uncertain
just
whether
for the
others
orchard,
would stand
but for
with
Redwood
her,
Hollow
or
at
if she would
large.
confront the threat alone.
The orchard's fruit
Morning
might be
broke with a
sparse,
brittle
its
chill
land
that seemed to
meager,
permeate
but it was
the
her
entire orchard.
world.
Rosalind
She
stood
prepared
at
to
the
face
cabin's
whatever would come
threshold,
from the dusty
surveying the
roads and
rolling
the
terrain
canyon
to the
beyond the
north,
settlement,
recalling the
uncertain
neighbor's
whether
urgent
others would
report of
stand with
riders
her
seen
or
near
if
a
she would
canyon in
confront the
that
threat
direction.
alone.
The light of
Morning
dawn
broke with a
revealed
brittle
little
chill
movement
that seemed seemed to
beyond a few
permeate the
grazing
entire
animals
orchard.
and the pale outlines of
Rosalind
distant rock
stood at the
formations.
cabin's threshold,
Although no
surveying the
immediate
rolling
threat
terrain to the
materialized,
north,
her
recalling the
instincts
neighbor's
urged
urgent
her to
report of
remain
riders seen
watchful.
near a canyon
She
in that
allowed
direction.
herself only a moment's
The
hesitation
light of
before
dawn
proceeding
revealed
with her
little movement
chores,
beyond a few
balancing
grazing
her
animals and the
responsibility to
pale
maintain
outlines
the
of distant
homestead
rock
with her need to be
formations.
prepared for danger at
Although
any
no
instant.
immediate threat
Beyond the orchard,
materialized,
Redwood
her
Hollow
instincts
stirred
urged
awake
her
under
to
the
remain
unsettled
watchful.
atmosphere gripping the
She
region.
allowed herself only a
At the
moment's
center of the dusty
hesitation
main
before
street,
proceeding with her
a
chores,
handful of townspeople
balancing her
gathered in small
responsibility to
clusters.
maintain the homestead
They
with her need to
exchanged
be
worried
prepared for danger
glances or
at any
hushed
instant.
pieces of news.
Beyond the
Some
orchard,
recounted hearing
Redwood
phantom
Hollow stood
hoofbeats in the
awake under
darkness,
the unsettled
while
atmosphere
others
gripping
described
the region.
unusual lights flickering along
At the
the
center
hills
of the
after
dusty
midnight.
main street, A
In
handful
the absence of
townspeople
definitive
gathered in
evidence,
small
the
clusters.
tension manifested as a
They
series of
exchanged
rumors
worried
and
glances or
half-formed
hushed
suspicions
pieces
that
of
roamed
news.
from one conversation
Some
to
recounted
another.
hearing phantom
At
hoofbeats in
times,
the
the sheriff's
darkness,
office door
while
would
others
swing
described
open,
unusual
revealing the
lights
weary
flickering
form
along
of
the
Sheriff
hills after
Tolliver
midnight.
or one of his deputies
In the
hurrying out
absence
to
of definitive
investigate another
evidence,
frantic
the tension
report of
manifested
suspicious
as a
riders.
series of rumors
Most
and
of these
half-formed
alerts proved
suspicions that roamed
inconclusive,
from one
yet each one
conversation
fanned
to
the
another.
flames of collective anxiety.
At times, the sheriff's
Rosalind,
office
after
door
completing
would
her
swing
morning
open,
chores,
revealing
contemplated
the weary
whether
form
to
of
ride
Sheriff
into
Tolliver
town
or one of
herself.
his deputies hurrying
She
out
wanted
to
additional
investigate another
information
frantic
regarding the
report of
Braxton
suspicious
Raiders'
riders.
supposed encampment near the
Most
canyon,
of these alerts
yet she
proved
was reluctant to
inconclusive,
leave her father
yet each
alone
one
for too
fanned the
long.
flames of collective anxiety.
She also feared drawing attention to
Rosalind,
herself,
after completing her
preferring that
morning
few
chores,
recognized her as
contemplated
anything
whether to
beyond an
ride into
orchard
town
caretaker.
herself. She
Anonymity
wanted
might
additional
offer a
information
strategic
regarding the
advantage
Braxton
later.
Raiders' supposed
Weighing
encampment
these
near the canyon,
considerations,
yet she was
decided to
reluctant
make
to
a
leave her
swift
father
trip
alone
to
for
Redwood
too
Hollow.
long.
She left
also feared
provisions
drawing
within reach
attention
for her
to herself,
father, who still
preferring
struggled
that
with
few
bouts of
recognized her
weakness,
as anything
then
beyond
mounted
an
the
orchard
homestead's
caretaker.
sturdiest horse and set
Anonymity
off
might
along the
offer a
winding
strategic
trail.
advantage
Throughout
later.
the ride, the landscape
Weighing
bore
these
signs of heightened
considerations, she
vigilance.
decided to make a
She
swift
noticed
trip to
newly
Redwood
erected
Hollow.
fences on neighboring
She left
properties,
provisions within
hastily
reach for her
reinforced
father,
with whatever
who still
material
struggled
could
with
be
bouts of
salvaged.
weakness, then
Some
mounted the
ranchers had
homestead's
placed
sturdiest
crude
horse and set
barricades
off
around their
along the winding
barns.
trail.
When she passed a modest
Throughout the
house near a
ride,
shallow
the
creek,
landscape bore
she
signs
observed a
of
pair of
heightened
men
vigilance.
taking turns, standing
She
guard
noticed
by the
newly
entrance.
erected fences
They wore
on
anxious
neighboring properties,
expressions, but
hastily
acknowledged her
reinforced
presence
with
with a
whatever
brief
material
nod.
could be salvaged.
Even though she avoided
Some
any overt
ranchers had placed
contact,
crude
she sensed their
barricades around their
suspicion of
barns.
strangers lurking just
When
beyond
she passed
sight.
a modest
By
house
late
near
morning,
a
she
shallow
arrived
creek,
at Redwood
she
Hollow's
observed a pair of
outskirts.
men taking
The
turns
main
standing
street
guard
felt more
by the
subdued
entrance.
than usual, with
They
many
wore
shutters
anxious
closed and the
expressions, but
general store's
acknowledged her
porch
presence with a
empty.
brief nod.
She guided her horse
Even though
behind
she
the
avoided
blacksmith's
any
shop
overt
to avoid
contact,
attracting
she
attention,
sensed their suspicion
then
of
paused
strangers
to survey
lurking
the
just
scene.
beyond sight.
The typically
By
noisy
late
saloon
morning,
across
she
the road
arrived at
seemed
Redwood
quiet,
Hollow's
though a
outskirts.
few horses were tied to
The
its
main
hitching
street
post.
felt more subdued than
A pair
usual,
of townsfolk
with many
shared a
shutters
hurried
closed
exchange
and
by
the
the
general
telegraph
store's porch
office,
empty.
and from their
She
gestures,
guided her
it
horse
appeared
behind
they
the
were
blacksmith's
discussing the
shop to
possibility
avoid
of more
attracting attention,
hostilities.
then paused to survey
The door to the
scene.
sheriff's office stood
The
partially
typically
ajar,
noisy saloon
and
across
one
the
deputy
road
paced
seemed
in
quiet,
front,
though a few
occasionally
horses were
glancing up
tied
and
to
down
its
the
hitching
street as
post.
though expecting trouble
A
to
pair of
descend at
townsfolk
any
shared a
moment.
hurried exchange by the
Rosalind
telegraph
dismounted
office,
and tied her
from their
horse behind a
gestures,
discreet
it
set of
appeared they were
crates.
discussing the
She made her
possibility
way
of
through the
more
narrow alley
hostilities.
that ran parallel to the
The
main
door to the
thoroughfare.
sheriff's office stood
The
partially
close-set wooden
ajar,
walls
and
on
one
either
deputy
side
paced
bore
in
dark
front,
scorch marks,
occasionally glancing
remnants
up
of a
and
small
down the street
fire
as
from
though
some
expecting
past
trouble
event.
to descend at any moment.
Near the rear entrance of the
Rosalind
blacksmith shop,
dismounted
she
and tied
overheard
her
a
horse
snippet of
behind a discreet
conversation
set of
between two
crates.
locals who were
She
discussing a
made her
missing
way
ranch
through the
hand,
narrow alley that
presumably
ran
lost
parallel
during
to
a
the main
recent scouting
thoroughfare.
errand.
The
Their
close-set
hushed
wooden
tones
walls on
reflected
either
deep
side bore dark
concern,
scorch marks,
suggesting that
remnants
this
of a small
disappearance
fire
might
from
be
some
linked
past
to the
event.
bandits rumored to be
Near
plotting
the
a
rear
coordinated
entrance of the
assault.
blacksmith shop,
Deciding that
she
information
overheard
was
a
her
snippet
primary
of conversation
objective,
between two
Rosalind found a
locals who were
vantage point
discussing a
near the
missing
side of the
ranch
sheriff's
hand,
office.
presumably lost
She
during a
lingered in
recent
the shadow
scouting
of the
errand.
building's overhanging
Their
roof,
hushed
careful
tones
to avoid
reflected
direct
deep
interaction.
concern, suggesting that
Although
this
she possessed
disappearance
skill
might be
and a
linked to the bandits
determination to
rumored to
defend
be
her
plotting a
home,
coordinated
she had no
assault.
desire to become publicly
Deciding that
involved unless
information
it
was her
proved
primary
absolutely
objective,
necessary.
Rosalind found a vantage
She
point
observed
near the
Sheriff
side of the
Tolliver
sheriff's
conferring
office.
with a tall,
She
broad-shouldered
lingered in the
individual
shadow
whose
of the
demeanor
building's
implied
overhanging
prior
roof,
military
careful to
experience.
avoid direct
This
interaction.
person wore worn leathers
Although
and
she
carried a
possessed
long
skill
rifle
and a
slung across his
determination to
back.
defend her home,
Their
she had
conversation
no
was
desire
tense.
to become
The
publicly
sheriff
involved
repeatedly
unless it
gestured
proved
toward a large
absolutely
map
necessary.
spread across a tabletop.
She observed
Perhaps
Sheriff
they were
Tolliver
devising a
conferring
patrol
with a tall,
schedule or
broad-shouldered
analyzing sightings
individual
of the
whose
Braxton
demeanor
Raiders.
implied prior military
After a few minutes, the
experience.
tall man nodded and
This
walked away,
person wore worn
disappearing
leathers
into the
and
haze
carried a
of the
long
midday
rifle
sun.
slung across his
Rosalind
back.
recognized that Redwood
Their
Hollow's
conversation
leadership
was
seemed
tense.
ill-equipped
The
to
sheriff
manage a
repeatedly
serious
gestured
threat.
toward a large map
The
spread
sheriff was
across
doing
a
what he
tabletop.
could, but the scattered
Perhaps
nature
they
of
were
the
devising a
ranches and the
patrol
lack of of a
schedule or
coherent
analyzing
defensive
sightings
structure
of the
left the
Braxton
entire
Raiders.
region vulnerable.
After a few
As she
minutes,
weighed whether
the
to
tall man
approach
nodded
anyone
and
in
walked
an
away,
official capacity,
disappearing into
an
the
older
haze of the
rancher
midday sun.
emerged from the office with a bandaged
Rosalind
arm.
recognized that
He
Redwood
moved
Hollow's
slowly,
leadership
his
seemed
eyes filled with
ill-equipped to
anger or
manage a serious
frustration.
threat.
He spoke to a
The
deputy
sheriff was
with
doing
quiet
what he
intensity,
could, but the
evidently
scattered
sharing a
nature of the
story of a
ranches
recent
and the lack
attack
of a
on his
coherent
property.
defensive structure left
The
the
deputy
entire
listened
region vulnerable.
sympathetically, but the
As she
rancher's
weighed
face
whether to
showed little
approach anyone
hope in
in
the
an official
reassurance he
capacity,
received.
an older rancher
The man
emerged
then
from the
limped
office
off,
with a bandaged
heading
arm.
toward the livery stable.
He moved
Although
slowly,
Rosalind
his
learned no
eyes
new
filled with anger
specifics
or
about the
frustration.
Braxton Raiders' location,
He spoke
she
to a
gleaned
deputy
that
with
the
quiet
outlaws
intensity,
continued to probe
evidently
the
sharing
area
a
for
story
weak
of a
points.
recent attack on his
In
property.
whispered accounts, it was
The
said
deputy
that small
listened
contingents of
sympathetically,
raiders
but the
had
rancher's
approached
face
multiple
showed little
ranches to
hope in the
gauge the owner's
reassurance he
readiness
received.
or to intimidate
The
them
man
into
then limped
surrender.
off, heading toward the
This
livery
tactic
stable.
suggested a looming plan,
Although Rosalind
systematically
learned no new
undermine the
specifics about
region's
the Braxton
confidence,
Raiders' location,
cause panic,
she gleaned
and
that the
strike
outlaws
when
continued
defenders
to
were
probe
most
the area
uncertain.
for weak points.
Concluding that
In
Redwood
whispered
Hollow
accounts,
offered
it
her
was
no
said that
additional
small
concrete
contingents of
insights,
raiders had
she
approached
resolved to
multiple
slip back
ranches
to
to
the
gauge the
homestead.
owner's readiness
She
or to
left by the
intimidate
same
them
route
into
she had
surrender.
arrived, passing
This
behind the
tactic
blacksmith
suggested a
shop,
looming plan,
collecting her horse,
systematically
and keeping a
undermine the
low
region's
profile until
confidence,
she was
cause
well
panic,
outside the
and
town
strike when
perimeter.
defenders
On the
were
road
most
back,
uncertain.
she encountered a lone
Concluding
traveler
that
who
Redwood
appeared
Hollow
nervous
offered her
but
no additional
unharmed.
concrete insights,
He was guiding
she
a loaded
resolved to
mule
slip
along
back
the
to
dusty
homestead.
trail and nodded
She
curtly
left
when he
by the
noticed
same
her.
route she had arrived,
She returned
passing
the
behind
nod,
the blacksmith's
recalling
shop,
that travelers were
collecting
among
her
the
horse,
prime
and
targets
keeping
for
a low
outlaws
profile
seeking quick
until she was
plunder.
well outside the town
The traveler
perimeter.
seemed relieved
On
not to
the
be
road
accosted,
back, she
which spoke
encountered a lone
volumes about the
traveler who
current
appeared
climate.
nervous but unharmed.
Farther along, she saw more
He was
evidence
guiding a
of
loaded
ranchers
mule along the
reinforcing their
dusty
homes,
trail and nodded curtly
makeshift
when he noticed her.
barricades, piles of
She
scrap
returned
lumber
the
and
nod,
wagon wheels
recalling that
arranged to
travelers
block
were among
potential
the prime
approaches.
targets for outlaws seeking
Each
quick
time she
plunder.
rode past one of these
The
hasty
traveler seemed
fortifications,
relieved not
she
to be
wondered whether
accosted,
it could
which
withstand
spoke
a serious
volumes about
raid.
the current
Upon
climate.
reaching the orchard, she
Farther
found her
along,
father awake,
she saw more
seated
evidence
on a
of
rickety
ranchers
chair outside the
reinforcing their
cabin.
homes,
He
makeshift
gazed at the
barricades,
grove of
piles of
trees,
scrap
which were
lumber,
losing
and
their
wagon
foliage
wheels
in the
arranged
crisp
to
autumn
block
air.
potential approaches.
A soft wind carried
Each
the
time
scent
she
of
rode
decaying
past one of these
leaves and
hasty
freshly turned
fortifications,
soil.
she wondered whether it could
Although he said
withstand a
nothing,
serious raid.
his posture revealed
Upon
concern about
reaching
the
the
orchard's
orchard,
fragile
she found her
future,
father
the
awake,
intensifying
seated on a
rumors,
rickety chair
and the
outside the
knowledge that
cabin.
time was robbing him of
He
the
gazed
strength
at the
to
grove of
protect what he
trees,
loved.
which were losing their foliage in the
Rosalind
crisp
took it
autumn
upon
air.
herself to perform the
A
afternoon
soft wind
chores,
carried the scent
ensuring
of
water
decaying
basins
leaves
were
and
filled,
freshly turned
livestock
soil.
fed, and the
Although
property's
he said
perimeter
nothing,
inspected
his
for any
posture
sign of
revealed
intrusion.
concern about the
As
orchard's
dusk
fragile
settled over
future.
the orchard, she
The
readied the
intensifying
rifle,
rumors,
positioning it
and the
within
knowledge
arm's
that
reach
time
near a
was robbing
window.
him of the strength
She
to
lit
protect
only
what
one
he loved.
lantern, keeping it shielded
Rosalind
so
took
that
it
no
upon
glow would
herself to
escape
perform
through
the
cracks or
afternoon
curtains.
chores, ensuring
The
water
orchard
basins
rustled
were
with
filled,
nocturnal
livestock
sounds,
fed,
from
and the
insects
property's
chirping in the
perimeter
grass
inspected
to
for
the
any
sigh of
sign of
wind in the
intrusion.
branches.
As dusk
Now and
settled
then,
over the
she
orchard,
thought she
she
detected
readied the
faint
rifle,
echoes of
positioning
movement,
it within
as if
arm's
distant
reach near a
riders were
window.
testing the boundaries of
She
the
lit
property.
only one lantern,
She
keeping it
permitted her
shielded so
mind
that
no
no glow would
indulgence in
escape through
doubt.
cracks
If
or
a
curtains.
confrontation arose, she
The
intended
orchard
to put her
rustled with
practiced
nocturnal
skill to
sounds,
use.
from insects
Without
chirping in the
direct
grass
speech,
to the
she
sigh of
communicated
wind
her
in the
resolve to
branches.
herself in the form of
Now
calm,
and then,
measured
she
breaths
thought she
and mental
detected faint
repetition of
echoes
her
of
father's
movement,
lessons
as
on
if
how to
distant
remain
riders
steady
were
under
testing the
pressure.
boundaries of the
Night
property.
passed without incident,
She
though that
permitted her
offered little
mind no
solace.
indulgence in doubt. If
The
a
next morning,
confrontation
the neighbor
arose,
who had
she
originally
intended
warned
to
of
put
the
her
canyon
practiced
camp
skill to
reappeared.
use.
He approached the
Without direct
homestead at a
speech,
brisk
she
pace,
communicated
his
her
horse
resolve
lathered
to
with
herself
sweat.
in the form of calm,
Through his
measured breaths,
agitated
and mental
gestures, he
repetition
conveyed
of
that a
her
larger
father's
gathering
lessons
of
on how to
outlaws had
remain
been
steady
observed in
under
the same
pressure.
canyon, now
Night
visibly
passed without
increasing in
incident,
number.
though that offered little
He believed
solace.
that a decisive
The
strike
next
against
morning,
Redwood
the
Hollow
neighbor
or its
who had
outlying
originally warned
ranches
of
was
the canyon
imminent,
camp
possibly
reappeared.
within days.
He
He
approached the
intended to
homestead
rally
at
a
a
few
brisk
brave
pace,
souls
his
to ride
horse
to the
lathered with
canyon's
sweat.
outskirts,
Through
attempting to
his
glean more
agitated
information
gestures,
or
he
disrupt the
conveyed
group's
that a larger
preparations.
gathering of outlaws had been
Rosalind
observed in the same
listened
canyon,
silently,
now visibly
acknowledging the
increasing in
urgency.
number.
After
He
delivering
believed
his
that a
message, the
decisive
neighbor
strike
galloped
against
away
Redwood
once
Hollow
again,
or its
presumably
outlying
to muster
ranches
what
was
assistance
imminent,
he could find.
possibly within
In the
days.
aftermath of that tense
He intended to
conversation,
rally a few brave
Rosalind
souls
felt
to
a
ride to
mixture
the
of
canyon's
alarm and
outskirts,
conviction.
attempting to glean more
If the rumored
information or
camp in the
disrupt the
canyon
group's
had indeed
preparations.
grown, it meant Luther
Rosalind
Braxton's
listened
men
silently,
might already
acknowledging
outnumber
the
any
urgency.
potential defenders.
After
She
delivering his
understood that
message,
Redwood
the
Hollow's
neighbor
future
galloped
might
away once
rest on
again,
whether its residents
presumably
could
to muster
unify
what
quickly.
assistance he could find.
But her father's condition
In the
made leaving the
aftermath of that
homestead
tense
risky.
conversation,
She
Rosalind
suspected
felt
that
a
if
mixture of
hostilities
alarm and
erupted,
conviction.
the orchard would not
If
remain
the rumored
untouched.
camp in the canyon had indeed
Weighing
grown,
the options,
it meant
she
Luther
decided to
Braxton's
remain
men
on
might
guard at
already
home until
outnumber
she
any
received
potential
clearer
defenders.
signs that the attack had
She
begun,
understood that
or that
Redwood
the
Hollow's
situation
future
required
might
her
rest on
direct
whether its
involvement
residents
elsewhere.
could unify
She
quickly.
used the next 2 days to
But her
prepare a
father's
rudimentary
condition made
defense
leaving
around
the
the
homestead
orchard.
risky.
She rearranged
She
crates
suspected
and
that if
barrels to
hostilities
create partial
erupted,
cover
the
near the
orchard would not
cabin's
remain
entry points.
untouched.
She also
Weighing the
cleared some
options,
low-hanging
she decided
branches
to
that
remain
might
on
obstruct
guard
her
at
line
home
of
until
sight
she
should she
received
need to
clearer
watch the
signs that
property
the
from the
attack had
barn
begun
loft
or
or
that
the
the
cabin's
situation
small attic
required her
space.
direct involvement
While
elsewhere.
making these modifications,
She used the
she
next 2
recalled her
days to
father's
prepare a
lessons about how
rudimentary
stationary
defense around the
defenses could
orchard.
become liabilities if
She
they restricted
rearranged crates
mobility.
and barrels to
She
create
therefore
partial cover near
memorized
the
possible
cabin's entry
fallback
points.
positions,
She
ensuring that
also
if
cleared
attackers
some
pushed
low-hanging
forward from
branches
one
that might
side,
obstruct her
she
line
could
of sight
quietly
should she
relocate
need to
to a
watch the
vantage point
property from the
behind them.
barn loft or the
The
cabin's
orchard,
small
with
attic
its
space.
dense arrangement of trees,
While making these
created a natural
modifications,
labyrinth
she
that
recalled
might
her
serve her
father's
well if
lessons
she
about
kept
how
her nerves
stationary
under control.
defenses could become
Meanwhile,
liabilities
reports
if
from
they
travelers
restricted
trickled
mobility.
in. Some
She
carried
therefore
tales of
memorized
more
possible
sightings near the
fallback
canyon,
positions,
describing an
ensuring that if
ever-growing
attackers
group of
pushed
raiders
forward
who
from one
practiced
side,
night drills,
she could
their
quietly
torches
relocate to a
flickering in the
vantage point
distance.
behind them.
Others mentioned
The
that
orchard,
smaller
with its
squads
dense
roamed the
arrangement of
territory,
trees,
cutting
created a
fences,
natural
stealing
labyrinth
horses,
that might serve her
or
well
intimidating
if she kept her
ranch
nerves
hands
under
into
control.
silence. Across
Meanwhile,
Redwood Hollow
reports
and
from
its
travelers
environs,
trickled in.
the threat felt tangible.
Some carried tales
Yet
of
no
more
single
sightings
event
near the
triggered an
canyon,
all-out
describing an
panic, so
ever-growing
most
group
residents
of raiders who
continued their
practiced
days
night
under an
drills,
uneasy
their
hush,
torches
braced for
flickering in the
whatever
distance.
darkness the night might bring.
Others mentioned
Rosalind
that
felt
smaller
those nights
squads
stretching
roamed the
into oppressive
territory,
intervals
cutting
of watchfulness.
fences, stealing horses,
She often sat
or
behind a shuttered
intimidating
window,
ranch hands
rifle
into
close,
silence.
scanning the dark for any
Across Redwood
silhouette that
Hollow
might
and its
indicate
environs,
raiders
the
converging
threat
on the
felt
homestead.
tangible.
The
Yet
orchard's
no
branches,
single event
swaying
triggered
in the
an
wind,
all-out panic,
occasionally
so
played
most
tricks on
residents
her eyes,
continued their days
resembling
under an
phantom
uneasy
shapes
hush,
slipping
braced for
between
whatever
trees.
darkness the night might
Each
bring.
time she exhaled slowly
Rosalind felt
and let her
those
training
nights
guide her
stretching
back
into
to
oppressive
composure.
intervals of watchfulness.
Small things took on
She
heightened
often
significance.
sat behind a
A
shuttered
scattering
window,
of leaves,
rifle
the
close,
distant call
scanning
of a
the dark
nocturnal
for any
bird,
silhouette that
or the
might
faint glow
indicate
from
raiders
distant ranch
converging on the
lights.
homestead.
The orchard had
The
become
orchard's
an island of
branches,
solitude
swaying
in a
in the
sea
wind,
of rumors and
occasionally
quiet
played
dread.
tricks on her
Eventually, the neighbors' efforts to
resembling
investigate
phantom
the
shapes
canyon
slipping
produced
between
new
trees.
insights. A
Each
small
time
group of
she
riders,
exhaled
including
slowly
the neighbor
and let her training
himself
guide
and
her
two
back
other
to
ranchers,
composure.
had ventured close
Small
enough to
things took
confirm
on
the
heightened
presence of
significance,
numerous
a
tents,
scattering of
horses,
leaves,
and
the
armed
distant call of a
individuals who
nocturnal
seemed well
bird, or the
organized.
faint glow
They
from distant
observed some
ranch
men
lights.
practicing target shooting
The
on
orchard had
makeshift
become an
dummies,
island of
while others
solitude in
drilled
a
in
sea of
formation
rumors
under
and
the
quiet
supervision
dread.
of a tall figure who might have been
Eventually,
Luther
the neighbors'
Braxton
efforts to
himself.
investigate the canyon
After this
produced new
covert
insights.
observation, the
A
riders
small
hastily
group of
retreated,
riders,
certain that
including
if
the
they
neighbor
lingered,
himself and
they
two
would be
other
spotted and
ranchers,
pursued.
had ventured close
They
enough to
returned with
confirm the
tales that
presence
the
of
brazen
numerous tents,
confidence of
horses,
these outlaws
and armed
suggested an
individuals who
impending
seemed well
large-scale
organized.
operation.
They
They also
observed some
noticed
men
wagons
practicing
laden
target
with
shooting on
supplies,
makeshift dummies,
implying that the
while
raiders
others
could
drilled in
sustain an
formation
extended
under the supervision
campaign,
of a tall figure
possibly
who might have
aiming
been
to
Luther
seize
Braxton
Redwood
himself.
Hollow outright. News
After
of
this
this
covert
revelation
observation,
stirred
the
apprehension
riders
in
hastily
town.
retreated,
The
certain that
sheriff
if they
convened
lingered,
another
they
meeting
would
to
be
discuss
spotted and
emergency
pursued.
plans for the settlement.
They returned with
Some
tales that the
ranchers and
brazen
shopkeepers
confidence of these
attended,
outlaws
but the
suggested an
atmosphere was
impending
grim.
large-scale operation.
Strategies varied.
They also
A
noticed
few
wagons
advocated
laden
for a
with
defensive
supplies,
perimeter
implying
around
that the
Redwood
raiders
Hollow,
could sustain an
stationing
extended
guards at key
campaign,
roads.
possibly aiming
Others
to seize
argued for a
Redwood Hollow
preemptive
outright.
strike on the canyon camp,
News of this
despite the high
revelation
risk.
stirred apprehension
The
in
discussion
town.
illuminated the
The
lack of a
sheriff
cohesive
convened
militia
another meeting to
and the strong
discuss emergency
possibility of
plans for the
infiltration,
settlement.
since no one knew
Some
whether
ranchers and
Braxton might have
shopkeepers
sent
attended,
spies
but
into
the
the
atmosphere
settlement
was grim.
itself.
Strategies
Tempers
varied.
flared, and the meeting
A few
ended with no
advocated for a
unified
defensive
solution.
perimeter around Redwood
An
Hollow,
overall sense of
stationing
mounting
guards at key
dread took
roads.
hold. A short while
Others
later,
argued
a
for
new
a
puzzle
preemptive
arose.
strike on the canyon
Several
camp,
ranchers
despite
reported
the high
receiving
risk.
cryptic messages
The
pinned to their
discussion
doors or
illuminated the
nailed onto
lack of a
fences.
cohesive militia
The notes
and the
threatened
strong
consequences
possibility
if
of
the ranchers
infiltration,
refused to
since
abandon
no
their
one knew whether
properties.
Braxton might
Some
have sent
mentioned the
spies
Braxton
into the
name
settlement
directly,
itself.
while others hinted that
Tempers
Redwood
flared,
Hollow
and the
belonged to
meeting
the
ended with no
outlaws,
unified
and any
solution.
resistance would be met
An
with swift
overall
violence.
sense of mounting dread took
The
hold.
town's blacksmith
A
discovered a
short
similar
while
note
later, a
attached
new
to his
puzzle
anvil at
arose.
dawn one morning.
Several
Fear
ranchers
rippled
reported
through the
receiving
streets,
cryptic messages
reinforcing the
pinned to
belief
their
that the
doors or
raiders not
nailed
only
onto
had
fences.
numbers but also enough
The
confidence
notes
to taunt
threatened
the locals
consequences
publicly.
if the ranchers
Still,
refused to
no
abandon
broad
their
attack
properties.
transpired, as though the
Some
gang was
mentioned the
biding its
Braxton name
time,
directly,
ensuring
while
that the
others
settlement
hinted that
reached the
Redwood
peak of
Hollow belonged
uncertainty
to
and
the outlaws,
frustration before
and
they
any
struck.
resistance would be met
Rosalind
with swift
recognized that
violence.
the orchard was not
The
immune to
town's
this
blacksmith
psychological
discovered a
pressure.
similar note
She
attached to
found a
his
single
anvil
piece
at
of
dawn
scorched
one
paper
morning.
wedged under a rock
Fear
by the
rippled through
property's
the
entrance.
streets, reinforcing
The
the
written
belief
words
that the
implied
raiders
that
not only
anyone
had numbers
safeguarding
but also
Redwood
enough
Hollow's
confidence to
interests
taunt the
would
locals
regret their
publicly.
loyalty when Braxton's men
Still,
arrived.
no broad attack
She destroyed
transpired,
the note
as
in the
though the
cabin's
gang was biding
fireplace,
its time,
refusing to let
ensuring
its
that the
threat
settlement
undermine
reached
her
the peak of
resolve.
uncertainty
Yet
and
she did
frustration
inform her
before they
father of
struck.
the development, kneeling
Rosalind
by his
recognized
bedside
that the
and
orchard was
describing
not
the
immune
evidence
to
of a
this
carefully
psychological
orchestrated
pressure.
campaign of
She
intimidation.
found a single piece of scorched
Oliver's
paper wedged
gaze
under a
drifted
rock
toward
by
the
the
trunk
property's
holding the
entrance.
ammunition, and
The written
Rosalind
words
read in
implied
his
that
eyes
anyone
a silent
safeguarding
affirmation
Redwood
that it
Hollow's
might soon
interests
be
would
time to
regret their
stand
loyalty
firm.
when when
Not
Braxton's
long
men
after,
arrived.
scouts spotted
She
new
destroyed the
movements near
note
the
in the
canyon.
cabin's fireplace,
The Braxton Raiders
refusing
had
to let
begun
its threat
breaking
undermine
camp,
her resolve.
hitching wagons, and
Yet
mounting
she did
horses in
inform
what
her
looked
father
like
of the
preparation
development,
for a
kneeling
journey.
by his bedside and
Whether they
describing the
intended to
evidence of a
strike Redwood
carefully
Hollow
orchestrated
directly
campaign of
or target
intimidation.
ranches first remained
Oliver's
unknown,
gaze drifted
but
toward
the
the
scale
trunk
of
holding the
activity was
ammunition,
unmistakable.
and Rosalind read in his
Word of
eyes
this
a
spread
silent
rapidly,
affirmation that it
prompting
might soon be
frantic
time to
moments in
stand
town.
firm.
Some families
Not long
packed
after,
wagons to flee,
scouts spotted
heading
new
for more
movements near the
fortified
canyon.
settlements beyond the mountains.
The Braxton Raiders had
Others
begun
hunkered
breaking
down
camp,
in Redwood
hitching
Hollow,
wagons, and
believing that
mounting
familiar
horses in
ground
what
might
looked like
offer them some
preparation for a
semblance of
journey.
advantage.
Whether
The
they
sheriff
intended
did what
to
he
strike
could,
Redwood Hollow
organizing
directly
the few
or target
volunteers
ranches
who
first
remained
remained
determined to
unknown,
stay
but
and
the
protect
scale
their
of activity
livelihoods.
was unmistakable.
Gaps in the defense
Word
were
of this spread
glaring,
rapidly,
and each hour
prompting
brought
frantic
fresh
moments in
rumors of how
town.
large or
Some
well-armed the
families
Braxton
packed
force
wagons
might
to
be.
flee,
At
heading
the
for more
orchard,
fortified
Rosalind
settlements
completed her
beyond the
final
mountains.
preparations.
Others
She
hunkered
fashioned
down in
extra
Redwood
barricades
Hollow,
at crucial
believing that
points
familiar
and
ground
tested
might
her
offer them
vantage in the
some
barn
semblance
loft,
of advantage.
ensuring that if
The
intruders
sheriff did
arrived
what
from
he
the
could,
west, she
organizing
could
the few
observe them before they
volunteers who
reached the
remained
cabin.
determined to stay and protect
She
their
carried an oil
livelihoods.
lantern with a shielded
Gaps in the
hood to
defense were
avoid giving
glaring,
away her position at night.
and each hour brought
She
fresh
quietly
rumors of how
practiced
large or
rapid reload
well-armed the
drills in
Braxton
the early
force might
morning
be.
light, controlling
At the
her
orchard,
breathing as her father
Rosalind
had taught
completed
her,
her final
aligning her
preparations.
posture with each shot.
She fashioned extra
During a brief
barricades at
pause,
crucial
she looked
points and
across the
tested her
orchard,
vantage in the
recalling
barn loft,
memories of simpler
ensuring that if
times.
intruders
Her
arrived from
father
the
showing
west,
her how to
she could
plant
observe them
saplings,
before
or her
they
mother,
reached the cabin.
long gone,
She
smiling at
carried
the
an
sight
oil
of
lantern
blossoming
with a
branches
shielded
in
hood to
spring.
avoid giving away
That
her
orchard
position
stood
at
for
night.
more than an attempt at farming.
She quietly
It
practiced
symbolized
rapid reload
resilience.
drills in the
She
early morning
intended to
light,
defend it, no
controlling
matter
her
the
breathing
cost.
as her father had
2 days
taught her,
later,
aligning her
reconnaissance from
posture
the
with
foothills
each shot.
indicated that Braxton's
During a
formation
brief
was on the
pause,
move,
she looked
heading
across the
southeast
orchard,
from the canyon
recalling
in the
memories
general
of simpler
direction of
times,
Redwood
her
Hollow.
father showing her
The
how to plant
exact destination
saplings, or her
remained a
mother,
mystery,
long gone,
but those who
smiling at the
observed the
sight of
movement
blossoming
estimated at
branches in
least 2
spring.
dozen outlaws,
That
likely
orchard stood
accompanied
for
by
more than an
additional
attempt at farming.
sympathizers scattered
It
across the
symbolized
region.
resilience.
The scouts
She
rushed back
intended to
to alert
defend
the
it,
town,
no matter
causing
the
a
cost.
burst of frantic activity.
2 days later,
Some
reconnaissance
volunteers
from the
took up
foothills
positions near the
indicated
main
that Braxton's
road,
formation
erecting
was on the
flimsy
move,
barricades
heading
of wagons
southeast
and
from the
crates.
canyon in the general
Others
direction of
retreated
Redwood
into
Hollow.
buildings,
The
barricading
exact
windows and loading
destination remained a
rifles.
mystery, but those
Fearful
who observed the
families that had
movement
not fled
estimated at
crowded
least
into
2
the
dozen
schoolhouse,
outlaws,
hoping
likely
strength in
accompanied by
numbers might
additional
offer a layer of
sympathizers
safety.
scattered across the region.
Rosalind, upon hearing
The
of this
scouts rushed
development,
back to alert the
stationed
town,
herself within
causing
the
a
orchard.
burst of frantic
She
activity.
spent the daylight hours
Some
making a final
volunteers took up
circuit of the
positions
property,
near the main
adjusting
road,
a few
erecting
positions where
flimsy
fallen
barricades
branches
of
might
wagons
impede
and
a clear
crates.
line of sight.
Others
She
retreated
placed
into
extra
buildings,
cartridges in a
barricading
satchel and
windows
located
and
a
loading
vantage
rifles.
point overlooking the main
Fearful
trail that
families
led to
that
the
had not
homestead.
fled crowded into the
In
schoolhouse,
the hush of
hoping
mid-afternoon,
strength
she
in
felt the
numbers might
oppressive
offer a
weight of
layer of
waiting.
safety.
She considered whether
Rosalind,
she should attempt
upon
to
hearing of this
coordinate with the town's
development, stationed
defenders,
herself within
but
the
the
orchard.
orchard lay on the outskirts,
She spent the
and she
daylight
lacked a
hours
convenient
making
way
a
to
final
confirm
circuit
they
of
could
the
hold the
property,
line if the
adjusting a
raiders
few
bypassed
positions where
Redwood
fallen
Hollow
branches
Center.
might impede a clear line of
She
sight.
remained convinced that her best
She
chance
placed
to
extra
protect her
cartridges
father
in a
and the
satchel
orchard
and
was to
located a
rely on her
vantage point
father's
overlooking the
teachings,
main
her
trail that led to the
preparations,
homestead.
and the advantage of
In
home
the
ground.
hush of
As
mid-afternoon,
dusk
she
approached,
felt the
the wind
oppressive weight
shifted,
of waiting.
carrying a new scent of dust
She
and horse
considered whether
sweat.
she should attempt to
A line
coordinate
of
with the
shapes became
town's
visible
defenders,
along the
but
ridge
the
near the
orchard lay on
orchard's
the
north
outskirts,
boundary,
and she lacked
silhouettes
a
against the
convenient
dimming
way to
sky.
confirm they could hold the line
Whether
if the
these
raiders
figures
bypassed
belonged to
Redwood
Braxton's
Hollow
main
Center.
force or a smaller
She remained
detachment remained
convinced that her
unclear.
best chance to protect her
Rosalind
father
peered
in the
through the
orchard was
scope
to
mounted
rely
on her
on her
rifle,
father's teachings,
discerning the
her
outlines of
preparations,
multiple
and
riders
the
moving
advantage of home
slowly,
ground.
as if scouting for
As
signs of
dusk
life below.
approached, the wind
She
shifted,
crouched low
carrying a
within
new
the
scent of
orchard,
dust and
heart
horse
thudding,
sweat.
recalling how her
A
father had
line of
instructed
shapes
her to
became
wait for the
visible
right
along
moment
the
rather
ridge
than
near the
fire
orchard's
blindly.
north boundary,
The riders
silhouettes
paused,
against the
evidently
dimming sky.
scanning the orchard.
Whether these
Then they
figures
proceeded
belonged to
along the
Braxton's
ridge,
main force
vanishing
or a
behind
smaller
a small
detachment
outcrop.
remained unclear.
The orchard fell silent
Rosalind
once
peered
more,
through the scope
except for
mounted
the
on her
rustle of
rifle,
dry leaves
discerning
overhead.
the outlines of multiple riders
Rosalind
moving
stayed in
slowly,
position,
as if
uncertain
scouting for
whether the
signs of
raiders
life
were circling
below.
around or whether they
She
intended to
crouched low
pass the
within the
property
orchard,
altogether.
heart thudding,
Minutes
recalling
felt
how
like
her father
hours.
had instructed her
She
to wait
tightened
for
her
the
grip
right
on the
moment
rifle,
rather than fire
replaying in her
blindly.
mind every detail
The
she had
riders
planned.
paused, evidently
If a
scanning the
confrontation
orchard.
unfolded, she
Then
would
they
need to
proceeded
remain
along
steady.
the ridge,
This was
vanishing
the
behind
skill
a
her
small
father had
outcrop.
shown her countless times.
The orchard fell
She
silent once
exhaled,
more,
settling
except
into
for the
the
rustle of
calm
dry
that
leaves
precedes
overhead.
decisive action. Night
Rosalind
descended
stayed in
slowly,
position,
each
uncertain
passing
whether the
moment
raiders were
magnifying the
circling
tension
around
that
or
lay
whether they
heavily on the
intended to
region.
pass the property
For
altogether.
Redwood Hollow's scattered
Minutes
defenders,
felt like hours.
vigilance became a shared burden.
She tightened her grip on the rifle,
orchard remained
replaying in her mind
motionless,
every
cloaked in
detail she had
darkness,
planned.
with only starlight
If a
glimmering
confrontation
between the thinning
unfolded,
canopy
she would
of
need
leaves.
to remain steady.
At some distance,
This was
the
the
faint
skill
echo
her
of
father had
gunfire
shown her
or a
countless
raised shout
times.
traveled across the plains,
She exhaled,
although the
settling
source
into the calm
remained
that precedes
unidentifiable
decisive
in the gloom.
action.
Rosalind
Night descended
steadied her
slowly,
breathing,
each passing
aware that the
moment
coming hours
magnifying the
might
tension
reshape
that
her
lay
destiny.
heavily on the
In the
region.
gloom, she thought
For
again of her
Redwood
mother,
Hollow's
who
scattered
had once
defenders,
believed in the
vigilance
orchard's
became a
potential to
shared burden.
flourish. She
The orchard
recalled the
remained
vision of green
motionless,
shoots
cloaked in
pushing through
darkness,
gravelly
with only
soil,
starlight
a
glimmering
testament
between
to
the thinning
tenacity.
canopy of leaves.
As the wind swept
At
across
some
the
distance,
orchard's rows,
the faint echo of
carrying hints
gunfire
of
or a
dust and
raised
pine
shout
resin,
traveled across the
she prepared
plains,
herself for
although
the
the
storm to
source
come.
remained unidentifiable
She
in the
understood
gloom.
that her father's legacy rested
Rosalind
not
steadied
only
her
on his
breathing,
orchard,
aware that
but
the
also
coming
on the
hours
quiet
might reshape her
fortitude he had
destiny.
instilled in her.
In the gloom,
And so
she
she
thought
waited,
again of her mother,
alone in
who
the
had once
shadows,
believed in the orchard's
guarding the
potential
place
to
that had
flourish.
shaped her into someone
She
capable of
recalled the
confronting
vision
an
of green
onrushing
shoots
tide
pushing
of
through
danger.
gravelly soil, a
The
testament
next
to
phase
tenacity.
of Redwood Hollow's struggle was
As the
about to
wind swept
begin,
across the
and
orchard's
she
rows,
intended to meet it
carrying
with
hints
every
of
ounce of
dust and
skill
pine
at her
resin,
command.
she prepared
Night weighed
herself for the
heavily on
storm
the
to come.
orchard, plunging its
She
rows of
understood
withered
that her
trees
father's
into an
legacy
almost
rested
otherworldly
not only on his
darkness.
orchard, but also
The
on the
lantern
quiet
inside the
fortitude
Pierce
he had
cabin
instilled in
remained
her.
dimmed, revealing
And
only
so
a
she
faint glow
waited,
at the
alone in
windows.
the shadows, guarding
Rosalind
the
had
place
taken
that
up
had
a
shaped her
position in
into
the
someone
barn loft,
capable of
peering
confronting an
out through a
onrushing
narrow
tide of
opening
danger.
she had created by
The
prying
next
loose a
phase of
board.
Redwood Hollow's struggle
From
was
that
about to
vantage,
begin,
she saw
and
the
she intended
silhouettes
to
of
meet it with
trees
every
swaying
ounce
in
of
the
skill
soft
at her
wind.
command.
The tension
Night
of the
weighed
previous
heavily on
hours
the orchard,
lingered in her
plunging
mind,
its rows of
along
withered
with the
trees
memory of
into an
seeing
almost
horsemen near the
otherworldly
ridge.
darkness.
Her
The
father lay
lantern
resting in the
inside the
cabin,
Pierce
too
cabin
weak to
remained
maintain a
dim,
vigil,
revealing
trusting
only a
that his
faint
daughter
glow
would
at the
sense any
windows.
approach before it was too
Rosalind
late.
had taken
She
up a position
contemplated
in
the
the barn
neighbors
loft,
who had sought
peering out
glimpses
through
of
a
the
narrow
Braxton
opening
raiders
she
in
had
the
created by
canyon,
prying loose a
wondering if
board.
those men still rode the
From that
ridges,
vantage,
or if
she
they had
saw
been
the
driven
silhouettes of
back by
trees
unseen
swaying in the
threats.
soft wind.
The orchard
The
was
tension of
silent
the
except
previous
for a
hours
distant,
lingered in her
intermittent
mind,
drone of
along with the
insects.
memory of seeing
She
horsemen
listened
near the
intently
ridge.
to the darkness,
Her
wishing
father
she
lay
could
resting in the
pinpoint the
cabin,
whereabouts of
too
the
weak to
outlaws
maintain a
rumored to be
vigil,
converging on
trusting that
Redwood
his daughter
Hollow.
would sense any approach
Small
before
events
it was
took
too
on
late.
amplified meaning.
She
An
contemplated
owl's
the
soft
neighbors who
flutter
had
in the
sought glimpses
branches,
of the
the
Braxton
crack of a
raiders in the
limb
canyon,
yielding to the
wondering if
breeze,
those men
or the
still rode
shuffle
the
of some
ridges or if
nocturnal
they had been
creature
driven back by
investigating
unseen
fallen
threats.
fruit. At
The
times,
orchard was
she
silent
found herself
except for a
holding her
distant,
breath,
intermittent drone of
unsure if a
insects.
faint sound came from an
She
animal
listened
or
intently
from
to
one
the
of
darkness,
Braxton's riders
wishing
edging
she could
closer.
pinpoint the whereabouts of the
Eventually,
outlaws rumored
the
to be
stillness
converging
became
on
nearly
Redwood Hollow.
suffocating, so she
Small
shifted her
events took on
position,
amplified
careful
meaning,
not to
an
disturb the
owl's soft
stacked
flutter
bales
in
of
the
hay
branches,
that surrounded
the crack
her.
of a limb yielding to
Her
the
rifle
breeze,
rested on
or
a
the
makeshift
shuffle of some
ledge,
nocturnal
muzzle
creature
pointed through the
investigating
gap in the
fallen
wall.
fruit.
She
At
had spent
times,
so many
she found
hours
herself
reviewing her
holding her
father's
breath,
instructions
unsure
that
if a
every
faint
step
sound
felt
came
second
from an
nature.
animal or from one of
Each
Braxton's
muscle
riders
movement,
edging
each
closer.
measured inhalation,
Eventually,
aligned with a
the stillness
mindset that
became
sought
nearly
clarity in the
suffocating,
face of
so she
potential
shifted her
chaos.
position, careful
She
not to
managed to
disturb
remain
the stacked
vigilant
bales
throughout
of
the
hay
long
that surrounded
hours,
her.
glancing occasionally
Her
at the
rifle
stars
rested on a
above to
makeshift
gauge how
ledge,
much night
muzzle
remained.
pointed through the gap in the
No
wall.
unwelcome visitors
She had
emerged
spent so
from the
many
blackness.
hours reviewing her
By
father's
dawn, the orchard's
instructions that
soft
every step
gloom had
felt second
lightened,
nature.
revealing the surrounding
Each
terrain
muscle
in
movement,
muted
each
shades of
measured
gray.
inhalation, aligned with a
Rosalind
mindset
rose,
that sought
stretched her
clarity
stiff
in the face
limbs,
of potential
and descended the
chaos.
loft's ladder to check
She
on her
managed to
father.
remain vigilant
He was
throughout the
awake,
long
but
hours,
lacked the energy to
glancing
move from
occasionally
bed,
at the
so
stars
she
above to
inspected his
gauge how much
condition,
night
made
remained.
sure he had water,
No
and offered him a
unwelcome
bit of
visitors
leftover
emerged
broth.
from the blackness.
A quiet
By
understanding
dawn,
passed
the
between them.
orchard's soft
No
gloom
words
had
were
lightened,
exchanged,
revealing
but
the
they both
surrounding
knew that
terrain
the
in
orchard
muted
hovered on
shades
the
of
edge
gray.
of confrontation. The
Rosalind
potential
rose,
for conflict
stretched
seemed
her
to
stiff
intensify
limbs,
with every
and
passing
descended the
day,
loft's ladder to
each
check
moment
on
of
her father.
silence a sign that the
He
outlaws
was
might
awake,
still be
but lacked
choosing
the
where
energy
and
to
when
move
to
from
strike.
bed, so she inspected
Outside,
his condition,
she began her
made
morning
sure he had
chores,
water,
her
and
gaze
offered him a
drifting
bit of
often toward
leftover
the
broth.
horizon.
A
The
quiet
orchard took
understanding
on a
passed
certain
between
bleak
them.
beauty
No
under a
words were
sky
exchanged,
veiled with
but they
pale
both
cloud
knew that the
cover.
orchard hovered on the
The
edge of
leaves,
confrontation.
now well into their
The
seasonal
potential
decline,
for
had
conflict seemed to
accumulated in dry
intensify with
piles
every
against the
passing
fence
day,
posts,
each moment of
and the
silence
apples
a
that still
sign that
clung
the
to
outlaws
branches
might
were
still be
smaller and
choosing
more
where and
shriveled
when to
than they
strike.
should have been.
Outside,
Yet the place
she
still
began her
retained a
morning
dignified
chores,
calm
her
that she
gaze
found
drifting often
reassuring.
toward the horizon.
This was the land her
The
family
orchard
had
took on a
nurtured
certain
despite
weak beauty
hardships.
under a sky
Any
veiled
threat
with
against
pale
it felt
cloud cover.
intensely personal.
The
Shortly
leaves,
before
now
midday,
well
she
into
heard
their
the
seasonal
rumble of
decline,
approaching
had
hooves from the main
accumulated in
road.
dry piles against
She
the
left the
fence
barn to
posts,
investigate,
and the apples
pausing
that
near a
still
patch
clung
of
to
overgrown
branches were
shrubs.
smaller and more
A
shriveled
lone
than they
rider
should have
appeared,
been.
traveling at a
Yet the
moderate
place
pace.
still retained a
He wore a
dignified
weathered
calm
coat
that
and
she
guided
found
his horse
reassuring.
carefully, as though wary
This
of
was the land
ambush.
her family had nurtured
Rosalind
despite
recognized him
hardships.
as one of the ranchers who
Any
lived
threat
closer
against
to
it felt
Redwood Hollow
intensely
Center.
personal.
He carried what
Shortly
looked like a
before
rifle
midday,
scabbard
she
along
heard the
his
rumble of
saddle,
approaching
and he
hooves
glanced
from the main
repeatedly
road.
over his shoulder.
She left the
Sensing
barn
no
to
immediate
investigate.
threat, she allowed him to come
Pausing
closer.
near a patch of overgrown
He did not
shrubs,
approach the cabin or
a
speak
lone
aloud,
rider
but
appeared,
he slowed near
traveling
the
at a
orchard
moderate
fence,
pace.
scanning the property.
He wore a weathered coat
After a
and
few
guided
moments,
his horse
he
carefully,
urged his
as
horse
though
forward
wary of
along the
ambush.
road, disappearing from
Rosalind
view.
recognized recognized him as
demeanor
one of the
suggested
ranchers
that a
who
sort
lived
of
closer
informal
to Redwood
patrol
Hollow
might be
Center.
underway,
He
individuals
carried what
venturing
looked
out
like
to
a
keep
rifle
watch over
scabbard
the more
along his
isolated
saddle,
homesteads.
and he glanced
The
repeatedly
orchard,
over
in
his
its
shoulder.
outlying location, likely
Sensing
drew
no
their
immediate
concern.
threat, she
As the
allowed him
hours
to come
wore on,
closer.
the sun
He
emerged
did
from
not
behind
approach
thin
the cabin or
clouds,
speak aloud,
shedding a harsher
but he
light
slowed
on the
near the
parched
orchard
terrain.
fence, scanning the property.
The orchard's shadows shortened,
After a few
and the
moments,
temperature
he
rose
urged
enough
his
to
horse
stir a
forward
dusty
along
haze
the road,
along the roads.
disappearing from view.
Rosalind used the
His
daylight
demeanor
to
suggested
finalize
that a
small
sort of
defensive
informal patrol
adjustments,
might be
tying a few
underway,
extra boards to the
individuals
fence
venturing
line
out
to
to
create
keep
more
watch over the
solid
more
cover.
isolated homesteads.
She positioned an old
The
water
orchard,
trough
in
in
its
such a way
outlying
that it might
location,
slow any
likely
mounted
drew their
riders if
concern.
they charged the orchard
As
directly.
the hours wore on,
Although
the sun
these measures
emerged
could
from
not
behind thin
transform the
clouds,
homestead
shedding
into a
a harsher
fortress,
light on the
they might
parched
provide
terrain.
fleeting advantages
The
in a moment
orchard's
of
shadows
crisis.
shortened,
Her
and
mind
the
wandered
temperature
to
rose
Redwood
enough to stir a dusty
picturing the
haze
sheriff
along the
attempting to
roads.
coordinate volunteers.
Rosalind used
She
the
imagined
daylight to
townspeople
finalize
boarding
small
up
defensive
windows,
adjustments,
rummaging through
tying
old
a few
trunks for
extra
any
boards to
functional
the fence line
firearms,
to create
and
more
weighing
solid
the merits
cover.
of fleeing versus
She
standing their
positioned an old
ground.
water trough in such
The
a way
saloon
that
would
it
likely
might slow
remain
any
open,
mounted riders
if only
they
because it
charged
offered
the
a
orchard
final
directly.
refuge for worried ranch
Although
hands or
these measures
travelers
could not
passing
transform
through.
the homestead into a
The telegraph
fortress,
operator
they
might
might
be
provide
sending frantic
fleeting
messages
advantages
to
in a
nearby
moment of
counties,
crisis.
pleading for
Her
assistance
mind
that would
wandered to
likely
Redwood
arrive too
Hollow,
late.
picturing the sheriff
These
attempting to
images
coordinate
underscored the
volunteers.
vulnerability of the region.
She imagined
The
townspeople
orchard,
boarding up
solitary
windows,
as it was,
rummaging through old
remained
trunks
both a
for any
potential
functional
target
firearms,
and a place where she
and
could
weighing the
leverage
merits
her
of fleeing
experience.
versus standing their ground.
She found a measure of calm
The
in her
saloon
father's
would likely
teachings,
remain open,
confident
if
that
only because
watchfulness
it
could
offered a
bridge the
final
gap
refuge
between
for worried
surprise and
ranch hands or
survival.
travelers
Toward late
passing
afternoon, faint
The
gunfire
telegraph
echoed from the
operator might be
southeast.
sending frantic
The shots
messages to
came in
nearby
short
counties,
bursts, then
pleading for
ceased,
assistance
as though
that
a
would likely
skirmish had
arrive too
concluded
late.
quickly.
These
She could not
images
determine the
underscored the
distance, but she
vulnerability of
guessed
the
it was
region.
somewhere between the orchard
The
and
orchard,
Redwood Hollow,
solitary as
or
it
possibly
was,
even
remained
beyond.
both a potential
A
target and
tightening
a
in her
place where she
chest
could leverage her
signaled that this might
experience.
be the first hint of
She found
Braxton's
a
men
measure of
engaging
calm in
local
her father's
defenders,
teachings,
testing the
confident that
area's
watchfulness
response.
could bridge the gap
She
between
considered
surprise and
riding out to
survival.
gather more information, but
Toward late
decided against
afternoon,
it.
faint gunfire
The orchard
echoed
had to
from the
remain
southeast.
guarded, and she did not
The
want to
shots
leave her
came in
father
short
alone in
bursts,
his
then
weakened
ceased,
state.
as though a skirmish had
Though
concluded
frustration
quickly.
gnawed at her,
She could
she
not
reminded
determine the
herself that
distance,
patience
but
was
she guessed
essential.
it was somewhere
Twilight
between the orchard
approached,
and Redwood
and the
Hollow,
crimson
or
hue of the
possibly
sky
even
offered an
beyond.
unsettling
A
contrast to the
tightening in her
orchard's
chest
darkening
signaled that
rows of
this might be the
trees.
first hint of
She
Braxton's
stationed
men
herself again
engaging
in the
local
barn
defenders,
loft, having
testing the
confirmed
area's
that her
response.
father was as comfortable as
She considered
circumstances
riding out to
allowed.
gather more information,
This time,
but decided
however, she
against
felt
it.
a heightened
The orchard
sense of
had to remain
urgency.
guarded,
The
and she did
sporadic
not want to leave
gunfire
her father
earlier in the
alone in
day
his weakened
suggested
state.
that events were
Though
escalating.
frustration gnawed at
She
her,
watched
she
the ridge
reminded
lines,
herself that patience
anticipating
was
that
essential.
mounted figures might appear
Twilight
as dusk
approached,
settled.
and the crimson hue
For a
of the
long
sky
stretch,
offered an
nothing
unsettling
stirred except the
contrast
wind,
to the
which
orchard's
rattled the
darkening
shutters
rows
on
of
the cabin.
trees.
Eventually,
She
her
stationed
vigilance was
herself again
rewarded
in the barn
or
loft,
punished
having
by
confirmed
movement
that her
along a
father
narrow
was as
dirt
comfortable
track
as
that branched
circumstances
off the
allowed.
main road.
This time,
Several shapes
however,
on
she
horseback
felt a
glided
heightened
into
sense
view,
of urgency.
barely distinguishable
The
against the dim
sporadic gunfire
backdrop.
earlier in the
She
day
counted at
suggested
least
that
3
events were
riders,
escalating.
possibly more trailing behind.
She watched the ridgelines,
They appeared to be
anticipating
traveling
that mounted
slowly,
figures
as
might
if
appear
scouting
as
each
dusk
property
settled.
they passed,
For a
searching for
long
lights
stretch,
or signs of
nothing stirred
occupancy.
except the wind,
Her
which
pulse
rattled the
quickened.
shutters on the cabin.
If these were Braxton's
Eventually,
men,
her
their
vigilance
presence
was
so close
rewarded,
to the
or
orchard meant
punished,
that the main
by
wave
movement
could not
along
be far
a narrow
behind.
dirt track that branched
She
off the main
tensed,
road.
recalling her father's guidance
Several
about
shapes on
choosing when to
horseback glided
engage.
into view, barely
Firing
distinguishable
prematurely
against
would
the dim
reveal her
backdrop.
position. Waiting
She
too
counted
long
at
could
least
invite
3
them to
riders,
circle the barn and
possibly
cut
more
off any
trailing
escape
behind.
routes. The riders
They
paused
appeared
at the
to be
far
traveling
fence,
slowly,
their
as
silhouettes
if
still
scouting
too
each
murky
property
to
they
identify
passed,
individually.
searching for lights or
One
signs of
dismounted,
occupancy.
moving closer to the
Her
wooden
pulse
posts.
quickened.
Rosalind
If
saw
these
the
were
faint glint
Braxton's
of a
men,
lantern
their
or small
presence so
light
close
source,
to the orchard
though the
meant that
flame
the
was
main
kept
wave
low.
could not be far
The
behind.
man seemed to be testing the
She
fence's
tensed,
sturdiness
recalling her
or searching
father's
for a
guidance
gap.
about choosing when
Another
to engage.
figure remained on horseback,
Firing
scanning the
prematurely
property from
would
a higher
reveal her
vantage.
position.
She
Waiting
heard
too
low
long
voices
could invite
but
them
could
to
not
circle
make
the
out
barn and
distinct
cut off any
words.
escape routes.
A moment later, the
The riders
dismounted
paused
figure
at the
returned
far
to his
fence,
horse,
their
and the group
silhouettes still
continued
too murky
forward,
to identify
eventually
individually.
disappearing down the trail that
One
skirted the
dismounted,
orchard.
moving
Relief
closer to the
mingled with
wooden
apprehension.
posts.
The orchard was
Rosalind
evidently
saw
under
the faint
surveillance,
glint of a
yet for
lantern or small
now
light
it was either
source,
not
though
deemed
the
a
flame was
priority
kept
or
low.
the riders intended to
The
return
man
with
seemed
more
to be
men.
testing the fence's sturdiness
Rosalind
or
waited
searching
until she
for a
was
gap.
sure they would not loop back.
Another figure
Her
remained on
heartbeat
horseback,
remained elevated,
scanning the
and her
property
focus
from
on
a
the
higher
empty space
vantage.
they left behind was
She heard low
unrelenting.
voices
She
but could not
anticipated
make
that
out
this would
distinct
only be the
words.
beginning of a longer,
A moment
more
later,
determined
the dismounted
approach.
figure returned
Once she
to
felt
his horse,
confident they
and
were
the group
gone,
continued
she descended to
forward,
ground
eventually
level,
disappearing
quietly
down the
circling
trail
the
that
orchard to
skirted the
ensure no
orchard.
one had lingered behind the
Relief
trees.
mingled with apprehension.
Nothing suggested immediate
The
danger.
orchard was
The
evidently
next
under
morning, she
surveillance,
carried out a
yet for
thorough
now,
inspection.
it was either not
She
deemed a
found fresh
priority or
hoofprints
the
near the
riders
fence,
intended to
confirming
return
that her
with more
nighttime nighttime observations had not been a
Rosalind
trick of
waited
her
until she was sure
imagination.
they would not loop
The
back.
fence itself bore no
Her
overt
heartbeat
damage,
remained
but
elevated,
one
and
section
her
showed
focus on
signs
the
that
empty
someone had
space they
tested
left
its
behind
boards.
was unrelenting.
She considered this
She
further evidence
anticipated
that the
that this would
Braxton
only be the
Raiders had
beginning of
begun
a
to
longer,
probe
more
outlying
determined
homesteads.
approach.
She also
Once she
noticed
felt
footprints
confident
in
they
the
were
dirt
gone,
near a
she
tall
descended
juniper
to
tree,
ground level,
as though a
quietly
scout had
circling
stood
the
there
orchard to
briefly
ensure
watching the
no one had
property.
lingered behind the trees.
The infiltration felt
Nothing
personal,
suggested
an
immediate
intrusion on
danger.
sacred ground that her
The next
family
morning,
had toiled
she
on
carried
for
out a
so
thorough
many
inspection.
years. She
She
thought of her
found fresh
father's
hoofprints near the
unwavering
fence,
persistence,
confirming that her
even as the
nighttime
orchard struggled
observations had
against
not been
poor
a trick of
soil
her
and brutal
imagination.
weather, Now
The
that
fence
same
itself
tenacity
bore
would
no
be
overt
required to
damage,
protect the
but one
orchard from
section
human
showed
threats.
signs that
During
someone
the
had
midday
tested its
lull, while
boards.
her father dozed,
She
she
considered this
reorganized
further
essential
evidence that
items.
the Braxton
She
raiders
placed
had
extra
begun to
water
probe outlying
containers near the
homesteads.
barn in case a prolonged
She also
firefight
noticed
forced her to
footprints
remain
in the
in
dirt
cover.
near a tall juniper
She dragged
tree,
a heavy
as though
wooden
a
crate
scout
to the
had stood there
cabin's side
briefly,
window,
watching the
creating a
property.
more stable rest for
The
her rifle if
infiltration
she
felt
needed to
personal,
switch from the
an
barn
intrusion
loft
on
to a
sacred
ground-level
ground that her
vantage.
family had toiled on
She
for
also
so many
gathered
years.
blankets and stored them in a
She thought
discreet
of her
corner of
father's
the barn,
unwavering persistence,
recognizing
even
that
as
if
the
a
orchard
siege
struggled
lasted
against
multiple
poor
nights,
soil
she
and
might
brutal
need some
weather.
comfort to maintain her
Now,
alertness.
that same tenacity
In
would
each
be
movement,
required
she
to
felt the
protect
weight
the
of having
orchard
to
from
plan
human
for
threats.
contingencies that her younger
During the
self
midday
could never
lull,
have
while
envisioned.
her father dozed,
That evening,
she
a neighbor
reorganized
arrived with a
essential
grim
items.
report of a small-scale
She placed
raid on a
extra water
ranch farther
containers
to the
near
west.
the barn, in case a
According to
prolonged
scattered
firefight
accounts,
forced her
half
to
a dozen
remain in cover.
riders, presumably
She
Braxton's
dragged a heavy wooden
associates,
crate
had
to the
descended on the
cabin's side
property,
window,
stolen a
creating
few
a more
horses,
stable
and
rest for
fired
her
shots
rifle
to
if
chase
she
off
needed
the
to switch
terrified
from the barn
residents.
loft to a
No one had
ground-level
been killed,
vantage.
but the sense of
She also
violation was
gathered
palpable.
blankets and stored
The
them in a
neighbor
discreet
appeared
corner of
rattled,
the barn,
urging Rosalind to
recognizing that if
remain
a
on
siege
guard,
lasted
then
multiple
rode on
nights,
to deliver
she
the
might
same
need some
message to
comfort to
others.
maintain her alertness.
She watched him depart,
In each
feeling a
movement,
flare of
she
anger at
felt
the
the weight
raiders'
of having to
tactics.
plan for
They were
contingencies that her younger
systematically
self
striking,
could never have
sowing
envisioned.
fear, and wearing down
That
the
evening,
region's
a
resolve
neighbor
without
arrived with
launching
a
a
grim
single
report of a
decisive
small-scale
assault.
raid on a
Sleep
ranch
became
farther to
elusive.
the west.
The orchard's
According to
creaks and
scattered
groans at
accounts,
night
half
felt
a dozen
amplified,
riders,
as though
presumably
everything
Braxton's
carried a hidden
associates,
menace.
had descended on the property,
In the loft,
stolen
she
a few
found a
horses,
certain measure of
and fired
composure by
shots to
recalling
chase
her
off the
father's
terrified
lessons on
residents.
breath control.
No one had been
She
killed,
would inhale,
but the sense of
hold for a
violation
moment,
was palpable.
then exhale slowly,
The neighbor
allowing
appeared
tension
rattled,
to drain
urging
from her
Rosalind
limbs.
to remain on guard,
Repetition of
then
those
rode on
steps
to
helped
deliver
align
the
her
same
mind
message
with the
to others.
unrelenting quiet around
She
her.
watched him depart,
Sometimes she
feeling a
thought she
flare of
heard a
anger
distant
at the
echo
raiders'
of
tactics.
hoofbeats or voices, but
They
they
were
never drew close
systematically
enough to
striking,
confirm.
sowing fear,
She remained
and wearing
vigilant,
down the
her
region's
rifle
resolve
always
without
within
launching a
arm's
single
reach.
decisive
Near
assault.
dawn, she noticed a faint
Sleep became
illumination to
elusive.
the southwest,
The
an
orchard's
orange
creaks
glow
and
against
groans
the
at night
sky
felt
that might have been the
amplified,
first
as
light
though
of day
everything
or
carried a
something
hidden
more
menace.
ominous. As
In
it
the
grew
loft,
more pronounced,
she found a
she
certain measure
realized
of
it was no
composure by
natural
recalling her
sunrise.
father's lessons on
The
breath
hue,
control.
flickering and intense,
She would inhale,
suggested a
hold for a
fire
moment,
in that direction.
then exhale slowly,
Alarmed,
allowing
she climbed
tension to
down
drain
and stepped
from her limbs.
outside, observing more
Repetition
carefully.
of those steps helped
Yes,
align her
it was
mind with the
definitely a blaze of
unrelenting
some
quiet
sort.
around her.
The orchard's vantage did
Sometimes
not
she
permit a
thought she
clear
heard a
view,
distant echo of
but the color
hoofbeats
was
or voices,
unmistakable.
but they never
The
drew
night
close
sky
enough to
reflected the
confirm.
flame,
She
illuminating the
remained
horizon
vigilant,
in an
her rifle
otherworldly
always
glow.
within arm's reach.
She suspected an act of
Near
arson
dawn,
or an
she
accidental
noticed a
barn
faint
fire at a
illumination to
vulnerable
the
ranch.
southwest, an orange
Either
glow
way,
against
it
the sky
underscored the
that might have been the
precariousness
first
of the
light of
region's
day or something
situation.
more ominous.
When true morning light arrived,
As it
she
grew more
completed her
pronounced,
daily round
she
of the
realized
orchard,
it was no natural
keeping an eye on the
sunrise.
horizon for signs
The
of lingering
hue,
smoke.
flickering and intense,
The air carried a faint
suggested a
smell
fire
of
in
charred
that
wood,
direction.
drifting from whatever had
Alarmed,
burned
she
overnight.
climbed down and stepped
Her stomach
outside,
churned at the
observing
thought
more
of a family
carefully.
losing their livelihood
Yes,
in an
it was
instant.
definitely a blaze of some
Redwood Hollow
sort.
lacked the manpower
The
to
orchard's
respond
vantage
effectively
did
to
not
such
permit a clear
incidents,
view,
forcing
but the
each
color was
homestead into a
unmistakable.
lonely stand.
The
As
night
midday
sky
approached,
reflected
she
the
made the
flame,
decision to
illuminating
ride
the
toward the
horizon
eastern
in an
ridge,
otherworldly glow.
hoping to gain a higher vantage
She
from which she
suspected
could
an
scan
act
the
of
region.
arson or an
She
accidental barn
informed her
fire
father,
at a vulnerable
ensuring
ranch.
he understood the reason for
Either
her
way,
absence.
it underscored the
Then she
precariousness
saddled
of
one
the
of the
region's
homestead's
situation.
horses, a sturdy
When
bay
true
that had
morning
enough
light
endurance
arrived,
for a
she
brief
completed her
expedition.
daily round of the
She
orchard,
maintained caution,
keeping an eye on the
keeping to
horizon
lesser
for
known
signs of
paths
lingering
rather
smoke.
than the main roads.
The air
The
carried a
orchard
faint
grew
smell of
distant
charred
behind
wood,
her,
drifting
soon
from
hidden
whatever
by
had burned
undulating
overnight.
hills. She
Her
pressed on
stomach
until she
churned
found
at
a
the thought
rocky
of a family
slope that
losing
offered
their
a partial
livelihood
view of
in an
Redwood
instant.
Hollow and the surrounding
Redwood
valleys.
Hollow lacked
From
the
that
manpower
elevated
to respond
position, she
effectively
observed
to
subtle
such
motions
incidents,
across the
forcing
landscape.
each homestead into
Tiny
a lonely
columns of
stand.
smoke curled from
As
scattered
midday
branches,
approached, she
indicating
made the
that people
decision to
were
ride
cooking or
toward the
boiling
eastern
water.
ridge, hoping to
A
gain
pair
a
of
higher
riders
vantage
appeared on
from
the
which she
road
could
leading
scan
out
the
of
region.
Redwood Hollow, though
She
she could not
informed her
determine
father,
their purpose.
ensuring he understood the
She
reason
searched
for
the
her
horizon
absence.
for any masked force of
Then
outlaws
she saddled one of the
or a
homestead's
caravan that
horses,
might signal
a
the
sturdy
Braxton
bay that
Raiders'
had
main
enough
body.
endurance for a brief expedition.
Nothing conclusive stood out.
She maintained caution,
If Braxton was
keeping to
gathering his
lesser-known
men for a
paths
final
rather
push,
than the main
they were
roads.
maintaining a careful approach.
The orchard grew
She then
distant
turned her
behind
attention to
soon
the
hidden
orchard's
by
direction,
undulating hills.
satisfied to see no sign
She
of
pressed
intruders
on
in
until
the
she found
immediate
a
vicinity.
rocky slope that offered a partial
Relieved,
view of
she
Redwood
nudged her
Hollow
horse
and the
to circle
surrounding
back.
valleys.
The ride
From
home
that
was
elevated
marked by a
position,
subtle unease,
she observed
a
subtle
sense
motions
that the
across
region
the
teetered
landscape.
on the brink of something far
Tiny
larger.
columns of smoke
She spotted
curled
a
from
lone
scattered
coyote
branches,
darting between
indicating that
sparse
people were
shrubs,
cooking or
startling her
boiling water.
momentarily until she
A pair
recognized
of
it for what
riders
it
appeared
was.
on the road leading out
Returning
of
to
Redwood
the
Hollow,
orchard, she
though
found
she could
nothing
not
amiss.
determine their purpose.
Her father was awake, though
She
clearly
searched the
drained,
horizon for
and she
any
resumed
masked
her
force
role
of
as
outlaws
caretaker,
or a caravan
balancing
that
that
might
concern
signal the
with her
Braxton
unwavering
Raiders' main
vigilance.
body.
Around dusk,
Nothing
the sky took
conclusive
on a
stood
moody
out.
hue, deep
If
blues and
Braxton was
purples
gathering his
merging with
men
the
for a
outline
final
of the
push,
hills.
they were maintaining
She
a
climbed
careful
into the
approach.
barn loft once more,
She then
rifle at
turned
the
her
ready.
attention to the orchard's
This
direction,
time, the weight felt
satisfied to see no
interminable,
sign of
stretching
intruders
late
in
into
the
the
immediate
night.
vicinity.
Clouds drifted
Relieved,
across the moon,
she nudged her
throwing
horse to
shifting
circle back.
shadows over the orchard.
The ride home
She
was
remained
marked by a
still,
subtle
fighting
unease,
the ache
a
in her
sense that the
muscles.
region teetered on the brink
Eventually,
of something
the
far
monotony
larger.
ended when she discerned
She
movement
spotted a
along the
lone
orchard's
coyote
perimeter.
darting between sparse
A small
shrubs,
group of mounted
startling her
figures slipped in
momentarily
from the
until
west,
she
nearly
recognized it for
invisible
what it
among the
was.
dark shapes of trees and
Returning
fence
to the
lines.
orchard,
They
she
dismounted
found
near the
nothing
barn,
amiss.
possibly intending to
Her
approach
father
on
was
foot.
awake, though
Their
clearly
outlines
drained,
betrayed a
and she
coordinated
resumed
effort.
her role as caretaker,
One figure inspected the
balancing
fence
their
while
concern
two
with
others
her
split off,
unwavering
heading toward
vigilance.
the orchard center.
Around dusk,
Rosalind
the
forced
sky
herself
took
to
on a
remain
moody
steady,
hue,
heart
deep
pounding.
blues and purples merging
If
with
these
the
were
outline
indeed
of the
Braxton's
hills.
men, they had chosen
She
a
climbed
stealthy
into the barn
strategy
loft
rather than
once more,
charging in with
rifle at the
noise
ready.
and gunfire.
This time,
She leveled
the
the
wake
rifle
felt
at the
interminable,
silhouettes,
stretching late
evaluating
into
which
the night.
target represented the
Clouds
greatest
drifted
immediate
across
threat.
the moon,
She
throwing
estimated the
shifting
distance,
shadows over the
felt
orchard.
the wind, and rehearsed
She
her father's
remained still,
fundamental
fighting
lessons in
the
her
ache
mind.
in her muscles.
A brief, tense moment
Eventually,
followed.
the monotony
The
ended
intruders
when she
paused
discerned
as though
movement
sensing
along
something.
the orchard's perimeter.
One of them
A
crouched
small
behind
group
a
of
barrel
mounted
near the
figures
cabin's
slipped in
side,
from the west,
apparently
nearly
unsure whether the
invisible
orchard's
among the dark
occupants were
shapes of
awake.
trees and fence lines.
Rosalind decided that
They
revealing herself
dismounted
too
near the
soon
barn,
might provoke
possibly
a
intending
prolonged
to approach on
exchange.
foot.
Still,
Their
letting
outlines
them roam
betrayed a
freely
coordinated
threatened the
effort.
safety of her father,
One
who
figure
remained in
inspected
the cabin
fence
with
while
limited
two others
mobility.
split off, heading
The
toward
orchard
the
had
orchard
become
center.
a stage for a critical choice.
Rosalind forced herself to
She
remain
exhaled
steady,
slowly,
heart pounding.
striving for the clarity
If
that
these
guided
were
her
indeed
marksmanship.
Braxton's men, they had
Then she
chosen a
applied
stealthy
gentle pressure
strategy
to the
rather
trigger,
than charging in
loosing a
with
single
noise and
shot
gunfire.
aimed at the ground near the
She
barrel.
leveled the rifle at the
The sudden
silhouettes,
crack of the rifle
evaluating
shattered
which
the
target
silence,
represented the
and
greatest
sparks
immediate
flared where the
threat.
bullet struck earth.
She
The
estimated
man
the distance,
crouching there
felt
jerked
the
back
wind,
in alarm,
and
nearly
rehearsed her
toppling
father's
over.
fundamental lessons
Rather than
in her
attempt a
mind.
second shot, she remained
brief,
hidden,
tense
relying on
moment
the
followed.
intimidation of that near
The
miss.
intruders paused,
The
as though
intruders
sensing
scrambled
something.
for cover, apparently
One of
taken
them
aback
crouched
by the
behind a
unseen
barrel near
shooter.
the cabin side,
Someone hissed
apparently unsure
instructions,
whether the
and in
orchard's
the commotion
occupants
she
were
spotted
awake.
two figures retreating toward
Rosalind
their
decided
horses.
that revealing
A
herself
third
too
tried to
soon
flatten
might provoke
himself
a
behind a
prolonged
fence
exchange.
post. The orchard pulsed
Still,
with tension,
letting them roam
every
freely
leaf and
threatened the
branch seeming
safety
to
of her
vibrate
father,
with the
who
echoes of
remained in the
gunfire.
cabin with limited mobility.
She held her position,
The
scanning
orchard
for
had
a clear
become a
shot
stage
if one
for a
advanced
critical
toward the
choice.
cabin. For a few
She
harrowing
exhaled
minutes,
slowly,
no one moved.
striving for the
The
clarity
orchard's
that guided
darkness
her
concealed
marksmanship.
both her vantage point
Then
and
she
the
applied
intruder's
gentle pressure
precise
to the trigger,
locations.
loosing a single
She
shot
listened
aimed
for
at
the
the
sound of
ground near the
boots on
barrel.
grass, or the clink
The
of a
sudden
rifle
crack
butt
of the
striking
rifle
wood,
shattered the silence,
anything that would
and
betray
sparks
their
flared
next
where the
move.
bullet struck earth.
Finally, the figure
The man
behind the fence
crouching there
post
jerked
pulled
back in
away,
alarm,
scuttling
nearly
toward the
toppling
horses
over.
with measured caution.
Rather than
The
attempt a
group
second
gathered
shot,
hurriedly,
she
then
remained
mounted,
hidden, relying on
receding
the
into the gloom as
intimidation of that
quickly as they
near
had
miss.
come.
The
She
intruders
waited,
scrambled
heart
for cover,
hammering,
apparently
unsure if
taken
they had
aback
left a
by the
scout
unseen
behind.
shooter.
The orchard
Someone
fell
hissed
back into thick
instructions,
silence,
and in the commotion,
broken only by
she
her own
spotted
pulse
two figures
thrumming in her
retreating
ears.
toward their horses.
After what felt like an
A
eternity,
third tried
she
to
descended,
flatten himself
keeping her
behind a
rifle
fence
ready,
post.
and examined the perimeter.
The orchard pulsed with
The
tension,
intruders had
every leaf
vanished,
and branch
leaving
seeming
scuffed
to
boot
vibrate
prints
with
near the
the echoes
barn
of
and a few
gunfire.
fresh marks on the fence.
She held her position,
The orchard
scanning
itself
for a clear
remained
shot
intact,
if one advanced
though the
toward
near
the cabin.
confrontation underscored
For a
that the
few
threat was
harrowing
now
minutes,
concrete.
no one moved.
This had not
The
been
orchard's
idle
darkness
reconnaissance.
concealed both her
These
vantage
individuals
point and the
likely
intruder's
intended to
precise
test how
locations.
vulnerable the homestead was.
She listened for the sound of
She
boots
checked
on
on her
grass,
father,
or
who
the
lay
clink of a
awake,
rifle but
his
striking
eyes
wood,
reflecting the
anything
recent
that would betray
turmoil
their next
despite
move.
his frailty.
Finally,
In a
the
quiet,
figure behind the
unspoken
fence post
understanding,
pulled away,
they recognized
scuttling
that the
toward the
orchard's
horses with
anonymity had
measured
been
caution.
shattered. The
The group
outlaws
gathered
knew
hurriedly,
someone
then
skillful
mounted,
was prepared to
receding
resist.
into the gloom as
Morning
quickly
found
as
her
they had
tending
come.
once more to the perimeter,
She waited,
her cheeks
heart
tight
hammering,
with the tension
unsure
of the
if they had
previous
left a
night's
scout
events.
behind.
She sifted
The
through
orchard
the
fell back
footprints
into
in the
thick
dirt,
silence,
verifying
broken
at least
only by her
3
own
distinct
pulse
sets.
thrumming in her ears.
While one might have left
After
behind
what
a
felt
faint
like an
smear of
eternity,
blood,
she
there
descended,
was no sign of
keeping
a
her
serious
rifle
injury.
ready, and examined
It seemed
the
her
perimeter.
warning shot had served its
The
purpose,
intruders had
to
vanished,
disorient
leaving
rather than
scuffed
kill.
footprints near the barn
She
and a few
reflected
fresh
on the
marks
moral
on the
weight of
fence.
such decisions.
The orchard
Her father
itself
had
remained
insisted
intact,
that lethal
though the
force
near
be a last
confrontation
resort,
underscored that
not
the
a
threat
first
was now
impulse.
concrete.
Yet, as the
This had not
situation
been idle
worsened,
reconnaissance.
she doubted any
These
measure of
individuals
restraint
likely
would deter
intended
the
to test
Braxton
how
raiders
vulnerable the homestead
indefinitely.
was.
Out in Redwood Hollow,
She
the
checked
rumor
on her
mill
father,
churned
who
with
lay
tales
awake,
of similar
his eyes
nighttime
reflecting the
incursions.
recent turmoil
Several
despite his
ranchers had
frailty.
reported encountering
In a
unknown
quiet,
riders testing their
unspoken
fences,
understanding, they
attempting to cut
recognized that
lines
the
or
orchard's
scaring off
anonymity had
livestock.
been shattered.
None of these
The
engagements had
outlaws knew
escalated
someone
into
skillful was
full-blown
prepared
battles,
to resist.
but the pattern was
Morning
impossible
found
to
her
ignore.
tending once more to the
The
perimeter,
outlaws were
her
prodding
cheeks
at the
tight with
region,
the tension
mapping
of the previous
defenses,
night's events.
and gauging how much
She
resistance they
sifted
might
through the
face
footprints
once
in
the
the
time
dirt,
came for a
verifying at
decisive
least
strike.
3 distinct
That day,
sets.
A messenger
While
arrived
one
at the
might have
orchard.
left behind a faint
He
smear
was a
of
young
blood,
man with
there was no
dust-covered
sign of a
clothes who
serious
rode a
injury.
nervous, sweat-lathered
It seemed her
horse.
warning shot had
He bore
served its
tidings
purpose,
that the
to
sheriff was calling
disorient
for
rather
any
than kill.
remaining able-bodied
She
individuals to
reflected on the
muster near
moral
the
weight of such
settlement,
decisions.
anticipating that a
Her
large-scale
father had
assault
insisted
could
that lethal
materialize
force be a
soon.
last resort, not
Though
a
the
first
messenger
impulse.
could not confirm exact
Yet
details
as
of
the
the raiders'
situation
plan,
worsened,
he
she
cited
doubted
enough
any measure
sightings
of
and small
restraint would
raids
deter
to
the
suggest a
Braxton
major
raiders
confrontation
indefinitely.
loomed.
Out in Redwood
Rosalind
Hollow,
listened
the rumor
gravely,
mill
but she
churned with
refrained
tales
from
of
joining
similar
the muster
nighttime
for reasons she
incursions.
already understood.
Several
She
ranchers
had a
had
duty to
reported
her father
encountering
and to the
unknown
orchard,
riders testing
which,
their
left
fences,
unprotected,
attempting
could
to cut
fall
lines,
quickly.
or scaring
The
off
young
livestock.
messenger seemed to register her
None of these
determination and
engagements
pressed
have
on to the next
escalated into
homestead
full-blown
without further
battles,
argument.
but the
With
pattern
each
was
passing
impossible
hour,
to ignore.
the orchard stood on the brink
The
of a
outlaws
collision
were
between
prodding
the
at the
tranquility
region,
of its
mapping
rows
defenses,
and the brutal
and gauging how
reality
much
of a looming
resistance they
conflict.
might face once the time came
Rosalind's
for a
routine
decisive
grew
strike.
austere, focused
That
solely
day,
on
a
readiness.
messenger arrived at
She
the
slept
orchard.
in brief intervals,
He was a young
occupying
man
a
with
shallow
dust-covered
rest that
clothes
allowed
who
her
rode
to
a
awaken
nervous,
at the slightest
sweat-lathered
sound.
horse.
By day,
He
she
bore
maintained
tidings
the
that the
homestead,
sheriff was calling for
rotated
any
between
remaining
vantage
able-bodied
points, and
individuals to
verified her
muster near the
supply of
settlement,
ammunition.
anticipating that
Her
a
father,
large-scale
too weak
assault
to
could
stand watch,
materialize soon.
offered moral support
Though the
through
messenger
small
could not
gestures.
confirm exact
He would
details
nod
of the raiders'
approvingly
plan,
when she
he cited
demonstrated a
enough
new
sightings
defensive
and small
measure
raids to
or
suggest
tested
a
the
major
rifle's
confrontation
mechanism.
loomed.
His silent way
Rosalind
of
listened
reinforcing
gravely,
that their
but
bond,
she refrained from
forged
joining
through
the
years
muster
of
for
shared
reasons she
hardship,
already
now
understood.
found its ultimate test.
She had a duty
As the
to her
sun
father
dipped
and to the
low
orchard,
one late afternoon,
which, left
the orchard's
unprotected,
shadows
could fall
stretched into
quickly.
elongated shapes
The young
that crawled
messenger
across the
seemed to
ground.
register her determination
Another
and
neighbor
pressed on
stopped
to the
by,
next
just
homestead
for a
without
moment,
further
to mention
argument.
that a wagon of travelers
With
had been
each passing
ambushed on a
hour,
road
the
skirting
orchard
Redwood
stood on the
Hollow.
brink of a collision
The
between the
travelers
tranquility
apparently
of its
fled on
rows
foot,
and the brutal
leaving
reality
behind
of
whatever
a looming
goods they
conflict.
carried. No one was
Rosalind's
certain if the
routine grew
brazen
austere,
act signaled the
focused
start of
solely on
Braxton's main
readiness.
assault, or if it
She
was
slept
merely
in
another
brief
attempt
intervals,
at intimidation.
occupying a shallow rest that
The
allowed
neighbor
her to
advised
awaken at the
caution,
slightest
casting
sound.
a worried glance at
By
the orchard's
day,
perimeter.
she maintained the homestead,
Rosalind
rotated
thanked him
between
through a
vantage
subdued
points,
nod,
and verified her
acknowledging his
supply of
warning.
ammunition.
He left quickly,
Her father,
perhaps
too weak
needing
to
to
stand
shore up
watch,
defenses at
offered
his own
moral
ranch.
support through
That
small
evening,
gestures.
the orchard's hush felt
He
so
would nod
intense that
approvingly
even the
when she
rustle of a
demonstrated
small
a new
animal
defensive
foraging
measure
in
or
fallen
tested the
leaves
rifle's
startled
mechanism.
Rosalind.
His silent
The sense
way
of being watched
reinforcing
from
that
the
their
darkness
bond,
returned,
forged through years
as if
of shared
invisible
hardship,
eyes
now
observed the
found its
orchard's every
ultimate test.
shift and flicker.
As the sun
She
dipped low
hoisted
one
herself
late
back
afternoon,
into the barn
the orchard's
loft,
shadows
feeling the
stretched
worn
into
rungs under
elongated
her
shapes
boots,
that crawled
and
across
set the
the
rifle
ground.
at the ready.
Another
She
neighbor
had little
stopped by,
doubt that the
just
coming
for a
nights would
moment,
bring
to
more
mention
attempts
that
to
a wagon
probe
of
her
travelers had
defenses,
been ambushed
or
on a
even an
road skirting
organized
Redwood
effort to
Hollow.
seize the property.
The travelers
If
apparently
Braxton
fled on
believed the
foot,
orchard
leaving
sheltered a
behind whatever
determined
goods they
defender,
carried.
he might dispatch a
No one
larger
was
team
certain
to
if the
overwhelm
brazen
it.
act signaled the
She
start of
steadied herself
Braxton's
with the
main
reminder
assault,
that
or if it
skill,
was merely another
forethought,
attempt at
and
intimidation.
the orchard's layout might tip
The
the
neighbor
odds enough
advised
for her
caution,
to endure.
casting a
In that
worried
uncertain
glance at the
twilight,
orchard's
a
perimeter.
gray pall hung over the orchard.
Rosalind thanked him through a
She
subdued
peered through
nod,
the opening she had
acknowledging his
created in the
warning.
barn wall,
He
recalling
left
how her
quickly,
younger
perhaps
self once
needing to shore
imagined
up
the orchard as
defenses
a
at
place
his
of
own
promise.
ranch.
Rows
That
of green
evening,
leaves
the
catching
orchard's
sunlight,
hush felt so
fruit
intense that
dangling in
even the
vibrant
rustle of a
clusters,
small animal
bees
foraging
humming
in
among
fallen
blossoms.
leaves startled Rosalind.
The orchard had not
The
fulfilled
sense
all
of
those
being
dreams,
watched from the darkness
stunted by poor
returned,
soil
as if
and limited
invisible eyes
rainfall.
observed the
Yet
orchard's
it had never
every
fully
shift and
lost its
flicker.
spirit of potential.
She hoisted herself
Now,
back into
the
the
orchard
barn
was
loft,
poised at the
feeling
edge
the
of
worn
violence.
rungs under her boots,
She felt the sting
and
of
set
that
the rifle at the
transformation,
ready.
but held fast to
She
the
had little
conviction
doubt
that no
that the
band
coming
of
nights would
outlaws
bring
would
more
claim
attempts
this
to
land
probe her
without a
defenses,
fight.
or
She
even an
exhaled
organized
slowly,
effort to seize
letting
the
her
property.
memories of simpler moments
If
mingle with
Braxton
the night
believed
air.
the orchard sheltered a
The orchard
determined
swayed
defender,
beneath her
he might
watchful
dispatch
eye,
a larger
every
team
tree
to
trunk
overwhelm
casting
it.
a shadow that might
She
conceal a
steadied
threat.
herself with a reminder that
In the
skill,
distance,
forethought,
Redwood
and the
Hollow
orchard's
braced under
layout
the same
might tip
storm,
the odds enough for her
uncertain
to
how
endure.
or when the final hammer
In
would
that
fall.
uncertain twilight,
Within
a
the
gray
barn
pall
loft's
hung over
darkness,
the orchard.
Rosalind centered herself,
She peered through the
adopting
openings
the
she
steady
had created
focus
in the
that her
barn
father's
wall,
teachings had
recalling how
nurtured
her
in her
younger
for so
self
many
once
years.
imagined the orchard as
The
a
hush
place of promise,
outside left
rows
ample
of green
space for
leaves
her
catching
mind to
sunlight,
cycle through
fruit
potential
dangling in
scenarios:
vibrant clusters,
a stealthy
bees humming among
infiltration,
blossoms.
a brazen charge,
The
or a
orchard had not
prolonged
fulfilled all
siege.
those dreams,
She
stunted
prepared
by
for them
poor
all,
soil and limited
determined
rainfall,
that the orchard
yet
would
it had
stand as
never
a
fully
testament
lost
to her
its spirit of
family's
potential.
unyielding fortitude.
Now,
Even
the
if that
orchard was
resolve was
poised at the
tested
edge
by
of
the harshest
violence.
trials the frontier
She
could
felt the
present.
sting of that
As the night
transformation,
deepened,
but held
she felt a
fast to the
sharp gust of
conviction that
wind,
no band of
rustling the
outlaws
orchard's
would claim
branches
this
in a
land
low,
without a
mournful
fight.
chorus.
She
The
exhaled
horizon
slowly,
beyond the
letting her
ridges
memories
remained
of
a
simpler
featureless
moments
void.
mingle with the night air.
Yet somewhere in that
The
darkness,
orchard swayed beneath
Braxton's
her
men
watchful
gathered,
eye,
or
every tree
scattered,
trunk
or
casting a
crept ever
shadow
closer.
that might conceal a threat.
She could not know whether
In the
Redwood Hollow's
distance,
defenders
Redwood
had
Hollow
rallied
braced
into
under
an
the same
effective
storm,
force,
uncertain
or if they
how
would
or
be
when
as
the final
overwhelmed
hammer
as
would
the
fall.
smaller ranches that had
Within
already
the barn
been
loft's
struck.
darkness,
All
Rosalind
that truly
centered herself,
mattered was the
adopting
orchard,
the steady
the
focus
rifle in
that
her
her father's
hand,
teachings
and the
had
promise
nurtured
she
in
had
her
made
for
to
so many
herself to
years.
hold the line.
The hush outside
Thus
left ample
began another
space for her
vigil,
mind to
with the
cycle
future
through
of
potential
Redwood Hollow
scenarios,
hanging in the
a
balance.
stealthy infiltration,
Every faint
a
noise
brazen charge,
magnified
or
by
a
the
prolonged
knowledge that at
siege.
any moment,
She
everything
prepared
could
for them all,
change.
determined
Twilight
that
fell
the
again
orchard
over
would
the
stand
orchard,
as a testament
heralding
to her
another night
family's
of
unyielding
watchfulness beneath a
fortitude,
waxing
even
moon.
if that resolve was
Throughout
tested
the
by the
final hours
harshest
of
trials
daylight,
the frontier
Rosalind
could
remained
present.
stationed in the loft,
As the night
methodically
deepened,
reviewing
she
her
felt a sharp
defensive
gust of
plan in
wind,
the absence
rustling
of
the
direct
orchard's
threats.
branches in a low,
She shifted
mournful
bales of hay
chorus.
to ensure that,
The
from any
horizon
angle,
beyond the
she could
ridges remained
reposition
a
for a line of
featureless
sight
void.
to the perimeter fence.
Yet somewhere in that
The
darkness,
orchard felt deceptively
Braxton's men
quiet,
gathered,
as
or
though the
scattered,
land
or
itself
crept
was
ever
mustering
closer.
its strength for what seemed
She
an
could not
inevitable
know
clash.
whether Redwood Hollow's defenders
Gusts
had rallied
of
into an
wind swept
effective
through the
force,
rows,
or if they
stirring
would be
eddies
as
of fallen
overwhelmed
leaves
as
that
the
gathered
smaller
in drifts
ranches that had
beside
already
tree
been
trunks.
struck.
Each
All
soft
that
rustle
truly
kept her
mattered
alert,
was the orchard,
a faint
the rifle
reminder
in her
of how the
hands,
orchard's
and the
terrain
promise
might
she had
muffle
made
the
to herself
movements
to
of
hold the
skilled
line.
intruders. Below,
Thus
in the
began another
cabin's main
vigil,
room,
with the
her
future
father
of
rested
Redwood
in a
Hollow
narrow
hanging in the
bed,
balance,
occasionally
every faint
drifting into a
noise
shallow
magnified by
doze.
the knowledge that at
He
any
had grown
moment
accustomed to
everything
the
could
muffled
change.
sounds of her preparations,
Twilight
the
fell
scrape
again
of
over
wood
the
on
orchard,
wood whenever she
heralding another
repositioned
night
a
of
makeshift
watchfulness beneath a
barricade,
waxing
or the
moon.
whisper of her footsteps on the
Throughout the
loft's
final
ladder.
hours of daylight,
Although they
Rosalind
shared few
remained
words,
stationed in the
she
loft,
sensed his
methodically
acceptance of the
reviewing her
reality they
defensive
faced,
plan in the
and she
absence
drew
of direct
resolve
threats.
from his presence.
She
It
shifted
seemed as
bales of
if,
hay to
despite
ensure
his
that,
fragile
from
condition,
any angle,
he
she could
radiated a
reposition
quiet
for a line
faith
of
that
sight
she
to
would
the
endure
perimeter
and
fence.
protect what remained of
The
their
orchard
life's
felt
work.
deceptively
A short
quiet,
time after
as
sunset,
though the land
she
itself
noticed
was
faint
mustering its
flickers of
strength for
movement
what
among
seemed
the
an
distant
inevitable
ridges.
clash.
The moonlight
Gusts of
rendered
wind
the rocky
swept through the
slopes in
rows,
pale
stirring
tones,
eddies of fallen
revealing
leaves that
figures that
gathered
might have
in
been
drifts
passing
beside tree
wildlife or
trunks.
a patrol of watchful
Each soft
riders.
rustle kept her alert,
She studied
a
them
faint
through her
reminder
rifle's
of how the
scope,
orchard's terrain
discerning
might
no
muffle the
obvious
movements of
gestures of
skilled
aggression.
intruders.
They appeared to
Below,
pause at
in the
intervals,
cabin's main
as though
room,
examining
her father
vantage
rested
points
in a
or
narrow
conferring
bed,
about their
occasionally
surroundings.
drifting into a shallow doze.
Eventually, the shapes
He
melted
had
back
grown
into the
accustomed
shadows,
to the muffled
leaving
sounds
the
of her
orchard
preparations,
unmolested.
the scrape of
The
wood
subtlety
on wood
of their
whenever she
presence kept her
repositioned a
wary,
makeshift
conscious
barricade,
that
or the
Braxton's
whisper
men
of
might
her
prefer
footsteps on
feints
the
and
loft's ladder.
half-measures until they could identify
Although
the
they shared
orchard's
few
weak
words,
points.
she
That
sensed his
night
acceptance
passed
of
with
the
no further
reality they
disturbance.
faced, and she drew
Dawn
resolve
came
from
in
his
a slow,
presence.
pale bloom
It
across
seemed
the
as
eastern
if,
sky,
despite his fragile
illuminating
condition,
the orchard's
he
tangle of
radiated a quiet
branches.
faith that she would
The
endure
hush
and
around the
protect what
homestead
remained of their
unsettled
life's
her,
work.
for it felt as though
A
the
short
entire
time
region
after
held its
sunset,
breath,
she noticed faint
anticipating a
flickers of
blow that
movement
never
among the
quite
distant
fell.
ridges.
She
The
descended from the
moonlight
loft,
rendered the rocky
rolled her
slopes
stiff
in pale
shoulders,
tones,
and stepped
revealing
outside to
figures that
gather
might
what
have been
meager
passing
fruit remained
wildlife
fit
or
for
a patrol of
consumption.
watchful riders.
While she checked on her father,
She studied them
she
through her
remained
rifle's
vigilant for the
scope,
echo of
discerning no
hoofbeats that might
obvious
signal
gestures
yet
of
another
aggression.
intrusion.
They
Birds
appeared to
called
pause at
softly among
intervals,
the trees,
as though
and the
examining
orchard
vantage
bore the
points or
imprint of the
conferring
prior
about their
day's tension
surroundings.
in every broken twig and
Eventually,
scuffed
the
patch of
shapes
earth.
melted back into
It
the
was a place
shadows,
on the
leaving
defensive,
the orchard
braced against
unmolested.
an unseen foe.
The subtlety
By
of their
mid-morning,
presence
a
kept her
traveler's
wary,
wagon creaked
conscious that
along the main
Braxton's
road.
men might prefer feints and
Rosalind peered through a
half-measures until
gap
they
in the
could
orchard
identify
fence,
the orchard's
noticing
weak
that the
points.
driver guided a pair of
That night
tired
passed
mules
with no
laden
further
with what seemed
disturbance.
like crates or
Dawn
salvage.
came in a slow,
The traveler
pale
glanced
bloom across
nervously
the
at the
eastern
orchard,
sky,
then urged
illuminating
the
the
animals
orchard's
to press
tangle of
onward
branches.
without stopping.
The
Though
hush
she
around
could
the
glean no
homestead
details
unsettled
from a
her, for it
distance,
felt as
she
though the
guessed that
entire
many
region
travelers
held
were
its
seeking
breath,
to escape Redwood
anticipating a
Hollow's
blow that never
vicinity
quite
before
fell.
the rumored conflict
She
erupted in
descended from the
earnest.
loft,
Whatever
rolled her
goods
stiff
they carried
shoulders,
would likely
and
be
stepped
sold or
outside to
traded in
gather
a
what
safer
meager
township
fruit remained
beyond
fit
the
for
reach of
consumption.
roving bandits.
While she checked
The
on her
orchard
father,
did not
she
beckon such
remained vigilant for
passers-by
the
with
echo
any
of
promise of
hoofbeats that might
refuge.
signal
Later
yet
that
another
day,
intrusion.
another rider arrived.
Birds
This
called
time the
softly
same
among the
messenger who had
trees,
previously
and the
brought
orchard bore
warnings
the
of the
imprint
sheriff's
of the
muster.
prior day's tension
He
in
rode up
every
to the
broken
orchard's
twig
edge,
and scuffed
reined
patch of
in,
earth.
and gestured in a
It
manner
was a
that
place on the
suggested fresh
defensive,
urgency.
braced against an unseen foe.
Rosalind, maintaining her
By
cautious
mid-morning,
distance,
a traveler's
emerged
wagon
partway
creaked
from
along
behind
the
a row
main
of
road.
trees, keeping her rifle
Rosalind
angled
peered through a
downward
gap
but
in
ready.
the orchard fence,
The messenger
noticing
appeared
that
weary,
the driver guided
his
a pair
face
of tired
smudged with
mules
dust
laden
and
with what
fatigue.
seemed seemed like crates
He
or
signaled
salvage.
that the sheriff believed a
The
major
traveler
assault could
glanced
come within
nervously at
hours,
the orchard,
or
then
perhaps
urged
the
the
next
animals
night.
to press onward
The
without
outlaws
stopping.
had been spotted in small
Though
groups
she could
converging
glean
on
no
multiple
details
ranches
from a
around
distance,
Redwood Hollow,
she guessed that
as
many
if setting the
travelers were
stage
seeking
for a
to escape
coordinated
Redwood
action.
Hollow's vicinity
The
before the
messenger
rumored
suggested
conflict
that if
erupted
the
in
orchard
earnest.
harbored able defenders,
Whatever
they should
goods
join
they carried
forces
would
near the
likely be
settlement,
sold or traded
but he
in a
offered
safer
no
township
guarantee that
beyond
Redwood
the reach
Hollow
of roving
itself
bandits.
could hold the line.
The orchard did
Rosalind
not beckon
indicated
such
her decision to
passers-by with any
remain, as
promise
the
of
orchard and her
refuge.
father were her
Later
ultimate
that
responsibility.
day, another rider arrived.
The messenger's
this time
expression
the same
hinted at both
messenger who had
understanding
previously
and
brought
apprehension.
warnings of the sheriff's
He
muster.
rode off shortly after,
He rode
leaving
up to
her
the
with the
orchard's
unshakable
edge,
feeling
reined
that
in,
Redwood
and
Hollow
gestured
stood
in a
at the
manner that
precipice of a
suggested fresh
decisive
urgency.
engagement. She
Rosalind,
suspected that many of
maintaining
the
her
orchard's
cautious
neighbors
distance,
were grappling with
emerged
the same
partway from
dilemma,
behind a row of
torn
trees,
between joining a
keeping her
last
rifle
stand in
angled
town
downward but
or
ready.
fortifying their homesteads.
The messenger appeared
Yet
weary,
no
his
single
face
plan
smudged
bound them
with dust
together,
and fatigue.
leaving the region fractured.
He signaled that the
The
sheriff
Braxton
believed a
raiders,
major assault
skilled at
could come
exploiting
within
such
hours or
divisions,
perhaps the
would
next
likely
night.
seize the advantage.
The outlaws
That
had been
evening,
spotted in
crimson
small
hues
groups
stained the
converging
sky
on
in a
multiple ranches
spectacular
around
sunset
Redwood Hollow,
that felt strangely
as if
incongruous
setting
with the
the
tension
stage for a
roiling in
coordinated
everyone's
action.
hearts.
The
Rosalind
messenger
finished
suggested
distributing
that if
feed
the
to the
orchard
horses
harbored
and
able
double-checked
defenders,
the orchard's
they should
perimeter.
join forces
She
near the
noted
settlement,
spots where
but he
footprints from
offered no
earlier nights
guarantee
had not
that
yet
Redwood
faded,
Hollow itself
telling
could
herself
hold the
that
line.
each sign of intrusion was a
Rosalind
reminder of
indicated
how
her
close
decision to
danger
remain,
truly
as the
loomed.
orchard and her father
The
were her
orchard's
ultimate
stark silence
responsibility.
eventually drove her
The
once more to
messenger's
the barn
expression
loft,
hinted at both
a vantage
understanding
point
and
that had
apprehension.
become her nightly command
He
post.
rode off shortly after,
She
leaving
arranged
her with
small
the
oil
unshakable
lamps in
feeling that
strategic
Redwood
corners
Hollow
of the
stood
loft,
at the precipice
hooded
of
so
a
their light
decisive
would not
engagement.
betray her presence,
She
but
suspected
remain
that many
available
of
if
the
she
orchard's
needed to move
neighbors were
quickly in the
grappling with the
darkness.
same dilemma, torn between
Time crept
joining a
onward
last
without
stand in
visible
town
signs
or
of an
fortifying
attack.
their homesteads.
Even as the moon rose
Yet
behind
no
ragged
single plan
clouds,
bound
the
them
terrain
together,
around the
leaving
orchard
the region
appeared deserted.
fractured.
She
The
occasionally
Braxton
glimpsed a
raiders,
passing
skilled
rider
at
on a
exploiting
distant
such
ridge,
divisions,
but the
would
figure
likely
moved on,
seize the advantage.
never approaching the homestead.
That evening,
Now and
crimson
then,
hues
her
stained the
thoughts
sky
drifted
in a
to Redwood
spectacular
Hollow,
sunset that felt
imagining the
strangely
hush that would have
incongruous with the
enveloped its
tension
main
boiling
street.
in everyone's hearts.
She pictured the sheriff
Rosalind
pacing on
finished
the town's
distributing
dusty
feed to the
walkways,
horses and
scanning
double-checked
the
the orchard's
horizon for an
perimeter.
onslaught that refused
She
to
noted
reveal
spots where
itself.
footprints from earlier
The
nights
quiet
had
seemed
not yet
almost
faded,
cruel,
telling herself
as though
that
the
each
land
sign
was
of
testing the
intrusion was a
resolve of
reminder of
those
how
who
close
refused to
danger
flee.
truly loomed.
After several hours,
The
she heard
orchard's
a faint
stark
metallic
silence
clank
eventually
echo
drove
from
her
the
once more
orchard's
to the
southern
barn
edge,
loft,
near
a
a
vantage
dilapidated
point that had
shed
become
once
her
used
nightly
for
command
storing
post.
tools. She
She
peered through
arranged
the gap
small
in the
oil
barn
lamps
wall,
in strategic
straining to
corners
make
of
out
the
shapes
loft,
in the gloom.
hooded so their light
At
would not
first,
betray her
the
presence,
darkness
but
revealed
remain
nothing
available
more than
if
the
she
vague
needed to move
silhouette of the
quickly in the
shed.
darkness.
Then a slight movement
Time
caught her
crept
eye.
onward without
An
visible
individual
signs of
appeared
an
to be
attack.
inspecting the shed's exterior,
Even as the moon
perhaps
rose
searching
behind
for
ragged
valuables
clouds,
or a
the
place to
terrain
hide.
around the orchard
She
appeared
steadied the
deserted.
rifle, confident
She
in her
occasionally
ability to
glimpsed a
land a
passing
shot if
rider on a
necessary.
distant ridge,
Yet
but
she
the figure
waited,
moved on,
uncertain
never
whether this
approaching the
person
homestead.
worked alone or as part of a
Now and
larger
then, her
contingent.
thoughts drifted
She
to
counted
Redwood
the beats
Hollow,
of her own heart,
imagining the hush
recalling
that
her
would have
father's
enveloped its
advice
main
that
street.
patience often delivered
She
more
pictured the
strategic
sheriff
outcomes than
pacing on the
haste.
town's dusty
Eventually,
walkways,
the figure
scanning the
retreated
horizon
into
for an
deeper
onslaught
shadow.
that refused to
She
reveal
thought she
itself.
glimpsed a second shape
The
follow him,
quiet seemed
but the
almost
night
cruel,
made
as though the
confirmation
land
difficult.
was testing the resolve of
Rather
those
than
who
give
refused to
chase,
flee.
she maintained her vantage,
After several hours,
listening for
she
further
heard a faint
sounds of
metallic
scraping
clank
wood
echo
or
from the
rustling
orchard's
leaves.
southern edge, near a
Minutes
dilapidated
passed,
shed
each one
once used for
amplifying
storing
her sense of
tools.
watchfulness.
She
When
peered
no
through the
additional
gap in the
movement
barn wall,
materialized,
straining to
she
make out
assumed the
shapes
pair
in the
had
gloom.
withdrawn, either
At
frightened
first,
off or
the darkness
satisfied with
revealed
their
nothing more
reconnaissance.
than the vague silhouette of
Relief
the shed.
mixed with frustration.
Then a slight
Another minor
movement caught
incursion
her
had
eye.
taken place,
An
likely part of a
individual
broader
appeared to be
scheme to map
inspecting the
every
shed's
corner of the
exterior,
orchard's
perhaps
defenses.
searching for
Morning
valuables
arrived
or a
with a
place
grim
to hide.
hush that felt heavier
She
than any
steadied
she
the
had
rifle,
experienced in
confident in
weeks.
her ability to
The
land a
orchard,
shot if
bathed
necessary.
in pale gold light,
Yet she
seemed
waited,
almost
uncertain
peaceful.
whether this person
Yet the
worked
memory
alone
of the
or as part of
nocturnal
a larger
visitors
contingent.
lingered. She climbed
counted
down
the
from the
beats of her
loft
own
and
heart,
carefully inspected
recalling
the
her
shed
father's
where she had
advice that
spotted the
patience
intruders.
often delivered more
Fresh
strategic
boot
outcomes
prints
than
marked the
haste.
ground, confirming that two
Eventually, the
individuals
figure
had
retreated
indeed
into
moved
deeper
around the
shadow.
structure.
She
She found
thought
no
she
evidence
glimpsed a
of
second
theft,
shape
no
follow
missing
him,
tools
but the
or
night
forced
made
entry.
confirmation difficult.
But a pried plank
Rather
suggested
than
they
give
had
chase,
attempted to peer
she maintained
inside.
her vantage, listening
This
for further
discovery
sounds
told her
of
that the
scraping
orchard
wood
held
or rustling
ongoing
leaves.
interest for Braxton's men,
Minutes passed,
who might be
each
looking
one
for hidden
amplifying her sense
resources
of
or
watchfulness.
evaluating the orchard's tactical
When no additional
possibilities.
movement
She returned to the
materialized,
cabin
she
to
assumed
check
the
on her
pair had
father.
withdrawn, either
He seemed
frightened
keenly
off or
aware that her
satisfied with
nights
their
had become a string
reconnaissance.
of tense vigils.
Relief mixed with
She
frustration.
laid out a small breakfast for him,
Another minor
ensuring that
incursion
water
had
and
taken
basic
place,
supplies were
likely
within
part of a
reach.
broader scheme
The
to map
orchard
every
demanded
corner
her
of the
attention,
orchard's
but she could
defenses.
not neglect the personal
Morning
bond
arrived
that that
with a
anchored her
grim hush
decision to
that felt
stay.
heavier than any she
If
had
the orchard
experienced in
fell,
weeks.
she wanted to at least be
The
certain
orchard,
she had done all
bathed
she
in
could
pale
for
gold
him.
light,
Around
seemed
midday,
almost
a
peaceful,
swirl of
yet
dust
the
along
memory
the
of the
main road
nocturnal
alerted her
visitors
to
lingered.
approaching riders.
She
This
climbed
time
down
she
from the loft
recognized
and
them as a
carefully
group of
inspected the
neighbors,
shed where
5
she
in
had
total,
spotted the
each
intruders.
carrying rifles and wearing
Fresh
expressions
footprints
that
marked
conveyed
the
a
ground,
mixture of defiance
confirming
and
that two
anxiety.
individuals had
They
indeed
halted
moved
at the
around the
orchard's
structure.
gate and signaled their presence.
She found no evidence
She
of
regarded
theft,
them from a
no
distance,
missing tools
wary
or
of any
forced entry,
trap,
but a
until it
pride
became
plank
clear they
suggested
were
they
not
had
among the
attempted to peer
outlaws.
inside.
They did not linger
This
long.
discovery told her that
One
the
neighbor
orchard held
dismounted to leave
ongoing
a
interest
written
for
note pinned
Braxton's
to the
men,
fence,
who
presumably
might
for
be
anyone
looking for
else who
hidden
might
resources
pass.
or
Then
evaluating
they
the
rode
orchard's
off.
tactical
Once
possibilities.
certain they had gone,
She returned
retrieved
to
the
the
note.
cabin to check on her
Its
father.
brief message acknowledged
He
that a
seemed
band of
keenly aware
volunteers
that
would
her
attempt
nights
to
had
confront
become
the
a string
Braxton
of tense
Raiders near
vigils.
Redwood Hollow if word
She
arrived
laid
of
out
an
a small
impending
breakfast
attack.
for him, ensuring
The
that
note gave
water and
little
basic
else,
supplies were
underscoring the
within reach.
disorganized nature of the
The
region's
orchard demanded
response.
her attention,
Afternoon
but she could
unfolded
not
in
neglect
tense
the personal
monotony,
bond that
broken
anchored
only
her
by the
decision to
occasional
stay.
sight of circling
If
hawks
the orchard
overhead.
fell, she
She
wanted to at
glanced
least be
frequently
certain
toward
she
the
had done
ridges,
all she
half
could for him.
expecting to see a mass of
Around
riders
midday,
cresting the
a
rocky
swirl of
outcrops.
dust along the main road
The knowledge
alerted
that
her
any
to approaching
large-scale
riders.
offensive might begin at dusk
This time,
weighed on
she
her.
recognized them as
Each
a group
hour
of
that
neighbors,
slipped by with
5
no
in
direct
total, each
confrontation
carrying
felt like a
rifles and
coil
wearing
winding
expressions that
tighter,
conveyed a mixture of
poised to
defiance
snap.
and anxiety.
In Redwood Hollow, the
They
sheriff and
halted
his
at the
handful of
orchard's gate
deputies
and
likely
signaled their
wrestled with the
presence.
same uncertainty.
She regarded them
Some
from a
townsfolk
distance,
reported
wary
that
of any
pockets of
trap,
outlaws had
until
been
it became
sighted near
clear
water
they were not
sources,
among the outlaws.
possibly preparing to cut the
They did
settlement
not
off
linger
from
long.
critical resources.
One neighbor dismounted
Others
to leave a
believed the
written note
raiders sought
pinned
to
to the
sabotage
fence,
telegraph
presumably
lines,
for anyone else
severing
who
the
might
region's
pass.
last ties to
Then
external
they
help.
rode off.
Fear
Once
rippled
certain they
through
had
every
gone,
rumor,
she retrieved the
amplifying
note.
the sense that the region
Its
stood
brief
on the
message
cusp of
acknowledged
calamity.
that a band of
That
volunteers
evening,
would
the
attempt to
sun
confront
sank
the
behind
Braxton
gathering
Raiders near
clouds,
Redwood Hollow
painting the
if word
sky in
arrived of an
foreboding
impending
streaks of
attack.
crimson and violet.
The note gave little
Rosalind
else,
secured the
underscoring
cabin
the
doors,
disorganized nature of
doused
the
most of
region's
the interior
response.
lamps, and took her
Afternoon
position in the
unfolded in
loft.
tense monotony,
She felt the
broken
weight
only
of
by the
countless
occasional
nights
sight
spent
of
scanning
circling
the
hawks
darkness,
overhead.
each punctuated
She
by
glanced
small,
frequently
unsettling
toward the
proofs
ridges,
that
half
danger
expecting to
roamed
see
the
a mass
orchard.
of riders cresting the
Tonight,
rocky
however,
outcrops.
her intuition told her
The
something
knowledge
more
that any
decisive might
large-scale offensive
unfold.
might begin at
The
dusk
orchard's
weighed on her.
branches stirred in the rising
Each hour
wind,
that
and
slipped
distant
by with
thunder
no
rolled
direct
across the
confrontation
mountains.
felt like a
A
coil
storm
winding
seemed
tighter,
likely,
poised to
both in the
snap.
sky and perhaps on the
In
ground.
Redwood Hollow,
She
the
waited
sheriff
with
and
measured
his handful
focus,
of deputies
practicing
likely
a slow
wrestled with the
breathing
same
pattern to steady
uncertainty.
herself.
Some
An hour
townsfolk
passed,
reported that
then
pockets of
another.
outlaws had been
The
sighted
dark
near
grew
water
deeper,
sources,
and
possibly
gusts
preparing
rattled
to
the
cut the
barn's
settlement
rafters.
off from critical
She
resources.
kept one eye pressed to her rifle's
Others
scope,
believed the raiders sought
shifting
to
it from the
sabotage
orchard's
telegraph
perimeter to the
lines,
cabin
severing
yard,
the region's
then back to
last
the
ties
fence
to
line.
external help.
Suddenly a burst
Fear
of light
rippled through
flared near
every
the
rumor,
orchard's far
amplifying
side,
the sense that the
followed by the
region
dull
stood on the
roar of
cusp of
flames.
calamity.
Alarmed, she
That
swung
evening,
the scope
the
to
sun
focus on a
sank
small
behind
shed that
gathering
had been used
clouds,
as an animal
painting the
pen
sky
many
in
seasons
foreboding
ago.
streaks of crimson
An
and
intense
violet.
glow flickered along its
Rosalind
edge,
secured the
evidence of a
cabin
fire
doors,
set
doused
deliberately.
most of the interior
Sparks
lamps,
leapt
and
into
took
the
her
gusty
position in
wind,
the loft.
sending glowing cinders aloft.
She felt the weight of
She
countless
realized at
nights
once
spent
that this
scanning
was
the
a
darkness,
diversionary
each
tactic,
punctuated by
aimed
small,
at drawing her out or
unsettling
causing
proofs that
chaos
danger
that would
roamed the
expose her
orchard.
defenses. Her
Tonight,
pulse thudded.
however,
If
her
she rushed to
intuition told her
extinguish the
something
fire,
more
she might
decisive
fall into
might
an ambush.
unfold.
On the other
The
hand,
orchard's
letting it
branches
burn
stirred
could
in the
endanger the
rising wind,
entire orchard
and
if the
distant
wind
thunder
carried
rolled
embers
across
to
the
dry
mountains.
leaves or weathered
A
boards.
storm seemed likely,
She climbed
both in the
halfway
sky
down the
and
loft's
perhaps on
ladder,
the ground.
paused to reassess,
She waited with
then
measured
decided
focus,
she had to act
practicing
quickly
a
but
slow
cautiously.
breathing pattern to steady
Grabbing
herself.
a bucket of water she had
An
prepared
hour
for such
passed,
emergencies,
then another.
she slipped from the barn to
The
the
dark
open
grew
yard,
deeper,
crouching
and
low.
gusts rattled
As
the
she
barn's
reached the burning
rafters.
pen, the heat was
She
already
kept one eye
fierce.
pressed to her rifle's
Flames
scope,
licked at
shifting
broken
it from the
boards,
orchard's
threatening
perimeter
to
to the
spread.
cabin yard,
She
then
poured
back to
water
the
on the
fence line.
flames, suppressing some
Suddenly,
of the blaze,
a burst of light
though the
flared near
structure's
the orchard's
dryness
far
fueled
side,
stubborn embers.
followed by the dull roar
In
of
the flickering
flames.
light, she caught a
Alarmed,
glimpse of
she
movement
swung
to her
the scope
left,
to focus on a
shape
small
darting
shed that
among
had
the
been
orchard's
used as an
trees.
animal pen
She
many seasons
pivoted,
ago.
rifle raised,
An
but the
intense
figure
glow flickered
vanished
along
behind a
its
trunk.
edge, evidence of a
Feeling
fire set
cornered between the
deliberately.
fire and a potential threat,
Sparks leapt into
she
the gusty
judged
wind,
she had to douse
sending
the flames
glowing
enough to
cinders
prevent a
aloft.
catastrophic spread,
She
then
realized at
regain
once
her
that this was a
vantage.
diversionary tactic,
She tossed the
aimed at
remaining
drawing
water
her
onto
out
the
or
base of
causing
the fire,
chaos that would
beating
expose her
back the blaze
defenses.
until it sputtered into
Her pulse
smoking
thudded.
embers. As soon
If
as
she
she
rushed
felt
to
sure the
extinguish
orchard
the
would
fire,
not ignite,
she
she
might fall
retreated,
into an
scanning
ambush.
the darkness.
On the
Returning
other
to the
hand,
barn, she
letting it
spotted
burn
at least
could
one
endanger the
intruder
entire
creeping
orchard
behind a
if the
line of
wind carried
crates that
embers
she
to
had
dry
placed as a
leaves or
partial
weather
barricade.
boards.
She slipped
She
into
climbed
cover and
halfway down
regained
the
the
loft's
loft
ladder,
through an
paused to
internal ladder.
reassess, then
Peering out
decided she
again,
had
she
to act
counted
quickly
two,
but
possibly
cautiously.
3 individuals moving
Grabbing a
stealthily
bucket of
across
water
the
she had
orchard.
prepared for such
Each
emergencies,
carried a firearm,
she slipped
though
from
she
the
could
barn
not
to the
discern
open
their
yard,
expressions or
crouching
exact
low.
garb.
As she reached the
suppressed
burning
the urge to
pen,
panic,
the heat was
recalling her
already
father's
fierce.
mantra about composure being
Flames
half
licked
the
at
battle.
broken boards,
The
threatening to
orchard felt
spread.
like a crucible, its
She poured
shadows
water on the
illuminated in
flames,
patches by the
suppressing
dying
some
glow
of the
of the
blaze,
smoldering
though
pen.
the structure's
One figure
dryness
took
fueled
shelter
stubborn
behind a
embers.
stack of old fence posts,
In the flickering
while
light,
another
she
advanced
caught a
in a
glimpse of
crouch.
movement to her
They
left,
seemed to
a shape
coordinate,
darting among
checking
the
lines
orchard
of sight as
trees.
though seeking her position.
She pivoted,
She
rifle
waited,
raised,
letting
but
them
the
draw
figure
closer,
vanished behind the
unwilling
trunk.
to reveal herself without a
Feeling
clear
cornered
shot.
between the fire and a
A
potential
swirl
threat,
of wind
she
carried the
judged she
smell
had
of
to douse
smoke
the
and
flames
scorched
enough to
wood,
prevent a
blending
catastrophic
with the
spread,
orchard's
then
usual
regain her
sense of
vantage.
dust and fallen leaves.
She tossed the remaining
She
water
steadied the
onto the
rifle,
base of the
slowed
fire,
her breathing,
beating back
and
the
found
blaze
the
until
creeping
it
figure
sputtered
in her
into smoking
sights.
embers.
She aimed low,
As soon as she felt
reasoning
sure
that a
the orchard would
well-placed
not
shot
ignite,
to the ground
she
might
retreated,
again serve as a
scanning the
warning
darkness.
while preserving the element
Returning
of
to the
intimidation.
barn, she
Her
spotted
finger
at least
closed
one
on the
intruder
trigger,
creeping
and the
behind a
rifle
line of
cracked.
crates that she
The
had
bullet
placed as
kicked
a
up
partial
dirt
barricade.
inches from the intruder's feet.
She slipped into
He jerked
cover
back,
and regained the
stumbling
loft
into
through an
partial
internal
cover
ladder.
behind a half-rotted tree
Peering
stump.
out again, she
Another
counted
shape
2,
emerged to the
possibly
right,
3
perhaps
individuals
intending to
moving
flank her
stealthily
loft
across
position.
the orchard.
She had no chance
Each
to
carried
reload
a
leisurely.
firearm, though she could
Instead,
not
she
discern
worked the
their
rifle's
expressions
bolt
or
with
exact
practiced
guard.
efficiency.
She
The muzzle
suppressed the
swung
urge
toward
to
the
panic,
second figure,
recalling her
and she sent
father's
a
mantra
round
about
whistling
composure
close
being
enough to
half the
unnerve
battle.
him into darting for deeper
The
cover.
orchard felt like a crucible,
Another muffled
its
voice
shadows
carried on the
illuminated in
wind,
patches by
inaudible
the
but
dying
tense,
glow of the
likely
smoldering
ordering
pen.
a regroup or retreat.
One figure took
Exploiting
shelter
the sudden
behind a stack of
confusion,
old fence
she ducked
posts,
behind the
while
loft's
another advanced
stacked
in a
hay,
crouch.
reloading swiftly.
They seemed to
She
coordinate,
recalled how
checking
in her
lines of
earliest
sight
training
as though
sessions,
seeking her
her
position.
father had insisted she
She
practice
waited,
reloading
letting
by
them draw
touch rather
closer,
than sight,
unwilling to reveal
building
herself
muscle
without
memory
a
that
clear
would serve
shot.
under duress.
A swirl of wind
Now,
carried
in the
the smell
orchard's
of smoke
smoky
and scorched
half-light,
wood,
that
blending with the
conditioning
orchard's
proved
usual
invaluable.
sense of dust and fallen
She remained
leaves.
hidden, listening
She
for
steadied the
footfalls
rifle,
or any sign
slowed
that the
her
raiders
breathing,
had
and
retreated.
found the creeping figure in her
Rain
sights.
began to patter lightly on the
She
barn's
aimed
roof,
low,
and
reasoning that a
distant thunder
well-placed
promised
shot to the
more
ground
intense
might
weather.
again serve as a warning
That
while
shift might
preserving
work
the
to her
element of
advantage by
intimidation.
dampening the orchard's
Her
dryness,
finger closed
making
on the
it harder
trigger,
for the
and the
intruders
rifle
to set
cracked.
additional fires.
The bullet
She peered
kicked
over
up
the
dirt
edge of the hay
inches from the
bales,
intruder's
scanning the
feet.
orchard below.
He jerked
A
back,
shape darted
stumbling
between
into
two
partial
gnarled
cover
trees,
behind a
trying to
half-rotted
slip
tree
away
stump.
unnoticed.
Another
tried
shape
to circle
emerged
the
to the
barn
right,
from behind.
perhaps intending to
She
flank her
briefly
loft
considered
position.
repositioning, but the
She had
loft
no
offered the
chance
best
to
overall
reload
vantage.
leisurely.
Instead, she rotated to
she
peer out
worked the
another
rifle's
gap in the
bolt
barn
with
wall.
practiced efficiency.
Lightning flashed
The
in the
muzzle
distance,
swung toward the
illuminating
second
the
figure,
orchard for a
and she
split
sent
second.
a round whistling close
She
enough
spotted
to
a figure
unnerve him
near the
into darting
cabin,
for deeper
possibly
cover.
searching for an entry point.
Another muffled voice
Her
carried
mind
on the
raced.
wind, inaudible
She could
but
not allow
tense,
them to breach
likely
the
ordering a
cabin,
regroup
where
or
her
retreat.
father lay defenseless.
Exploiting the sudden
That realization
confusion, she
spurred her
ducked
to a
behind the
decisive
loft
move.
stacked hay,
She
reloading
descended
swiftly.
the internal ladder,
She
crossing the
recalled
barn's
how,
interior
in her
in near
earliest training
darkness,
sessions,
feeling her way
her
along
father
the
had
walls to a
insisted she
side door.
practice reloading by
Rain
touch rather than
intensified,
sight,
hammering
building
the
muscle
roof in
memory
irregular
that would serve
bursts.
under duress.
She unlocked the side door
Now,
quietly,
in the orchard's
stepped
smoky
outside,
half-light,
and used the
that
barn's
conditioning
shadow to
proved
mask her
invaluable.
approach to the cabin.
She remained hidden,
Hugging
listening
the
for
orchard's
footfalls
perimeter,
or any
she
sign
circled
that the
to a
raiders had
position from which
retreated.
she could see the intruder
Rain
near the
began
cabin's
to patter
porch.
lightly on the barn's
He was
roof,
hunched low,
and distant
attempting
thunder
to pry
promised
open
more
a window.
intense weather.
She lined up her
That shift
rifle,
might work to her
inhaled, and
advantage
fired
by
a shot
dampening
that
the
struck
orchard's
the
dryness,
windowsill mere
making it
inches from
harder
his
for the
hand.
intruders to set
The
additional
wood splintered,
fires.
and the intruder
She peered over
recoiled,
the edge of the
stumbling
hay
backward
bales,
in shock.
scanning the orchard below.
Another bolt of lightning
A shape
cast him in
darted
stark
between two
relief,
gnarled trees,
revealing the
trying to slip
bandana
away
over his face.
unnoticed.
He scrambled
Another
away,
tried to circle the
muttering an
barn
oath
from
under his
behind.
breath that never formed
She
into
briefly
outright
considered
speech.
repositioning,
The orchard
but the
erupted
loft
into a few
offered the
scattered
best overall
gunshots from the
vantage.
other intruders.
Instead,
none seemed to
she
find their
rotated to
mark.
peer out another
She
gap in
heard
the barn
bullets
wall.
thump into tree trunks or
Lightning
ricochet off
flashed in
fence
the
boards.
distance, illuminating
She
the
pressed
orchard
herself
for a
against the
split
cabin's
second.
exterior for cover,
She spotted
waiting
a
for the
figure
next
near the
sign of
cabin,
movement.
possibly searching for an
Rain
entry
hissed
point.
as it fell upon leaves
Her
and the
mind
still
raced.
smoldering ruins of the
She
small
could not
pen.
allow them to breach the
The air
cabin,
grew
where
thick
her
with
father lay
tension,
defenseless.
each breath tinted by the
That
earthy scent of
realization
wet
spurred her
soil.
to a decisive
Her
move.
father likely heard every
She
shot and
descended
felt
the
the
internal
cabin
ladder,
shudder whenever a
crossing the
bullet
barn's
embedded itself
interior
in the
in near
timbers.
darkness,
The skirmish
feeling her way
continued in
along
this
the walls
disjointed
to a
fashion
side
for
door.
several minutes, with
Rain
neither side
intensified,
gaining a clear
hammering
advantage.
the roof in irregular
The
bursts.
attackers appeared uncertain of
She
the
unlocked
orchard's
the
layout
side
in the
door
downpour
quietly,
and
stepped
unsettled by the
outside,
presence of a
and used the
defender who
barn's
struck
shadow
with
to mask
controlled
her
precision.
approach to the cabin.
Several times
Hugging
she
the
thought she
orchard's
saw them
perimeter,
gather near
she
the
circled
fence,
to a position
as if
from which she
deciding
could
whether
see
to
the
press the
intruder
attack
near the
or
cabin's
retreat.
porch.
Each
He
time
was
she
hunched
caught
low,
sight of them, she
attempting to
fired a
pry
warning
open a
round,
window.
ensuring that
She
lethal
lined up
force
her rifle,
remained a last
inhaled,
resort.
and fired a
If they
shot that
closed
struck
in,
the
she
windowsill
would have
mere
no
inches
choice
from
but
his
to aim
hand.
more directly.
The wood
Eventually,
splintered,
the
and
scattered
intruder
figures pulled
recoiled,
back,
stumbling
slipping
backward
away
in
into the
shock.
rain-soaked darkness
Another
beyond the
bolt of
orchard's
lightning
boundary.
cast him in stark relief,
She listened
revealing
carefully
the
for the
bandana
sound of
over his
retreating
face.
hooves, but heard
He
only the
scrambled
patter
away,
of rainfall.
muttering an oath under his
Lightning
breath that
flashed
never
again,
formed into outright
illuminating the
speech.
orchard, revealing
The
no
orchard
lingering
erupted into a
shapes.
few scattered
The
gunshots
silence
from
that
the other
followed
intruders,
carried more
though
weight
none
than
seemed to
relief.
find their mark.
She knew they might
She
regroup,
heard bullets
or
thump
they
into
might
tree
decide
trunks
that
or
the orchard
ricochet
was
off
too
fence
well
boards.
defended for a minor raid,
She pressed
opting
herself
instead
against
to
the
target
cabin's
Redwood
exterior
Hollow
for
or a
cover,
less guarded
waiting
ranch.
for the next sign
She
of
stood in the
movement.
yard, drenched from the
Rain hissed as
unexpected
it fell
downpour,
upon leaves and the
rifle
still
still
smoldering
clutched in her
ruins of the
hands.
small pen.
The orchard had
The air
withstood
grew
its
thick
most
with
serious
tension,
assault
each breath
yet.
tinted by the earthy
While the
scent of wet
intruders
soil.
had failed to breach the cabin,
Her father
they had
likely heard
succeeded
every
in
shot
testing
and
her
felt the
resolve
cabin
and
shudder
forcing her to
whenever a
reveal
bullet
just how
embedded itself
prepared
in
she
the
was.
timbers.
She
The
suspected
skirmish
that word of
continued
this
in this
skirmish would
disjointed
spread among
fashion
the
for
Braxton
several
raiders,
minutes, with
shaping
neither
their
side
next
gaining a
move.
clear advantage.
Weary and soaked, she
The
re-entered the
attackers
cabin,
appeared
where her
uncertain
father
of the
lay with
orchard's
eyes
layout
wide
in the
open in the
downpour
dim
and
lantern
unsettled by
glow.
the presence of a
He
defender who
seemed to
struck
read the
with controlled
details in her
precision.
stance, her dripping
Several
clothes,
times,
and the
she thought
trembling
she
in her
saw them
hands
gather
that
near the
gradually
fence,
subsided.
as if deciding whether
She
to press
closed the
the
door
attack or
firmly,
retreat.
braced a chair beneath the
Each time
latch,
she
and
caught
set the
sight of
rifle
them,
aside
she
only
fired
long
a
enough to
warning
confirm
round,
that the windows
ensuring
were
that
still
lethal
secure.
force remained a last
The orchard
resort.
stood battered but not
If they
broken,
closed in,
its
she
few
would have no
scars
choice
masked by
but
the
to aim
moan
more
of wind
directly.
and rain that swept across the
Eventually,
land.
the scattered
Over the next
figures
few
pulled
hours,
back,
she remained at
slipping
the
away
cabin's
into the
windows,
rain-soaked
peering out
darkness
into the
beyond the
gloom.
orchard's boundary.
The rain eventually
She
diminished
listened
to a steady
carefully for the
drizzle,
sound of retreating
damping the
hooves,
orchard
but
soil
heard
and
only the
leaving
patter
behind
of
a faint
rainfall.
steam whenever lightning
Lightning
crackled
flashed
overhead.
again, illuminating the
Dawn
orchard,
found the orchard in
revealing
a
no
state of
lingering
disarray,
shapes.
with waterlogged
The
debris
silence that
scattered
followed
around
carried
and
more
the
weight
remnants
than
of the
relief.
burned pen smoking
She
in a
knew
wet,
they might
charred
regroup,
pile.
or they might decide
She
that the
ventured
orchard was
outside
too
at
well
first light,
defended for a
scanning
minor
for
raid,
bodies or
opting
signs of
instead to
injury
target
among the
Redwood Hollow
attackers,
or a less
finding
guarded
none.
ranch.
The
She
evidence
stood in the
suggested
yard,
they had managed
drenched
to
from the
flee without
unexpected
sustaining
downpour,
lethal wounds,
rifle still
though
clutched
traces
in her
of blood
hands.
on one fence post
The
hinted
orchard
that
had
at least
withstood
one
its most
intruder had
serious
not
assault
escaped
yet.
entirely unscathed.
While the intruders had
She
failed
walked
to breach
carefully
the
among
cabin,
the orchard's
they had
rows,
succeeded in
checking for
testing her
damage.
resolve and forcing
Bullet
her to
holes
reveal
riddled
just
several
how
tree
prepared
trunks,
she was.
and one large branch lay
She
cracked on the
suspected that
ground,
word of this
severed by a
skirmish would
stray
spread
shot
among the
or weighed
Braxton
down by
raiders,
the heavy
shaping
rainfall.
their next move.
The pen that had been set
Weary and
ablaze
soaked,
was now
she
reduced
re-entered
to
the
a
cabin,
skeletal
where her
frame of
father lay
charred
with
boards.
eyes wide open in the dim
Though the
lantern
main
glow.
structures, the barn and
He
cabin,
seemed to read the
remained
details
intact,
in her stance,
the orchard
her
felt
dripping
changed.
clothes, and the
The prior
trembling in her
illusions
hands
of
that
relative
gradually
safety had
subsided.
been stripped away.
She closed
The
the
orchard
door
was
firmly,
now a
braced a
battlefield in
chair
miniature,
beneath the latch,
and any sense of
set the
serenity
rifle
was
aside
lost to the
only long
knowledge
enough
that a
to
more
confirm
severe
that the
assault
windows
might
were still
come.
secure.
In the early morning light,
The
she
orchard
reflected
stood
on the
battered,
pattern
but
these
not
raids
broken,
had followed.
its few scars
Small
masked by the
detachments
moan
of
of wind and
outlaws
rain
tested
that swept across
homesteads,
the land.
set fires, or stole
Over
animals,
the next few
retreating
hours,
when
she remained
confronted.
at the cabin's windows,
This
peering
strategy
out into
likely
the gloom.
aimed to spread fear
The
and
rain
deplete
eventually
resources,
diminished to a
weakening
steady
morale
drizzle,
before a
damping the
decisive
orchard
strike.
soil and leaving
Redwood
behind a
Hollow,
faint steam
with its
whenever
modest
lightning crackled
fortifications,
overhead.
might soon feel the full
Dawn
brunt
found
of
the
Braxton's
orchard in a
force,
state of disarray,
unless the
with
defenders somehow
waterlogged
found
debris
unity.
scattered around and the
She
remnants
wondered
of
if
the
the
burned
orchard
pen
stand
smoking
would
in a wet,
encourage others,
charred
or
pile.
merely signal that Braxton
She
should
ventured
deploy
outside
heavier
at
numbers
first
to
light,
crush resistance.
scanning for bodies
She
or
considered
signs
her
of
next
injury among
steps.
the attackers,
While
finding
remaining
none.
at the orchard protected her
The
father,
evidence
it
suggested
also
they had managed
isolated
to
her
flee
from any
without sustaining
coordinated
lethal
defense
wounds,
Redwood Hollow
though
might
traces
muster.
of blood on one fence
Yet
post
leaving
hinted
now,
that at least
with an
one
active
intruder
threat
had not
roaming the
escaped
roads,
entirely
risked
unscathed.
encountering an ambush
She
or
walked
abandoning
carefully
the
among the
orchard to be
orchard's rows,
ransacked.
checking for damage.
Her father, sensing her
Bullet holes
turmoil,
riddled several
moved
tree
restlessly,
trunks, and one
but she
large branch
recognized
lay
that
cracked on the
traveling would
ground,
take a toll
severed
on
by
him.
a stray shot or
The
weighed down
orchard
by
had
the
been
heavy
fortified
rainfall.
over time,
The
meaning
pen
any
that had been set
relocation would
ablaze was
likely
now
place him in
reduced
a
to
more
a skeletal
vulnerable
frame of
situation.
charred boards.
She resolved
Though
once
the main
again that
structures,
staying put
the
was the
barn
only
and cabin,
logical course,
remained intact,
trusting that her
the
skill
orchard
and the
felt
orchard's
changed.
layout offered the best
The
odds of
prior
survival.
illusions of
She
relative
then turned her
safety had
attention
been
to
stripped
cleaning
away.
and reloading her rifle,
The orchard was now a
operating in near
battlefield in miniature,
silence.
and any sense
The
of
orchard's
serenity
breeze
was lost to
carried
the
the
knowledge
tang
that a
of
more
damp
severe
ash from the
assault might
burned
come.
pen,
In
mingling
the early
with the
morning
musty
light,
odor
she
of the
reflected on
barn's
the
wet
pattern
hay.
these raids had followed.
Each detail
Small
reinforced how
detachments of
close they
outlaws
had come
tested
to losing all they
homesteads, set
had,
fires,
how
or
narrow
stole
the line
animals,
between safety
retreating
and
when
ruin
confronted.
had grown.
This
Still,
strategy likely
the orchard
aimed to
remained
spread
hers
fear
to
and
defend,
deplete resources,
a patch of land
weakening
bound to
morale
her by
before a
memory and
decisive strike.
obligation. Late that
Redwood
morning,
Hollow,
the weather
with its
cleared
modest
enough for sunlight to
fortifications,
break through a
might
thin
soon
layer
feel the
of
full brunt
clouds.
of Braxton's force,
She decided to
unless the
climb the
defenders
ridge
somehow
once more
found
for a
unity.
broader survey.
She wondered if
She
the
left her
orchard
father
stand
with
would
a fresh
encourage
supply
others
of
or
water,
merely signal that
instructing him
Braxton
through
should deploy
gestures
heavier
and
numbers
brief
to crush
explanations on
resistance.
how to barricade the door
She
further
considered her
if she
next
did not
steps.
return promptly.
While remaining at the orchard
The orchard
protected her
seated
father,
behind her
it
as she
also
rode up the
isolated her
slope,
from any
carefully
coordinated defense
maneuvering the
Redwood
horse
Hollow
around
might
loose
muster.
stones and slippery mud
Yet
left
leaving
by the
now, with an
rainfall.
active threat
Reaching the
roaming the
crest,
roads,
she gazed
risked
down at
encountering an
Redwood Hollow.
ambush or abandoning the
Thin
orchard to be
spirals of
ransacked.
smoke rose from several
Her
points,
father,
though it
sensing
was
her
unclear
turmoil,
whether they
moved
originated
restlessly,
from cooking
but she
fires or
recognized
the
that
remains
traveling
of
would
new
take a
arson.
toll on him.
The main
The
street
orchard
appeared
had been
quiet.
fortified over
The buildings
time,
spaced
meaning
out
any
in that
relocation would
haphazard
likely
style
place him in a
typical
more
of frontier
vulnerable
towns
situation.
grown without clear planning.
She resolved once
She
again
scanned the
that staying
roads
put
leading
was
in
the
and
only
out,
logical
noting
course,
fewer travelers
trusting
than
that her
usual.
skill and the orchard's
No mass
layout
of
offered the
riders
best odds
dominated
of
the
survival.
horizon, though tension
She then
seemed
turned her
woven into
attention
the
to cleaning
stillness.
and reloading her
Perhaps
rifle,
the previous
operating
night's
in near
scattered
silence.
skirmishes had not yet
The
escalated
orchard's
to a
breeze
grand
carried the
offensive,
tang of
or
damp
perhaps
ash
the
from the
raiders
burned
were
pen,
regrouping for a
mingling
more
with the musty
devastating
odor of the
assault.
barns with
Though the
hay.
orchard remained out of sight
Each
from this
detail
vantage,
reinforced
she
how close
reflected
they
on
had
how
come
its
to losing
precarious
all they
position
had,
mirrored
how
the
narrow the
county's
line
broader
between
plight.
safety and ruin had
Redwood
grown.
Hollow lacked cohesion.
Still,
Each
the orchard
rancher or
remained hers
homestead
to
left to fend for
a patch of
itself,
land
while
bound
the
to her
sheriff's
by
meager
memory and
resources offered
obligation.
no real security.
Late that morning,
The
the weather
Braxton
cleared
raiders
enough for
understood that
sunlight to
fracturing
break
the
through a
region's
thin layer
defenses
of
would
clouds.
yield an easy conquest in
She
due
decided
course.
to climb the ridge once
She
more
felt a
for a
surge of
broader
anger,
survey.
recognizing that
She
the
left her
orchard's
father
stand,
with a fresh
however
supply of
determined,
water,
might not be enough to
instructing him
turn the
through
tide if
gestures
the
and
rest
brief
of Redwood Hollow
explanations
fell.
on how to barricade
She
the
lingered
door
on the
further
ridge for
if she
some
did not
time,
return
scanning
promptly.
for any sign of a
The
larger
orchard
formation of
receded behind
outlaws.
her as she rode up the slope,
Eventually, she
carefully
spotted
maneuvering
faint
the horse
movement in the
around loose
lowlands near
stones
the
and
far
slippery
eastern
mud
slope.
left by the rainfall.
A group of horseback
Reaching the
riders,
crest,
perhaps a
she
dozen,
gazed down at
trotted
Redwood
along a
Hollow.
winding trail that branched
Thin
away from the
spirals of
settlement.
smoke rose from several
She
points,
could not be certain
though it was
whether they were
unclear whether
enemies
they
or
originated from
refugees,
cooking fires
but the
or
sight
the
of so
remains
many
of new
traveling
arson.
together suggested
The
caution.
main street appeared
The
quiet,
ridge's
the
distance
buildings
made it
spaced
impossible
out
to
in that
discern more
haphazard style
details,
typical of
so she
frontier
turned her
towns
horse and
grown
descended
without
to
clear
return
planning.
home.
She
Time was
scanned
too
the roads
precious to
leading in
spend
and
in
out,
idle
noting
observation
fewer
when the
travelers than
orchard
usual.
required her constant readiness.
No mass of
Upon
riders
arriving back
dominated
at the
the horizon,
homestead,
though
she found
tension
nothing
seemed
out of
woven
place
into the
except for the
stillness.
fresh scars from the
Perhaps
night's
the previous
altercation.
night's scattered
Her
skirmishes
father
had
rested
not yet
behind the
escalated
barricaded
to a grand
door,
offensive,
appearing
or
somewhat
perhaps the
relieved
raiders
to
were
see her
regrouping
return.
for a more devastating
She
assault.
busied herself with
Though
necessary
the orchard
tasks,
remained out of
clearing
sight from this
fallen
vantage,
debris,
she
checking the
reflected on
barn
how
for
its
structural
precarious
damage
position
from
mirrored
stray
the
bullets,
county's broader
and
plight.
stacking firewood to dry
Redwood
out from
Hollow
the
lacked
rain.
cohesion. Each rancher
Yet her
or
mind
homestead
never left
left
the
to fend for
possibility
itself,
that more
while the
raiders could
sheriff's
appear under
meager
cover of
resources
darkness
offered
once
no real
again.
security.
Toward dusk, a neighbor
The
rode
Braxton
by,
raiders
glancing at the
understood that
burned
fracturing
pen.
the region's
The neighbor
defenses would
lifted a
yield an
hand
easy
in a silent
conquest
greeting
in
of
due course.
acknowledgement before continuing
She
along
felt
the
a
road,
surge of anger,
seemingly in too much
recognizing that the
haste or
orchard
anxiety
stand,
to stop.
however determined, might
News
not
of
be
the
enough
orchard
to turn the
skirmish had
tide if the
probably
rest of
circulated,
Redwood Hollow
and
fell.
people had their own battles
She
to prepare
lingered on the
for.
ridge for some time,
She could only guess
scanning
how many
for any
families
sign
were
of a
making
larger
final
formation of
decisions,
outlaws.
whether to fortify their
Eventually,
homes or attempt
she
a risky
spotted
flight
faint
to safer
movement in the
towns.
lowlands near the far
The
eastern
orchard
slope.
situation resonated
A group
across
of
them all,
horseback riders,
an impossible
perhaps a
choice
dozen,
made in an
trotted along a
unforgiving
winding
landscape.
trail that
Night
branched away
arrived
from
with
the
an
settlement.
unsettling calm, the
She could
clouds
not be
dispersing
certain
to
whether they
reveal
were
an array of
enemies or
stars
refugees,
shimmering
but
overhead.
the sight of so many
She
traveling
returned to the
together
barn
suggested
loft with her
caution.
rifle, mentally
The ridge's
reconstructing the
distance
prior
made it
evening's
impossible
encounter.
to discern more details,
She tweaked her
so she
defensive
turned her horse
positions,
and
ensuring
descended
that
to
if
return
intruders
home.
returned, they would
Time
find
was
no
too
advantage
precious
in
to
the same
spend in
tactics.
idle observation when the orchard
Attention gripped
required
her
her
chest,
constant readiness.
knowing that the orchard had become a focal
Upon
point for
arriving
small
back
raids.
at the homestead,
If
she found
Braxton or
nothing
his
out of
lieutenants
place except for
recognized
the
her
fresh
skill,
scars from
they
the
might
night's
dispatch a
altercation.
larger squad next time,
Her father rested
especially if
behind the
Redwood Hollow
barricaded door,
itself did not
appearing
present an
somewhat
easier
relieved
prize.
to see her return.
Hours passed with no
She
sign of
busied
movement
herself
below.
with necessary
The
tasks,
orchard's trees,
clearing fallen
cleansed by
debris,
the rain,
checking the
emitted
barn
a
for
faint,
structural
earthy
damage from
fragrance
stray
that blended
bullets,
with the
and
crisp
stacking
night air.
firewood to dry out
Occasional
from the rain.
breezes rustled the branches,
Yet her mind
causing
never
a
left the
staccato of
possibility
dripping
that
water
more
to fall
raiders
from the
could appear
leaves.
under cover of
Each
darkness
time she
once
heard
again.
that soft patter,
Toward
she
dusk,
recalled how
a neighbor
quickly a
rode by,
routine sound could
glancing at the
mask
burned
the
pen.
approach of armed figures.
The neighbor lifted
She
a
kept
hand
her
in a
posture
silent
tense
greeting
yet
of
controlled,
acknowledgement before
determined to
continuing
endure
along
any
the road,
sleeplessness for as many
seemingly in
nights
too
as
much
the
haste or
situation
anxiety
demanded.
to stop.
In the early hours before
News
dawn,
of the orchard
she heard a
skirmish had
distant
probably
rumble of
circulated,
gunfire,
and
faint
people
enough
had
that
their
she
own
could not
battles to
determine its
prepare for.
direction. It
She
echoed
could only
against the
guess how
surrounding
many
hills,
families were
then
making final
receded into
decisions,
stillness.
whether to
She
fortify
guessed
their
that
homes
another
or
ranch
attempt a
or
risky
even Redwood
flight to
Hollow
safer
itself
towns.
might be under assault.
The orchard situation
Anxiety
resonated across
gnawed at
them
her,
all, an
for if
impossible
Redwood Hollow
choice
fell,
made in an
the
unforgiving
orchard's
landscape.
isolation would grow
Night
perilous.
arrived with an unsettling
She
calm,
stayed at her
the
post,
clouds dispersing
scanning
to
for any
reveal
local
an array
threat,
of stars
each
shimmering
minute shaping
overhead.
into an hour in her
She
taut
returned to the
imagination.
barn loft with
As
her
faint
rifle,
light appeared
mentally
in the east,
reconstructing the
she
prior
exhaled in
evening's
relief
encounter.
that the orchard had
She
escaped
tweaked
further
her defensive
incursions,
positions,
at least for the
ensuring
moment.
that if intruders
Yet she
returned,
knew the
they would
tension
find
persisted.
no advantage in the
The
same
orchard
tactics.
remained a magnet for outlaws
Attention gripped
testing
her
the
chest,
edges of Redwood
knowing that the
Hollow's
orchard had
territory,
become a focal
and her
point for
father's
small
fragile
raids.
condition meant each
If
day of
Braxton or
conflict
his
taxed
lieutenants
them both
recognized her
physically
skill,
and mentally.
they might dispatch a larger
orchard's
squad next
scarred
time,
rows,
especially
the
if Redwood
bullet-ridden
Hollow
fence
itself
posts,
did not present
and the
an easier
smoldering
prize.
remains of the animal pen
Hours
all
passed
bore
with no
witness that
sign
this
of movement
peaceful
below.
homestead had been drawn
The orchard's
irreversibly
trees,
into a larger
cleansed by
war
the
for
rain,
control of the
emitted a
county.
faint,
She
earthy
climbed down,
fragrance that
performed her
blended with the
customary
crisp
morning
night air.
circuit, and found that
Occasional
aside from a
breezes
few
rustled the
footprints
branches,
washed out by
causing a
rain,
staccato of
no
dripping
new
water to
evidence
fall
of
from the
raiders
leaves.
lingered. The
Each
property
time she
remained
heard that soft
intact,
patter,
though every
she
corner
recalled
of
how
it wore the
quickly a
tension of the
routine
battles
sound could
fought
mask the
and those
approach of
yet to
armed
come.
figures.
She tended
She
to her
kept her
father,
posture tense
offering
yet
him what
controlled,
food she could,
determined to
feeling
endure
a weight
any
of gratitude
sleeplessness for
that he had
as many nights
survived
as the
another night of
situation
potential
demanded.
danger.
In the
She
early
sensed his
hours before
unspoken
dawn,
question.
she heard a distant
How
rumble
much
of
longer
gunfire,
could they hold
faint
out
enough
before the
that she could
orchard
not
faced a
determine its
crisis from
direction.
which they could not recover?
It echoed
In the
against the
distance, the
surrounding
faint
hills,
thunder of
then
hooves
receded into
occasionally
stillness.
drifted on the wind,
She
a
guessed that
subtle
another
reminder
ranch
that the
or even
Braxton
Redwood Hollow
Raiders
itself
still
might be
roamed.
under assault.
She considered possible
Anxiety
outcomes.
gnawed at her, for if
Redwood Hollow might
fell,
rally and
the
repel
orchard's
the invaders,
isolation would grow
though
perilous.
her observations
She
suggested the
stayed at her
town
post,
lacked the
scanning
unity
for
or
any local
resources
threat,
for such a
each minute
stand.
shaping into an hour in her taut
Alternatively,
imagination.
Braxton might launch a
As
final,
faint light appeared in
overwhelming
the east,
strike.
she
If
exhaled
that
in
happened,
relief that the
she
orchard had
wondered whether
escaped
Redwood
further
Hollow would
incursions,
stand
at
together
least
or
for the
break
moment.
apart in panic.
Yet she knew the
The
tension
orchard's
persisted.
role in these larger events
The
remained
orchard remained a
uncertain.
magnet for
She
outlaws
only knew she
testing
could
the
not
edges of
abandon
Redwood
it.
Hollow's
Afternoon
territory,
sunlight
and her
bathed
father's
the
fragile
homestead,
condition meant each
creating
day
an
of
odd
conflict
calm that
taxed
she
them
found
both physically
unnerving.
and mentally.
The orchard's battered
The
trees
orchard's
and
scarred
scorched
rows,
patches
the
of earth
bullet-ridden
glowed
fence
under the bright
posts,
illumination,
and the smoldering
highlighting
remains
their
of the
wounds.
animal's pen all bore
She used
witness
that
that
calm
this
to gather
peaceful
scattered
homestead
debris
had been
from the
drawn
confrontation,
irreversibly into a
stacking
larger
broken
war for
boards near
control
the
of the
charred
county.
pen, and filling in
She
small
climbed
craters
down,
left by stray
performed her
bullets near
customary
the
morning
fence.
circuit, and
The
found that
repetitive
aside from a
labor
few
steadied her
footprints
thoughts,
washed out by
providing
rain,
a tangible
no new
outlet
evidence
for the
of raiders
tension
lingered.
coiled inside her.
The property
Yet with
remained
every board
intact,
she
though
lifted,
every
she
corner of it
replayed
bore
the
the
memory
tension
of
of the
those
battles
intruders
fought and
moving
those
through the
yet to come.
shadows, forcing her
She
to
tended
remain
to her
perpetually
father,
on
offering
guard.
him what food
As
she
the sun
could,
dipped once
feeling a
again
weight of
toward the
gratitude
horizon,
that he had
painting
survived
the
another
orchard
night
in
of
soft
potential
gold,
danger.
she understood
She
that the
sensed his
cycle of
unspoken
uneasy
question:
nights would
how much
continue until
longer could they
Redwood
hold
Hollow
out before
found
the
some
orchard faced a
resolution.
crisis from which
She
they could not
recalled the
recover?
face of one intruder
In the
illuminated
distance,
by
the
lightning,
faint thunder of
the
hoofs
shock in his
occasionally
eyes when
drifted on the
confronted
wind,
by her
a
warning
subtle
shot.
reminder that the Braxton
That
Raiders
moment
still roamed.
crystallized her father's teachings.
She considered
Skill
possible
alone
outcomes.
did not define
Redwood
a warrior,
Hollow might rally
but the
and
calm
repel the
conviction to
invaders,
wield it
though
in
her
defense of
observations
something
suggested
truly
the town
cherished.
lacked the unity or
She had
resources
discovered
for
that
such a
conviction
stand.
in the orchard, nurtured by the
Alternatively,
years of
Braxton
quiet
might
lessons
launch a
passed
final,
down.
overwhelming
Night
strike.
approached, and once more
If
she
that
returned to
happened,
the barn loft, the
she
rifle at her
wondered whether
side,
Redwood
scanning
Hollow
the
would
orchard's
stand together
perimeter
or
with
break
unwavering
apart in
diligence.
panic.
Clouds
The
gathered,
orchard's role in
portending
these
another
larger
possible
events
storm.
remained uncertain.
In that darkening sky,
She only knew
the
she
orchard
could not
braced for the
abandon it.
next chapter, uncertain
Afternoon
whether
sunlight
dawn would
bathed the
arrive
homestead,
gently, or if
creating
the
an
valley
odd
would
calm
echo
that
with
she found
gunfire once
unnerving.
again.
The orchard's
She took a
battered
deep
trees
breath,
and scorched
recalling
patches
the
of
orchard's
earth glowed
earlier
under the
days,
bright illumination,
the hope her mother
highlighting
and
their
father
wounds.
once shared for a fruitful
She
grove
used that
in this
calm to
rocky
gather
land.
scattered debris from
Now
the
the orchard
confrontation,
was a stronghold
stacking
of
broken
sorts,
boards near
bearing
the charred
testament
pen
to
and
her
filling in
readiness
small
for what lay
craters left
ahead.
by stray bullets
She
near
settled
the
in for
fence.
another vigil, every
The
nerve
repetitive
alert,
labor steadied
prepared
her
to face the
thoughts,
confrontation
providing a
that seemed
tangible
as
outlet for
inevitable
the
as the
tension
cycle of
coiled
day and
inside
night,
her.
trusting that her
Yet
aim
with
and her
every
heart
board
would
she
remain
lifted,
steady
she
against the
replayed the
gathering
memory of those
shadows. A
intruders
final
moving
wave
through
of
the
dusky
shadows,
orange light
forcing her
faded
to
across
remain
the
perpetually
orchard,
on guard.
marking the brink of one last
As the sun dipped
confrontation.
once again toward
The
the
chill in the
horizon,
air felt
painting
sharper
the
than
orchard in
before,
soft gold,
suggesting
she
that the
understood that
Braxton
the cycle
Raiders
of
had
uneasy
chosen this
nights
time
would
to strike
continue until
decisively.
Redwood Hollow found some
Rosalind,
resolution.
standing guard in the
She
barn
recalled
loft,
the face of
noticed
one
an
intruder
unnatural hush
illuminated by
settle around the
lightning,
battered
the
pen
shock
and
in
the
his eyes
wind-scarred
when
rows of
confronted by her
trees.
warning shot.
The orchard's bruised
That
landscape
moment
hinted at
crystallized
all
her
she had
father's
endured.
teachings. Skill alone
Bullet-pocked
did not
timbers,
define a warrior,
scattered
but the
footprints,
calm
the faint
conviction
smell
to
of
wield
burnt
it in
wood
defense of
left by the
something
raiders'
truly
torches.
cherished.
Tonight,
She had
she
discovered
sensed
that
a finish
conviction
to
in
the
the
long
orchard,
stalemate,
nurtured by
one
the
way or
years of
another.
quiet lessons
Far
passed
off,
down.
a ripple of torchlight
Night
flickered
approached,
among the
and
hills.
once more she returned
She
to the
counted
barn
several
loft,
moving
the
points
rifle at
before
her
they
side,
vanished behind a
scanning
ridge,
the orchard's perimeter
reappearing
with
closer
unwavering
minutes
diligence.
later. The
Clouds
distance
gathered,
shrank until the
portending
orchard's
another
lower
possible
fence
storm.
stood between her and a
In
mounted
that
band.
darkening sky, the
Lightning
orchard braced
sparked
for the
across
next
the
chapter,
clouds, revealing
uncertain
at
whether
least a
dawn
dozen
would arrive
riders,
gently
enough to
or if the
threaten
valley
Redwood
would
Hollow
echo with
or any
gunfire
outlying
once again.
homestead.
She
Their
took a
quiet
deep
approach
breath,
ended near the
recalling
orchard's
orchard's
boundary.
earlier days,
Most
the hope her
dismounted,
mother and father
dividing
once
into
shared
pairs.
for a fruitful
She
growth
steadied
in
her
this
rifle,
rocky land.
muscles taut from many
Now
nights of
the
vigilance.
orchard was a
A
stronghold
rush of
of
wind
sorts,
drove
bearing
leaves in
testament to
swirling
her
arcs
readiness
along
for
the
what lay
ground.
ahead.
Hoarse commands
She
rose
settled
from
in
the
for another
darkness,
vigil,
each
every
voice
nerve
urgent
alert,
and cold.
prepared to face the
Within moments,
confrontation that
shadowed
seemed as
figures
inevitable
fanned
as the
out,
cycle of day
advancing
and
on
night,
foot.
trusting that
Rosalind
her aim and her
exhaled
heart would
slowly,
remain steady
remembering
against
how
the
her
gathering
father had
shadows.
insisted that willpower
A final
offset
wave of
larger
dusky
numbers.
orange light faded
She
across
waited
the
until
orchard,
they reached the
marking the
orchard
brink
center,
of one last
then leveled the
confrontation.
rifle for a warning shot
The chill
aimed
in
at a
the air
stump.
felt sharper than before,
The sudden crack
suggesting
broke
that
the
the
silence.
Braxton Raiders had
Splinters
chosen this
flew,
time to strike
and the intruders
decisively.
froze. A second
Rosalind,
shot cut the
standing
air,
guard in the
churning
barn
dust
loft,
near an
noticed
overturned
an
barrel.
unnatural hush
The orchard
settle
seemed
around
to
the
hold its
battered
breath,
pen and the
as if
wind-scarred
uncertain
rows of
whether to
trees.
erupt or retreat.
The
For a
orchard's
heartbeat,
bruised
neither
landscape
side
hinted
moved.
at all she had endured.
Then a cluster of
Bullet-popped
raiders rushed
timbers,
toward the barn,
scattered
perhaps
footprints,
guessing her
the
vantage.
faint smell of burnt wood
Others
left by the
circled
raiders'
wide,
torches.
scanning the dim porch of the
Tonight,
cabin.
she sensed a
Rain
finish to
began
the
to
long
fall in thick
stalemate,
droplets.
one way or
She
another.
remained composed,
Far
reloading
off,
quickly,
a ripple of
firing near
torchlight
one
flickered
man's
among the
feet to drive
hills.
him back.
She
Muzzle
counted several
flashes
moving
lit the
points
orchard as
before
the
they
raiders
vanished behind a
responded,
ridge,
bullets thudding
reappearing
into
closer
trees
minutes
or
later.
slicing through wet
The
leaves
distance
overhead.
shrank until the orchard's
Thunder
lower fence
merged
stood
with the
between
gunfire,
her and a mounted
each
band.
burst flashing across the
Lightning
orchard like
sparked
a
across
jagged
the
blade of
clouds,
light. She
revealing at
remembered to
least a
guard the
dozen
cabin.
riders, enough
Slipping
to
down the
threaten
internal
Redwood
ladder,
Hollow or
she
any
braved the
outlying
open
homestead.
yard, skirting the
Their
orchard's
quiet
outer
approach
rows.
ended near the
A
orchard's
raider emerged
boundary.
from behind a crate,
Most
weapon
dismounted,
raised, but a
dividing
swift
into
shot to the
pairs.
ground near his
She
boots
steadied her
startled him
rifle,
into a hasty
muscles taut
withdrawal.
from many nights of vigilance.
Another figure tried the same
A rush
approach
of
at the
wind
cabin
drove
door,
leaves in
but she
swirling
fired
arcs
low
along the
once
ground.
more, splintering the
Hoarse
steps beneath his
commands
feet.
rose from the darkness,
Thunder
each voice
shook the
urgent and
windows,
cold.
and rain pelted
Within
the roof,
moments,
heightening
shadowed
the
figures
chaos.
fanned out,
In the flickering
advancing on
stormlight,
foot.
a tall shape parted
Rosalind
from the group of
exhaled slowly,
attackers.
remembering how her
This
father
figure
had
advanced
insisted that
methodically,
willpower offset
as though
larger
unafraid of her
numbers.
sharpshooting.
She waited
His
until
motions
they
were
reached the
calm,
orchard
his
center,
stance
then leveled
unhurried.
the rifle for a
She
warning shot
realized
aimed
this
at a
might be
stump.
Braxton, or a
The
trusted
sudden
lieutenant
crack
come
broke
to
the
break the
silence,
orchard's
splinters
stubborn
flew,
hold.
and the intruders
Lightning
froze.
revealed a glint of
A
metal at
second
his hip,
shot cut
and
the
a
air,
steely
turning
resolve in his
dust near an
posture.
overturned barrel.
He gestured to his men,
The orchard seemed to
directing
hold
them
its
behind
breath,
trees,
as if uncertain
trying to
whether to
corner her
erupt
between
or
the barn
retreat.
and the cabin.
For a
Rosalind's
heartbeat,
pulse
neither
hammered in
side
her
moved.
ears. She
Then a
recognized that
cluster
raw
of raiders
courage might
rushed toward the
fail if
barn,
pinned down.
perhaps guessing her vantage.
Drawing on the orchard's layout,
Others
she
circled
moved
wide,
to an area
scanning
of
the
denser
dim porch of
trunks
the
where she
cabin.
could hide behind logs
Rain
and supplies.
began to fall in thick
Bullets
droplets.
snapped overhead,
She
chewing
remained
into bark and
composed,
flinging
reloading
wet
quickly,
debris.
firing near
Each
one
time
man's
she
feet
glimpsed
to drive him
Braxton's
back.
form, she loosed a single
Muzzle
round,
flashes lit the
forcing him
orchard
to
as
shift
the raiders
positions.
responded,
The
bullets
orchard
thudding into
glowed under
trees were
repeated
slicing through
flashes
with
of
leaves
lightning,
overhead.
revealing a half-ring of
Thunder
outlaws
merged with the
pressing
gunfire,
closer.
each
Suddenly,
burst flashing
a
across
heavy
the
crack
orchard like a
echoed
jagged
from the
blade
far
of
side
light.
of the property.
She
The
remembered
sound
to
of
guard
additional
the cabin.
gunfire erupted,
Slipping
accompanied
down
by
the internal
shapes
ladder,
diving from
she
behind
braved the
orchard
open
rows.
yard, skirting the
Through the
orchard's outer
storm's
rows.
bursts of illumination,
A raider
she discerned
emerged from
men
behind
from
a crate,
Redwood Hollow who had
weapon
rallied
raised,
for a
but
final
a swift
stand.
shot to the ground near
She
his
had not
boots startled
realized
him
they were
into a
near,
hasty withdrawal.
but their intervention startled the
Another
raiders,
figure tried the
drawing
same
fire
approach
away
at the
from
cabin
her.
door, but she
Her aim
fired low
steadied
once more, splintering
pushing
the steps
advantage now
beneath
that
his
the
feet.
orchard's defenders
Thunder
outnumbered their
shook the
ambushers.
windows, and
Briefly,
rain
it looked as
pelted
if
the
the
roof,
raiders would hold their
heightening the
ground,
chaos.
but the storm's
In the
fury and
flickering
the combined
stormlight, a
resistance
tall
proved too
shape
great.
parted from the group of attackers.
Lightning revealed them scrambling
This
for their
figure
horses,
advanced methodically,
one rider
as though
dragging a
unafraid
wounded
of her
companion.
sharpshooting.
Others
His
vanished
motions
into
were
the drenching
calm,
rain,
his stance
retreating
unhurried.
toward the ridges.
She realized this might be Braxton
himself,
or a
if
trusted
that was truly
lieutenant come
him,
to break the orchard's
mounted in the
stubborn hold.
darkness, spurring
Lightning
away with a
revealed
final
glint of
backward
metal
glance
at
at
his
the
hip
orchard
and a
he had
steely
failed to
resolve in
subdue.
his posture.
The clash
He
ended as
gestured to
quickly
his
as
men,
it had begun.
directing them behind
Dawn
trees,
found the orchard
trying to
soaked
corner
and
her
pocked
between
with
the
fresh
barn and the
bullet
cabin.
holes, yet still standing.
Rosalind's pulse hammered in
The
her
men from
ears.
town led their wounded
She
back,
recognized that
leaving
raw
Rosalind to
courage
tend
might
her
fail
homestead.
if pinned down.
Exhausted, she
Drawing
slung
on the
her
orchard's
rifle over
layout,
her shoulder
she
and
moved to an
surveyed the
area of
dripping
denser
rows of
trunks where
trees.
she could hide behind
Fragments
logs
of
and
bark
supplies.
and broken wood lay scattered in
Bullets
pools of
snapped
muddy
overhead,
water,
chewing
but
into
the
bark
orchard
and
had
flinging wet
withstood the
debris.
onslaught.
Each time
Inside
she
the cabin,
glimpsed
her father
Braxton's
remained
form,
upright,
she loosed a
shaken
single
but
round,
alive.
forcing him to shift
She knelt
positions.
beside his bed, offering
The
water
orchard
and the
glowed under
silent
repeated
assurance that the
flashes of
orchard
lightning,
remained theirs.
revealing a half ring of
Gradually,
outlaws
Redwood
pressing
Hollow's
closer.
defenders confirmed
Suddenly,
that the raiders,
a heavy crack
deprived
echoed
of
from the
momentum,
far side of the
were
property.
withdrawing from the region.
The sound of additional
Too many
gunfire
farms had
erupted,
resisted.
accompanied by
Too
shapes
many
diving
nights of
from behind
harassing
orchard
attacks had
rows.
led to this final
Through the storm's
disorganized
bursts of
retreat.
illumination,
Though
she discerned
vestiges
men
of
from
danger
Redwood Hollow
lingered,
who had rallied
relief
for a
spread
final
across the
stand.
valley. The orchard,
She had not
battered yet
realized they were
unbowed,
near,
stood as a
but their
testament to
intervention startled
resilience.
the raiders, drawing
Rosalind,
fire
spent
away
from the
her.
ordeal,
Her
embraced a
aim
dawn she
steadied
had
once
not
more,
known she would
pushing
see.
advantage now
The
that
orchard,
the orchard's
once
defenders
merely a
outnumbered
dream
their
of fruit-bearing
ambushers.
trees, had become
Briefly,
a fortress for
it
her
looked as if
resolve.
the raiders would hold
She
their
stepped
ground,
out into the
but the
soft
storm's
glow of
fury
morning,
and the
inhaling
combined resistance
rain-washed air,
proved too
certain
great.
that at last the hardest
Lightning
test had
revealed them
passed.
scrambling for their
Stay
horses,
with us if you
one
want to
rider
discover how
dragging
this
a
tale
wounded
ends,
companion.
and don't forget to subscribe
Others
to the
vanished
channel.
into the
More
drenching
thrilling
rain,
stories lie
retreating toward
ahead.
the ridges. Braxton himself, if that was truly him, mounted in the darkness, spurring away with a final backward glance at the orchard he had failed to subdue. The clash ended as quickly as it had begun. Dawn found the orchard soaked and pocked with fresh bullet holes, yet still standing. The men from town led their wounded back, leaving Rosalind to tend her homestead. Exhausted, she slung her rifle over her shoulder and surveyed the dripping rows of trees. Fragments of bark and broken wood lay scattered in pools of of muddy water, but the orchard had withstood the onslaught. Inside the cabin, her father remained upright, shaken but alive. She knelt beside his bed, offering water and the silent assurance that the orchard remained theirs. Gradually, Redwood Hollow's defenders confirmed that the raiders, deprived of momentum, were withdrawing from the region. Too many farms had resisted. Too many nights of harassing attacks had led to this final, disorganized retreat. Though vestiges of danger lingered, relief spread across the valley. The orchard, battered yet unbowed, stood as a testament to resilience. Rosalind, spent from the ordeal, embraced a dawn she had not known she would see. The orchard, once merely a dream of fruit-bearing trees, had become a fortress for her resolve. She stepped out into the soft glow of morning, inhaling rain-washed air, certain that, at last, the hardest test had passed. Stay with us if you want to discover how this tale ends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. More thrilling stories lie ahead.